Well, we continue this interesting story, where the team approached the king and lowered their heads as a sign of respect. Iela was actually a little indignant, since Rei did not want to lower his head and just looked at the king, so she tried to hint to him that he needed to lower it. After which he did this and immediately also bent her over and expressed his respect. The girl became a little embarrassed and asked if he was really trying to disgrace her in this way, but the king was also quite wise and treated all this with understanding. He asked the boys to raise their heads and told them that he had heard that they were returning to the Holy Kingdom. The girl looked at him and said that the fact that they have the opportunity to return to the Holy Kingdom is all thanks to His Majesty. Theogard smiled and said that he had done nothing at all for this. All this was the merit of the strong Holy Kingdom. But Iela insisted on her own, because thanks to the fact that they accepted him in Cilia, they managed to find the saint and their return after that became possible, so she bowed her head and announced that she would definitely repay the debt. He thought about it, because he was really interested in such an offer, which he would not mind gladly taking advantage of. The king looked at Rei and asked if he was now really the newly elected saint that everyone had been talking about for so long. He was a little scared, but still said that it was true and introduced himself again, saying his name. The king began to study him deeply and began to doubt him, because he did not feel at all that he had mana. But if you analyze his body, it would seem that he has mastery of the sword. Even Theogard himself noticed the fact that for the second time in his life he was observing the appearance of a saint, so he was also a little nervous, but now, looking at him, he also realized that Rei now poses absolutely no danger. After he analyzed the whole situation, he continued his story, saying that it was indeed a great honor for him to meet two saints in one place. While the girl was trying to say that the king was exaggerating, Rei turned to her and asked if they could quietly take it and leave here. The king was a little surprised after hearing all this, so he didn't even understand how to react to all this correctly. He extended his hand and turned to the girl, who just a few minutes ago had reported that she would be in his debt. It looked like he had a proposal. Iela was a little surprised, because perhaps the king was already ready to do a special task for her. The king asked them to look again at the interior of his room and tried to somehow choose the right words, because it was noticeable that he was nervous and did not know how to correctly talk about his request. The thing is that his cousin, the daughter of the Archduke of Silos, is sick and no one can cure her. They had already tried to heal her by any means, they invited many priests, but none of them could identify the disease and make an accurate diagnosis, not to mention its treatment. He looked at the guys and asked them to at least look at her and say what it could be, but Rei was very surprised by such a request and began to behave ugly, because he began to aggressively refuse, arguing that they did not have time at all. Rei looked at Iela and asked her to refuse as soon as possible, because they still have a lot to go towards the kingdom. But she agreed, which greatly surprised the guy and made him nervous, because he definitely didn't expect this now and was determined to move on, and not stop and give help to those in need. He looked at the girl and thanked her very much for this, which made her very embarrassed, because she herself understood that this would not only be her merit. But still, she came to terms with it and they went into the garden in order to look at it and move to help. Rei was clearly not happy, because he didn't understand why he couldn't immediately go to the Holy Kingdom. Iela smiled and said that he was now also a worker of the Holy Kingdom, so if he learned to handle divine power just by monitoring it, it would be a big breakthrough for the world. But Rei was still not happy, because now they will spend much more time, first going to the Archduke's estate and only then going to the Holy Kingdom. Yes, that was exactly Iela's plan. Meanwhile, the weather was beautiful outside, but that was not the most important thing. They are going to treat a sick person, aren't they? He looked at the girl and asked, since they are the only ones who can help, doesn't that mean they need to hurry up now? He is ready to go anywhere if there is a patient who needs help, because this is precisely the duty of a doctor. The priests were also already preparing for the campaign and turned to the saint, informing her that it would not be as easy as it might seem. They have already reported to the Holy Kingdom about their return and preparations for the appointment of a new saint are now in full swing, so there can be no question of them going to the Archduke. The girl came closer to him and said that this was a request from the King of Scylla himself and she had no right to refuse him at all, so she asked him not to distract her. The priest asked if the king promised anything in return. No, nothing like that. This is her way of expressing her gratitude for the fact that he allowed them all to stay here. He bowed his head and agreed with the girl, because in this case, they cannot refuse him at all, so in order to maintain a good relationship with Scylla, he will contact the Holy Kingdom and report to them about the delay in order to delay the ceremony a little. Iela bowed her head and thanked him for his understanding, saying that they were going there right now in order to save at least a little time. Due to the fact that people in this world have not yet learned medicine, the first patient whom Rei helped, instead of gratitude, caused him a commotion. While they were moving forward to help, he became very interested in what kind of person his second patient would turn out to be and what consequences should be expected from him next. They walked all day, so since the sun began to set and night was approaching, it was decided to stop the journey for today and stop in the forest to spend the night and rest. The priest pointed his finger at the tent that he and his colleagues had set up and asked everyone to go there. They looked at the guy, who was upset because everything did not go according to the plan he had imagined, and continued to discuss it, since they themselves could not quite believe that he really was a saint. They also noticed that he was actually much more handsome than the rumors that were circulating about him, so they wanted to get to know him better and come talk to him. Ray was a little surprised after they immediately approached him and started talking to him, trying to find out if he was really a saint. The girls kindly offered to help him, but the guy assured them that everything was fine and there was no need to worry about it. They were very interested in talking to him, so they asked him for permission to stay next to him, since they were very interested in watching the guy. Ray smiled and invited them to sit next to him in a way that would be comfortable for them. Perhaps he should invite one of them for coffee when they already arrive at the Holy Kingdom. A second later, the girls were very scared and surprised, because they were definitely not ready to see all this now. And they looked at the guy who began to glow very strongly after he took out his magical plant, which he found in the elven forest. It was already starting to get dark outside as the sun was setting below the horizon. Ray looked and really didn't understand how there could be so much energy in these young girls. He was really a little surprised, because after the girls left, he decided to eavesdrop on them and think about what they were already saying. It turned out that the priest was really not very pleased that the girls were discussing him, because isn't it too much honor for such a guy? He explained to them that this was still a child who had not even known life, but simply dared to set the conditions for the kingdom. Besides, he was together with those elves who dared to raise their hands on their saint. Had they all forgotten about this? Ray really became very aggressive, because he didn't understand what they were allowing themselves to do. Why were they starting to throw mud at him behind his back? The girl threw up her hands and said that in any case, upon arrival in the Holy Kingdom, it would become clear to everyone that no guy is a saint, but just a dummy. Iela listened to this statement, after which she became very angry, asking to explain what they just said about her and the saint. She was very angry, although she looked quite safe. She looked again at the guys who had just discussed them and asked them to repeat everything again, giving them the opportunity to apologize, and she would pretend that she had misheard. She was really very unpleasant that they were discussing them behind their backs, because she really didn't understand which way they ended up in their dialogue. So she simply invited them to continue, because apparently they had something to add. At this time there was complete silence on the street. No one said anything, trying to simply ignore this phrase and avoid further showdowns, but Iela stood her ground and did not let them do this, asking if they would continue to remain silent. At that moment she became very angry and said that in this case she would simply consider what she heard to be the truth. So could she think that the priests had such an opinion about them? They didn't know how to react correctly to all this and were very scared, trying to find at least some justification for their actions. Children, they just didn't want others to forget about what she had to go through. Iela was very surprised, because how does what she had to go through have anything to do with them, or maybe she ever complained about it? So they were talking about it for her sake, right? Well, did she ask for such help? She turned around and left, but the priest wanted to stop her and apologize. He understood that these guys were still very young and quite stupid, so it was just a big misunderstanding, and that's probably not what they really wanted to say. The senior priest grabbed them by the neck and immediately ordered them to apologize to the saint. Did they really think that a simple apology would just be enough? How dare they make fun of Ray just because he is still young and even have the audacity to call him a dummy? Do they really think that the girl will let them get away with all this? Obviously, the saint was chosen by God himself, so insulting the saint can be equated to insulting the choice of God himself. This is simply blasphemy. Do they really think that this situation can be resolved just because they apologized? And what if their apology seems unconvincing to Iela? Ray continued to stand behind the tree and observe the situation, because he was interested in finding out what they were saying about him. The priests had already begun to fall to their knees and asked Lady Iriel for forgiveness, because they had no right to discuss such things. But Iela was very aggressive, so she made it clear to them that they were apologizing very poorly. Had they really decided to doubt God's chosen one? And besides, they couldn't even properly apologize for their misdeeds. But there are people in the world who would like to apologize, but this is not permissible for them. Ray was very surprised, because he could not understand what kind of whisper it was. Was she really talking about herself? That's right. Being a saint at such a young age is really a heavy burden, because she knows like no one else without her words. Ray smiled and said that he knew this, because he himself was a man who in a past life was a brilliant surgeon. He was already tired of standing behind a tree, and he understood that it was time to show up and talk to all these people. They ended the conversation, right? Having not received an answer to this question, Ray decided to go out and talk to them, saying that it was really unpleasant for him to hear this and it really upset him. Ray looked at all these people, telling them that he could not even imagine that they had such an opinion about him, because do they really consider him a very small child who is not able to think logically? The priests fell to their knees and were very worried, because they understood that their lives were now at stake, so they began to look for excuses in every possible way, saying that this was not what they meant at all. In fact, they are not mistaken, since they thought that he would become a saint, being a dummy. Iela was very surprised, because why is the saint saying this now? What kind of dummy? The guy calmly replied that now he does not have divine power and he has absolutely no idea how he will manifest himself now in the Holy Kingdom, but even if God himself chose him, then isn't he an ideal candidate for the role of a dummy? In truth, every one of them thinks so, doesn't it? Iela was also very surprised, so she answered this question in the negative, because why should he be a dummy? Ray continued to talk to her, but the girl insisted that God has his own plans, but Ray also did not say that God chose him for no reason. He is just sure that there will be many people in the Holy Kingdom who will think the same way. In this case, for all of them he will remain a dummy in any case. That is why he decided to look at them again, and it was clear that he was not quite ready to continue the dialogue with them, so he turned to Iela asking what if he wanted to choose a punishment for them. They were very scared of such a priest, because the guy offered to hand them over to the Inquisitors, or, in the worst case, just kill them. They began to fall to their knees and begged for his forgiveness, which also surprised him very much, but they needed to receive forgiveness, at least for once. Ray thought about their proposal and thought about how he could answer all this correctly, so that he would not be humiliated further, and would not be talked about behind his back. He was sure that there were other guys here who looked down on him, wasn't he? Therefore, he addressed them, saying that those who take him for a dummy, as well as for a small child or an insufficiently qualified specialist for this task, all of them are probably right in some way, at least in that their words are that he is still young and has not won their trust, and also that he does not yet have power, ability, connections, or reputation. However, after a couple of years that he spends in the Holy Kingdom, he will prove to them all that they were very deeply mistaken about him. The priests were very surprised, so they asked what he meant. How was it wrong? But I turned around and told them something that would make them regret what they said. Everyone who looked down on him and despised him, absolutely everyone who dared to insult him, would pray that he would forgive him. Ray looked at these priests, who began to cry, and said that he would leave them as witnesses to this promise, and would not punish him in any way, and extended a helping hand to him. The priests just continued to cry, begging for forgiveness, because they themselves began to realize that they had made a terrible mistake. Perhaps all this was due to the fact that they were really in danger of death, but still they really looked like repentant people who asked for forgiveness. Ray smiled and said that he really hoped that the day would come when they would regret what they had done even more than they did now. All this will happen as long as he is in the territory of the Holy Kingdom and does not achieve his goal. He is ready to do absolutely everything to raise the honor of the Holy Kingdom even higher. He looked at the moon, which was already lighting up the earth, and said that he himself did not know how many years it would take. However, he is ready to do absolutely everything to make them go crazy about today. He began to glow. It was really clear that the guy was confident in himself, who was afraid of absolutely nothing and was ready to work to take revenge on his offenders. Absolutely all the priests and those who were next to them were very surprised and shocked, because they had never seen it so bright near a person in the middle of the night. That is why they all began to fall to their knees and express their respect, and also many of them began to mentally ask for forgiveness for what they had done. Ray continued to sit by the fire after this conversation, preparing another portion of delicious food, and while calming down, he saw Iela, whom he immediately called to him. She was very surprised and even embarrassed, because she was very impressed by the speech of this guy, who spoke so confidently, but he also felt a little funny because the girl began to mock him a little, repeating his phrases. She immediately drew attention to the fire and asked if she should cook dinner for herself again. That's right, because the priests also ate his portions, so he needs to cook everything again. Ray looked at the girl and smiled a little, because after everything that had happened, he was really a little hungry, so he invited the girl to eat with him, because food really tastes much better when it is still hot. Iela smiled and said that she really wanted to eat and could not refuse such an offer. Together they also looked at the night sky, where a shooting star began to fly. At that moment there really was a very pleasant atmosphere. Everything was calm and there were no signs of trouble. Iela really hadn't looked at the night sky like that for a long time, and right now she was lucky enough to see a falling star. Perhaps this really was some kind of sign. He remembered that in a past life his name meant a shooting star. Unexpectedly for himself, he remembered that he had even forgotten that in his previous life he was called that way, because he was so accustomed to his new name. Therefore, he opened his eyes and, smiling, turned to his girlfriend and said that where he comes from, there is a tradition in which you make a wish when you see falling stars and it really must come true. The girl immediately took these words as truth and began to make a wish, which surprised the guy very much, Does she really believe in superstitions? After listening to the guy, Iela remembered the legend of their kingdom, where they say that everyone who has seen a falling star knows a happy death. The guy continued to eat his food and kept the spoon in his mouth, because what does a girl mean when she talks about a happy death? He couldn't believe that death could be happy, just like the girl, so he decided to ask her how she sees a happy death. But we will never know the answer to this question, because the night has already ended outside and the morning has come, with the most beautiful weather. The carriage and crews began to arrive in the Duchy of Silos. Ray continued to read his book, and the girl just looked out the window and said that they were about to come to the patient and they would need to treat him. The priest also looked at them near the carriage and asked where they would go when they arrived in the duchy. But the girl told him that they were really in a hurry, so they would go straight to the patient. She continued to look out the window and realized that they really didn't have much time. They need to figure out the treatment as quickly as possible, after which they need to return to the Bright Kingdom, because if they are delayed, then they could have really big problems. At the entrance they were greeted by Hertz, who said that he was really very glad to see the guys, because when he learned about their arrival he was really very excited. He is really very happy, because the team has come such a long way for the sake of his daughter. Iela also smiled and said that everything is happening according to the will of God, for the sake of the suffering, they came to give her grace, because this is the duty of the saints, so there is no need to worry about this. The Duke was a little scared, after which he began to worry, but still he apologized again for the rush. However, he would like to ask them to help his daughter as quickly as possible, because for him, her existence is like a tar, so he cannot watch how his precious children are suffering. The team informed him that they were ready to go there right now. The Duke promised them to do absolutely everything they asked if they managed to cure his daughter. Ray was very surprised, because Duke believes so much in this girl, although she has not done anything yet. Of course, being a saint, she has divine power and is a great person. The maid asked everyone present to follow her so that she would lead them to the bedroom where the girl was. She knocked on the door and told Mrs. Layla that the saint had arrived. Ray was very surprised, no less than Iela, because they had never seen this before, so they didn't even know how to react correctly to this. They were noticeably scared. It looks like the guy began to guess about something. Is this really what he was thinking about now? Meanwhile, the patient's hand became covered with red spots, which looked really very terrible. The girl got up and lowered her head, because she was really very scared, since absolutely no one could help her, so she was in hopelessness. These were erythematous papules. Is this really a case of dermatitis herpetiformis? Ray started yelling that they should have started treating her sooner so that she wouldn't end up in a state that they even thought was possible, because it looked really disgusting. Iela walked closer to the girl, who began to cover herself with her blanket and was scared, after which she asked her to extend her hand to examine her. Since there was no other way out, Layla listened to her and kindly agreed to do it. Iela decided to cheer her up, saying that she knew that it was not easy for her now, but from now on everything would be fine and there was no reason to worry. She continued to hold her hand and used her magical power to heal the girl, after which the entire room began to glow with a bright yellow flash that blinded everyone present. Layla was shocked by what was happening and began to believe that her illness would pass and she would begin to live life like an ordinary person. Everyone in the room watched what was happening and were shocked, because divine power really exists. After several minutes, the girl's hand continued to glow, but there were no longer any traces there that would remind of this terrible illness. Layla was shocked, because her skin began to hurt a lot, like after an operation, but all the spots disappeared and she became a healthy person again. She pulled them out and was very happy, because she again looked like a beautiful girl who should worry about what to wear on a date, and not about her sores. Layla began to cry with happiness, because now her hands were healed and the treatment was completely completed. Iela looked at the Duke, who was clearly perplexed and shocked, saying that everything went fine and there was absolutely no reason to worry. He immediately ran to his daughter and hugged her very tightly, crying with happiness, which she did exactly the same. The Duke looked at Iela and thanked her again for her help. She really is a saint, because his daughter suffered so much for the last 8 years, after which he completely lost hope for her recovery, so he promised them that someday he would definitely repay them. Iela smiled and said that this was not at all necessary, because everything was God's will. Ray watched the situation and was perplexed, because at first it looked like a skin defect that required a very long treatment, but the fact that she can heal people just by touching them really inspires respect. He was very upset, because does medicine really have no meaning in this world? Iela spent the whole day in their palace with the team, since the Duke asked them to stay with them in order to somehow thank the saints for their help. He ordered his workers to prepare a delicious table from the most expensive and luxurious dishes, after which he invited the guys to a meal, worrying that perhaps this would not be enough, but he tried to prepare the best. The saint thanked him for the food and looked at him, saying that it was not at all necessary to do this, because this was already much more than they could ask for. Lord Hopel looked at her and could not take his eyes off, because he understood that according to rumors, he knew that the saint was amazing, but he could not even imagine that she was so merciful and beautiful, so he would also like to thank her from the bottom of his heart for the treatment her younger sister. She was a little embarrassed, even though she loves attention in her direction, but she was still confident that they could do the best for their Lord Gaia. At this moment, Hopel really admired the girl, and also how modest she still was. Ray, meanwhile, continued to sit upset. It was clear that this situation hurt him very much, because would medicine really not be needed? The Duke noticed this and asked what happened, because the guy doesn't speak at all, maybe he didn't like the food. Ray smiled back, saying that the food was really great, he was just really thinking about something, so he immediately apologized for making Duke worry. Iela tried to rectify the situation by saying that the saint had a lot of thoughts that bothered him, so there was absolutely no reason to worry about this. She looked at the guy and tried to find out what was happening, was something wrong? But Ray told her that he was really tired and would like to rest. Iela had already agreed to stay that night in the castle, so she invited the guy to go to her room and relax. In it, he still continued to think and analyze the current situation. It was clear that all these thoughts did not leave him peace and made him worry. He remembered how he lived his past life and could not understand why he had shed so much blood and tears in order to become a doctor. Was it really worth it? Although he still has memories of his previous life, they are all useless in this world. He really needs to forget about his past name as Park Yu-sung, and start living his new life, in which he is already called Ray. He has been trying to find the answer to this question in his head for several years and only now has it reached its peak. At that moment there was a knock on the room, asking if the saint was already sleeping and if Iela could come in. Ray just looked at the doors and didn't say anything, because right now he didn't want to talk to anyone, so he just continued to lie on the bed and think about the current situation. Iela decided not to open the door, so she said that she really didn't know what had gone wrong now, but despite all this, she asked Ray not to stop believing in himself and his strength. She is well aware that there are times when everyone doubts themselves and hopes that what is bothering him will not destroy what he has already created. Her words greatly surprised the guy, so he continued to listen to what she told him. Instead of worrying and exhausting himself, he needs to focus on the present, because the current role suits him much more than what he had before. These words really made him think. So he got up from the bed and continued to replay her phrases in his head, where Iela convinces him not to lose faith in himself. He thought about it and realized that this makes sense, because now his name is Ray, but he is still a former doctor named Park Yu-sung. Now the guy just needs to find something that only he is good at and develop in this direction. Iela still continued to stand outside the door and talk, crossing her arms behind her back. And when she repeated once again that she wanted the guy not to give up, he opened his doors and made her a little embarrassed, because she definitely didn't expect this. Ray smiled and thanked the girl, because her words were really very timely and this is what he wanted to hear at that very moment. She smiled, because at least once in her life she managed to help the saint, but he still had one request. He turned to the girl and said that it seemed like she was comforting someone for the first time. Could this really be true? But she still didn't quite understand what the guy meant, so she asked him to explain. A situation occurred again that no one could even imagine. The maids continued to cry, because they remembered that yesterday everything was fine with the girl. Was she really not completely healed? The Duke was scared and very angry, so he ordered them to immediately call the saints into the room. They didn't understand what was happening here, because they were starting to prepare for the trip to their kingdom. The Duke fought back his tears as he told them that her symptoms had returned, so did that mean they had failed to heal her? Iela was shocked, because the treatment was successful and there could be no mistake. She also did not understand why the symptoms returned, so she will try to cure Layla again. The Duke looked at her in despair and said that now everything was in her hands. Ray realized that this was his chance, so he asked the girl to wait and take her time. She was very surprised, after which she immediately stepped aside, as she understood that the saint now wanted to try to heal the girl in his own way. He looked at Layla, but the Duke ordered her not to even turn towards the guy. Ray looked quite pleasant and asked her politely for her hand to take a look. The Duke was very worried, because how could this guy heal something that even a saint could not do? So it seems it would be better if the saint just tried again. But Ray looked at him and said that if this is what he thinks about and the diagnosis is confirmed, then he is the only one in this world who can cure her of this disease. The Duke refused to believe it, because how is it even possible that a young guy who doesn't even have superpowers could be the only one who can cope with such a task? Ray looked at him and informed him that the saint would not be able to heal the child in any way. They could ask Iela to heal her and everything would be fine again. But after they left, what were they all going to do if the symptoms returned? The Duke looked at him with concern, because he understood that now there really was no other way out, so he agreed to all these conditions. Besides, Ray was also absolutely sure that all Lady Layla needed now was definitely not the healing of the saint. Ray was completely confident that she needed to accept his treatment and trust. The Duke was at a loss, because he understood that the guy had no strength at all. What was he going to do? His treatment does not require healing powers, he just uses all the information he knows to get rid of this disease, which is how he will heal his daughter and get rid of the disease. Layla also agreed with the guy, because she understood that he was really right, because if they didn't trust him, then she didn't think that they would have the opportunity to do anything without his help. She began to persuade her father to agree to this, because they have absolutely no other choice, since they have already practically tried all possible treatment options, but none of them have given results. The Duke agreed, because he understood that they really had no other choice, so if his daughter sincerely thinks so, then he will certainly support her. He looked at Ray and began to beg for help for his daughter, falling to his knees and barely holding back tears. Ray smiled and promised that he would definitely be able to cure this young lady and return her to normal life. From the next day, he began to investigate the reason for this condition of the girl's skin. The first was hygiene. Since this is the most basic component of health, the first thing he tried to check was this option, but seeing that they maids washed blankets and clothes at least once a day, a logical decision was made that one could safely rule out poor hygiene as the main one. Considering that the castle was protected by a magical barrier, it is also very unlikely that a parasite from the external environment could cause this disease. However, Ray noticed one problem that arose from her diet, because there was one thing in common. All the dishes she ate every day had one characteristic. All of them were prepared using flour. Not only that, bread is the most commonly consumed food in this world. Also, even all the main meat products were garnished with flour products, which was very surprising. In addition, the girl's condition further worsened after eating food, which at the moment was the only clue that the guy managed to find. Flour contains an insoluble protein called gluten, which Layla eats daily, so her illness is caused by a severe sensitivity to gluten. Dermatitis is also known as an allergy, which is really not that difficult to cure, but unfortunately, the only problem is that there are no useful drugs in this world that can be quite effective. It would be difficult to try to make medicine from plants he is not familiar with, and it might take a long time. The only thing he can do now is change the girl's diet. He looked at the maids and told them to remove everything he wrote below from her diet from now on. In Layla's room there were beautiful candles and mugs near a large window that overlooked the whole city. But she had no time for that now, as she continued to lie in her bed and cough. At that moment, Ray knocked on the door and asked if he could come in to talk to her. Layla was very panicked, because she wasn't quite ready to talk to him alone, so she was very worried, and Ray once again apologized for invading her personal space and tried to defuse the situation. He smiled and said that he wanted to see her and how she was feeling now. Layla smiled and said that everything had only gotten worse, which was not surprising, because the reason for this was her diet, which the guy guessed almost immediately. He looked at her and said that he had to tell her something very important, which Layla was not entirely aware of. From now on, he wants her to avoid foods that contain flour, that is, she must completely avoid anything that looks like bread, and also when her body itches, under no circumstances should she do this. Layla was very surprised, because she didn't understand how to avoid bread. But Ray smiled and said that for now that was all he could do for her. The girl refused to believe it, because bread was her favorite food. Why couldn't she eat it? So she began to suspect that Ray was lying to her and wanted to call security for help. Besides, she looked at him again and asked if he really wasn't going to do something else. Perhaps he's using magic to heal her or something similar. But Ray smiled and said that he had already given her recommendations on what to do. All this is her treatment, which will give results and help cope with this problem. He looked at the girl and assured her that in the coming days they would be able to get rid of all these blisters on her body and he would do everything himself, since he needed to check her condition. This was where all his recommendations and advice ended, so he ordered the girl to have a good rest, saying that this is the most important thing she can do now. Layla could not understand whether her condition would really improve if she gave up eating bread, but how could this be connected? Iela ran to the door and asked the guy what condition the girl was in now, but he said that everything was only getting worse. Iela was very upset, but it seemed she began to guess where Ray had come to their world, but still asked if he really thought that she wouldn't get better if she tried to heal her again. Ray looked at her and informed her that her healing method was really useless, so if they use it again, everything will return to the same state as now. But Iela did not understand his treatment method, because can a girl really get better if she just goes on a diet? If this is the case, then why didn't he do so right away? Iela looked at him and said that she believed the guy, but the Duke thinks otherwise, and as he himself understands it, now they cannot stay in this castle for a long time, since they need to go to the Holy Kingdom. Ray thought about it, because the girl was also really right, so it was necessary to make a decision quickly so as not to delay it. She was a little scared, so she asked not to look at her with that look, since she herself could not do anything about these circumstances that had developed. Ray clenched his hand into a fist and said that now it doesn't matter at all whether he can heal Layla or not, what's important is something completely different. How he will treat all his patients from now on will depend on this. Ray looked at her and said that he only needed 1 week to see the first results. He showed one with his finger and was absolutely sure that in such a period of time he would be able to completely heal the girl. Iela looked at him and had no choice but to simply accept the guy's decision. The next day, Layla began screaming in her room, convincing everyone that she was not at all ready for such a treatment method. Ray could no longer hold back and also began to shout at the girl, ordering her to drink the medicine, since she did not even drink a small part of what she should. Moreover, this is simple water, which she needs to regularly drink 3 liters a day, but she cried and refused, not understanding how water could heal her, because it is not even holy water. Water helps cure allergies, just believe it and drink it, is it really that difficult? When foreign substances enter our body, a chemical created by the immune system called histamine is created. Although it is produced in response to the body's defense against foreign substances that enter the body, in people with allergies the chemical is produced in excess and can cause dire consequences. Therefore, after Ray explained the whole situation to her, he tried to once again hand her a glass of water and asked her to drink it calmly, because when she starts drinking enough water, the cells of her body will be able to start working properly and everything will return to normal. This will also reduce the effects of the allergic reaction, so it is the best way to cure the girl, so he simply started pouring water from a glass into her mouth while she cried. Layla panicked, because she couldn't understand how he could call himself a saint if he treated her like that. He's just crazy and looks great. For days passed in this manner in this castle, where similar procedures were repeated every day. After Ray put the girl on a diet and also forced her to drink a lot of water, she began to hate him. However, Layla decided to trust him, because she really had no other choice. As a result, everything went well and she herself called the saint to inform him that her skin had indeed healed and Layla began to recover at incredible speed. Ray smiled and said that he was right, because he himself promised her that he could really help. Layla felt much better after she stopped eating flour and started drinking a lot of water. She couldn't believe it. Despite all the successes, Ray still said that the girl was still not completely cured, so she needed to continue treatment so that there would be no problems later. Layla already fell in love with the guy, so she listened to his every advice and no longer perceived him aggressively. Although he was worried that people in this world would react differently from those in his previous world, it seems that he was worrying about it in vain. Now it was only a matter of time before the girl was cured, or so he thought until they ran into trouble again on the 6th day. In the dining room, plates and all other utensils began to break, as it was simply unbearable to endure. Layla began to cry and demand that bread be brought to her immediately, as she had withdrawal symptoms. In this world, flour is a staple of the diet, so it was quite expected that she would break out and run for flour products. Therefore, Ray began to shout at her, because he understood that if she ate flour products without completing the treatment, then all his efforts would be in vain. To distract her, he needed to help the girl focus on something else, so he approached her and tried to tell her in a calm voice not to cry, otherwise she might become dehydrated. He took a wooden object in his hand and made a magical blade, starting to carve a figure out of it, which surprised Iela very much. She asked what he was doing, but he was just trying to come up with a game, but he wasn't sure if he could do it. Iela also didn't understand what kind of game it could turn out to be and why she should do it at all now, but Ray simply invited her to look at the chess piece he was holding in his hands. He immediately asked what comes to her mind when she sees this. Iela didn't quite understand what he was talking about, so she asked if he was now talking about the white thing that was in his hand. She said that it reminds her of a castle, it feels like they are in a holy kingdom, and it also looks like a crown. Does it look like a crown? Ray was very happy that it really worked, so he turned around and ran, asking Uriel to follow him. She was shocked, because she didn't understand how he dared to leave her like that. Layla's room was in order and all her things were already in their places. She had already calmed down a little, as she was informed that Ray would like to see her, as well as her brother. The Lord was glad that the saint invited him for the first time, so he immediately asked if he could help with anything. Ray smiled and said that right now he needed his help, because what he was going to show them now would help cope with the withdrawal symptoms of the young lady Layla. She was surprised, because he was really talking about this strange thing that was in his hands. He made a game for them that was very popular in his previous world, but in the new world absolutely no one had ever heard of it, so he proudly introduced it, saying that it was called chess. He sat them all at the table and began to explain the rules, saying that each of them has his own army, and the rules of the game are quite simple. All you need to do is capture the opponent's king by moving your pieces, and the one who controls best will win with their troops. However, there are rules regarding how each of these figures can move, which surprised everyone in the room. What Ray now holds in his hands is a king. He can only move one square like a true ruler, keeping his movements to a minimum, and on the other side is the queen, which is the opposite of the king. As long as it is not captured, he can move as much as he wants, just as each of these figures has its own rules, which he will explain. It's really very interesting. There are a lot of variations of moves, so it's quite a complex system that would be useful in real military training. Layla was also absolutely sure that Dad would like it too. Therefore, Ray suggested not to delay it and invited the girls to play a game if they didn't mind competing. They immediately agreed, because it was something new for them and seemed quite exciting. Iela smiled and invited the princess to start her turn first. Layla was also very happy, so she kindly agreed, saying that she would take the game very seriously. Ray was also very pleased, because the game really interested them, which means he was able to achieve his goal, because as long as she is involved in the game, she will be able to take her mind off her addiction. Meanwhile, their game ended, as one of the participants made checkmate. The winner turned out to be Iela, who was very happy about such a victory and said that all this was thanks to the power of the Holy Kingdom, so they can try to hide from it, but it will still overtake everyone. She began to rejoice very much, so she began to dance and mock the girl, inviting her to simply give up, telling her that she would allow her to become her subordinate. This made Layla cry. She was very upset that she lost, while Iela couldn't get enough of her victory. The Lord decided to help his sister, so he invited the saint to fight him to avenge his sister's loss. Iela smiled and said that she was ready to accept absolutely any challenge, so she invited him to start the game first, since in any case, everyone would kneel before the power of the Holy Kingdom. Ray thought, because everything is becoming much better than he imagined, does this really mean that they like the game? Another checkmate, only with black figures. Iela smiled and said that he at least tried to defeat her, but he just smiled, asking if she really thought they were playing so easy. Therefore, the Lord took his figurine in his hand and said that he was waiting for her next move, after which he would be ready to show the full power of their dukedom. Ray smiled and suggested that they stop a little so as not to get carried away so much, because until that moment he thought that this would be a good way to distract her from thoughts about starchy food, but there was an unexpected change in events. Information about the new entertainment quickly spread throughout the castle. Therefore, the father came into their room and was very surprised, because his children introduced him to a new game called chess, which was invented by the saint. His son smiled, because this is indeed a very complex and interesting game, thanks to which the Duke will be able to evaluate his strategic capabilities as a military leader. He was shocked that Ray was able to create such a perfect game. He knew that Ray was sent to him by God himself, but if he could also find a real use for this game, then it would be just great. After the Duke plunged into the game, the situation took on truly strange proportions. The week they agreed on is over, but why is no one talking about it yet? Ray was a little surprised, because he was not at all prepared for such an outcome of events, since he did not understand who all these people were. And why did even the servants also start playing chess? He looked at the guys who were also standing and starting to make figures in order to play this wonderful game. Now Ray really thought about it, because why does everyone play chess? After all, they were originally intended as a game that would help Layla distract herself and finish her treatment. Therefore, he simply excitedly watched the situation and did not understand what was happening here, since he never even thought that the game would be able to completely capture Silo's castle. After all this, the Duke decided to call them to his meeting room, where the guys kindly came. They looked at him and actually smiled very much, as their mood was very good, announcing that they had appeared, as he had asked. He greeted them and said that in just 1 week, thanks to Ray, his daughter's condition had really improved very much, and he also managed to create such a wonderful game that everyone liked, so he couldn't believe that he was capable to do this at your age. He was very happy, since his daughter's condition had really improved noticeably, so he thanked them for the work they had done. He bowed his head in gratitude, saying that when his father, it was really very painful for him to look at her in such a state, so he asked their permission to thank him for freeing her from such suffering. Iela smiled very hard and said that this time she did absolutely nothing. You only need to thank the saint and his methods of treatment. The Duke smiled and asked her not to belittle herself and her dignity, but indeed, the saint did a really great job. Therefore, as a token of gratitude for their help, he would like to give them something very valuable to him. Ray was very surprised, because he couldn't believe his eyes. Would they really give him something now? This ring was given by the ruler of our territory. It was given to this kingdom back when they saved the dwarves. Ray was very surprised, because as a sign of gratitude, are they really ready to give him a family heirloom? Well, the Duke insisted on this, since in this way he expresses his gratitude, so he asked to be received as soon as possible. Ray said that he would never be able to accept this kind of gift, but in his head he was already very happy, because he understood how much money it cost, and also realized all its uniqueness and rarity. But the Duke insisted that the guy try it on, since it was very important to him. And so he put the ring on his hand and was really grateful for it. But still he said that he probably shouldn't wear it on a regular basis. Ray was very scared and surprised. After the ring really fit perfectly on his finger, he couldn't believe it, so the Duke said that since it was made by the palaces, the long johns are already so simple. Ray smiled and thanked him for such a precious gift, but still you are sure that he cannot accept it so easily. If the dwarves find out that the saint got this ring, they will be glad. This is how the Duke calmed him down. He also heard that the boys were going to the Holy Kingdom tomorrow. Therefore, he allowed them to ask permission to sponsor their trip in order to make it as comfortable as possible, since the journey would be really long, so they needed to rest a little before setting off. He once again allowed them to thank them for all the efforts they had made to help his daughter and invited them to his rooms to sleep. The next morning, Ray woke up and began to communicate with Iela, where she talked about how she was really very glad that everything was over, but doesn't it really seem to her that the Duke is really very generous? But Iela believes that most likely he just wants to thank them in this way. Ray was very skeptical, since he always looked for a catch in everything, so he really didn't believe in such an outcome of events. Suddenly, someone knocked on their door, which greatly surprised the guys, so Ray decided to find out if they were really waiting for someone. Iela also said that this was definitely not for her. I wonder who it could be at a time like this. It was Layla and her brother who apologized for the late visit, because they heard that they were leaving tomorrow. The Lord was very happy, because he could not even think that they would be able to meet the saint, whom they had only read in books before, because they really helped with his sister's illness and created the game of chess, so they also wanted to thank them for everything what they did for them. Ray grimaced a little and said that there was absolutely no need for this, and Ella also replied that she was very glad to meet them, but she was very sorry that they could not stay here for a long time, because great things were ahead of them. Therefore, the guys suggested that they go on a night picnic, if they don't mind, of course, since there is a castle in the backyard, which offers an incredibly beautiful view of the night sky. This will be truly unforgettable. What do you say, Ray? Sure, sounds interesting enough, why not? The children were very happy, because it was also a great honor for them to walk together with the saints, so they asked them to wait a little so that they had time to prepare. After that, they turned around and ran to catch everything. The girl smiled and laughed very hard, which surprised the guy very much. He didn't understand what was funny, but she beat him to it and said that this would indeed be a farewell party for them, so she thought it was very nice of them. But Ray believed that all he does is work for the good of the Holy Kingdom and scare away all the people around him, so he never had the opportunity to experience something like this, even in the previous world. Maybe this one has changed for the better, but he still didn't notice. Iela also noticed that she had never experienced such feelings before. Ray also closed his eyes and thought about the moment when he first met Iela. She was very cold and I went towards my goal, no matter what. She was also really incredibly cruel. But now the old Iela is no longer there. She seems to have dissolved, especially after her questions about whether the world has changed. We can safely assume that she has actually changed. Ray asked if she would really look up for a long time. Maybe they would already start moving and somehow help the guys organize a picnic. Meanwhile, the guys had already called them and said that they really needed to hurry up and go to them. They were a little worried about the fact that perhaps this was a bit of a modest picnic, but I also needed a big table. The most important thing was to spend time together. Ray was a little surprised and immediately decided to tell them that he had forgotten to say one important nuance. The girl would have to avoid flour even after he left, so if the girl continued to eat flour, the disease would return. Layla was very scared, because had she really not fully recovered? No, because her body reacts to chemicals, and flour products act like poison, so it is very difficult to recover from this disease. But Ray said that not everything is so simple, because if she can hold out for at least 5 years, then by the time the disease may already have receded, which frightened the girl very much. The Lord smiled and said that he had prepared something for them as a gift, which surprised them very much, while the girl continued to cry because she could not eat bread. The Lord said that he was going to light up the area, so he used his finger and magical power to make fireworks. A few seconds later, beautiful explosions began to form in the sky, lighting up everything around. Ray was very happy about what was happening, like a little child. It was really very beautiful, especially in such a friendly atmosphere, and I remembered that he had never paid attention to such things before. So he turned to the Lord and asked him for friendly advice. Did it really take a lot of mana to do such a thing? He was a little embarrassed and said that this might be the last time he would not see each other. He wanted to do everything in his power. This made Ray very happy, as he seemed to have found some really good friends for himself. If this is really the case and they see each other for the last time, which is of course unlikely, then he would also not mind giving them a gift. Therefore, he also decided to do a standard trick, which he had already shown to Iela in the forest. Ray took his finger and ordered it to light up and make an explosion. A second later, a beautiful glow formed in the sky, which very much resembled lightning. It perfectly complemented the fireworks the Lord had made, making them much more colorful and vibrant. The maids watched the fireworks in the sky and were very happy, as it was a real miracle. The Duke also drank wine and watched the situation unfold through the window, rejoicing that they were lucky enough to meet such guys. Layla held her cheeks and was very happy, because she understood that it all looked really incredible, especially since she had never seen such beautiful fireworks before. The Lord was also surprised, because not everyone can achieve such a high understanding of magic, so he once again praised the saint and said that he would never forget this night. Ray smiled and said that he was really very glad that he was lucky enough to spend such a wonderful time with them. It would also fill him for a long time. Magic is too convenient a tool, so he considers giving up his personal aspirations, but in the end, he still managed to understand that his methods of medicine work. Thanks to this, he was able to develop new relationships and create wonderful memories, so he will travel only as long as it takes to cure the maximum number of people, but still they need to now start going to the Holy Kingdom. Finally, Ray and the saint decided to head to the Holy Kingdom of Taya, the path to which was quite long, which is why it began in the morning. Although they had a long journey ahead of them, thanks to the support of the Duke, they were able to continue their journey calmly, without any problems. The Saints squad knew that all this support was thanks to Ray. They thanked him for this, because they would be able to have a very good lunch anywhere and relax, restoring their strength. Time passed. Ray was just gaining a good reputation for himself and began to get a little upset, because in just a couple of days he had become so accustomed to tents. Suddenly they came up to him and said hello, which surprised him a little, because the voice was somehow unfamiliar. It was one priest who said that she was very inspired by the game he created, so she decided to present him with some strategies for it to make it more interesting to play. She was not alone, but with a whole team at once, so she invited him to look at their development, and perhaps even play, if Ray, of course, was not busy. He was surprised because there were too many of them, but still agreed, because why not? There's nothing to do anyway. In return, he promised to spare absolutely none of them, especially newcomers like them. The priests were a little scared, but still agreed, even though they had a bad feeling. Thus began a team chess tournament, completely spontaneously, where Ray defeated his first opponent in just 4 moves. The guy was also defeated in a similar way, which shocked him very much, because how does Ray manage to win in just 4 moves? Since they all didn't know that Ray took part in the World Chess Tournament in his previous life, all 7 players lost to him in 4 moves. This is how he set a record without defeat and was very proud of himself, since he had not experienced such feelings for a long time. The priests were shocked, the girls began to say that they knew that he was invincible, and the accompanying squad forever changed their opinion about him. So another day passed on the way to the Holy Kingdom, after which the team went for a good rest before the no less long journey that lay ahead of them. The next morning the weather was not entirely good, as large clouds appeared in the sky, but still no rain was expected. Ray began to worry a little, as he had the feeling that during all this time they had not actually moved from their place. Perhaps it was because they were coming such a long way. Iela approached him and informed him that as soon as they left these surroundings, the Holy Empire would already be very close, which made the guy very happy. The ground began to shake sharply under his feet and Ray rose from his chair, barely able to stand, not understanding what was happening. The soldiers began to panic, since they had never encountered anything like this before, so they were very scared. The earthquake was caused by a crowd of orcs who were out hunting, so the commander ordered everyone to take positions and prepare for battle. Ray realized that it looked like the soldiers were fighting monsters there and suggested that Iela go to help, but she smiled, saying that she was completely confident that they could handle it themselves without any problems. But why not help them get on the road faster? There must clearly be more than 3 orcs there. But the answer was very simple, because if they came out, they would have to change their positions to protect them. This would cause discussion in the ranks and would do much more damage. So she looked at the guy and asked him to leave everything to the knights of the kingdom. Ray understood that she was partly right, but the orcs did not stop and continued to attack the army. One of them threw a huge stone towards the knights and was ready to destroy absolutely everyone who stood in their way. The knight on horseback parried one of his blows, complimenting the orc, since he himself did not expect that he could be so powerful. He clenched his teeth, because he understood that they no longer had any other choice. Therefore, he immediately shouted to the middle detachment and ordered them to reform to protect the saint and saint from the attackers. He ordered all the soldiers to try to prevent the orcs from passing towards them, but at that moment an attack was already being prepared on him. His name was Hirio and right now he was shocked by what he was seeing before his eyes. The orc's huge fist flew straight at him at high speed, making it very difficult to dodge. But Ray came to the rescue, who activated his superpower and created a shield that stopped the orc and forced him to stop. After that, he smiled, saying that even if he gets out, it certainly won't get any worse, because it seems like the knights are having a little trouble now, doesn't it? Hirio was shocked by this outcome of events and immediately began to turn to Ray, asking what he was doing here, because it was really very dangerous here. He smiled and said that everything was fine and the situation was under control. Everything looked like the orcs were superior to the knights in strength, so they could use some help. Ray stopped and used his magical powers to stop them. It was like lightning that swept across the entire earth and completely captured all the orcs in its path. It was triple magic, which even the guy himself was a little surprised by, because he had never used it in practice before. The binding, earth spear, and fire obeyed him this time, so he began to attack the orcs with all his might, practically burning them alive. Iela was very surprised by this, because he had never seen anything like this before, so he asked the guy if he was injured and how he was feeling. In addition, he thanked the guy for blessing him with his protection, but he asked not to worry about this, since they should help each other. If the commander is not mistaken, then the saint is quite young. How can he use such strong magic like this? Ray closed his eyes and said that he smelled like roasted meat, so he wondered what orcs tasted like. The guy was able to use a fourth circle spell, an earthen spear, and all this only with the help of words. But how else could he use binding and fire along with that? Perhaps he is a magician of the fifth circle or even reached the status of even the sixth circle of magic, but he did not care, as he continued to smile and enjoy his victory, calling out to Iela. She looked at him and asked if he was really trying to exploit the rumors about how brilliant he was throughout the continent. What does he mean by this? Nothing, he just has a very strange feeling. For some reason the orcs have become so strong, maybe someone is training them. She had a bad feeling, so she said that they need to move on before the monsters unite, but Ray said that it was already quite late. As armies of other goblins began to appear from behind the bushes and were ready to fight, Iela couldn't believe it, because the goblins would also have to have a lot of courage to stand in their way to the Holy Kingdom. Therefore, he ordered his knights to take care of them, because they did not have the opportunity to waste so much time. So the knight rushed into battle to clear the way and eliminate the threat, swinging his sword. But at the moment of the blow, the goblin jumped back sharply and began to laugh loudly, thus humiliating the warrior. He was shocked by this outcome of events, because how could this be? Are these specially trained goblins who cannot be gotten rid of so easily? After that, he was dealt a strong blow by the green monster, who apparently did not want to endure humiliation in his direction. He wounded the knight and caused him severe damage, although he still could not understand why the goblin was so strong and how he could just do it. He looked at him and did not understand how he was able to achieve such power. Ray looked at Iela and asked if she thought this goblin looked quite unusual. It was already difficult for her to disagree with this. She looked towards the fight and said that now they have no other choice, so they must intervene. Without hesitation, she took a step and was also ready to fight, since they simply had no other options. A second later, a large protective field formed near her, which scattered all the goblins who tried to attack her. Iela did not feel sorry for them at all, so she mercilessly destroyed them one by one, trying to avenge her knights. Ray began to think that perhaps Iela would actually be stronger than him in martial arts, but at that moment she shouted to the guy and warned him that a nasty goblin was attacking him right now. With no time to think, Ray swung his arm and used the force of the wind to push the goblin back. No matter how many they kill, goblins will still keep appearing out of nowhere, so if they just stall for time, they simply won't be able to deal with them. It would be great if they could destroy everyone at once, so Ray got excited about this idea and began to think about how to make it a reality. So he looked at the goblins and called them to him, getting their attention. He began to make faces in order to provoke as many goblins as possible to attack him and gather them all in one place. They were a little surprised, because people had never done this to them before, so they didn't even quite understand how to react to it and stood in bewilderment. Ray continued to tease them and run away, gathering a large crowd of green monsters around him who tried to catch him. Iela was scared, because she didn't know what he was planning. The only sounds that could be heard were running, scattering leaves, and dust throughout the forest. Iela didn't understand what was happening. Maybe this was some kind of spell. Ray stopped near a tree, because it seemed to him that he had already run enough. He exhaled and wanted to rest a little, because he understood that there were a lot of goblins gathered in front of him, much more than he could have expected. Ray began to worry whether he had taken them far enough from the others, but there wasn't much time to think, so he extended his hand and created a huge fireball. The goblins, seeing this, could not contain their laughter. They found it funny, because is this really all that the guy is capable of? Ray smiled too, asking if they were really having so much fun right now. Therefore, he suggested that they talk about this a little later, when he showed them what he was capable of. A second later, he activated his abilities to maximum and a large flame flew towards the goblins, which looked like a meteorite and noticeably instilled fear. Ray continued to laugh at them, because now they themselves understood what situation they were in, because he had prepared a separate ball for each of them. The two goblins were perplexed and pointed their fingers towards the guy. Right at that moment, they were all torn apart as a large explosion was created that could be compared to the power of an atomic bomb. The knights who were at a very far distance were also blinded by such flames. Southwest they tried to close their eyes so that so much light would not fall on them. The commander was very happy, because now he understood where and why the saint ran. He began to worry about him, so he shouted in his direction and started running to help, asking if everything was okay with him. A huge hole appeared at the site of the explosion, several meters deep, and as happens in films, Ray emerged from the smoke and immediately began addressing the soldiers and asking how long they were going to stand idle, because it seems they still have a very long way to go, doesn't it? He smiled and suggested that they all hurry up to get out of this forest, and also hoped that they would not meet any more monsters on the way. The soldiers asked for a little time and said that very soon they would be ready to leave. Near the fire, Ray decided to ask Iela, as he was very interested, are usually monsters as strong as the ones they encountered today? She replied that no, because their squad often copes with them on its own, but today it was very difficult. She was a little upset and emphasized his mana, which really surprised the guy. He also thought that if he undergoes the baptism ceremony, his mana will disappear forever, but Ray still did not understand whether this means that it will completely disappear from his body. If he is baptized in the Holy Kingdom, God himself will bestow upon him divine power, but as we know, the human body can only store one type of power, and divine power has the same properties as mana. If divine power enters his body and mana is present there, most likely it will not withstand it and the guy may die. Therefore, before bestowing divine power on him, the mana in Ray's body will gradually be replaced by divine power. He asked what happens to those people who have no mana. In this case, divine power will fill the body without any problems. But what about the mages and their circles of power? They can't save them, right? This is a really good question. So Ray continued, is it possible that magicians who do not have magic circles can gain divine power? But things work completely differently. God will create vessels for mana in the body so that they can use their divine power. Once this happens, the mana vessels created by God, which they used to call golden chains, will control all the mana that circulates in his body. But what are golden chains? This is just a term that the saints came up with. They cannot go against the word of God as they are not allowed to say or do anything that goes against their faith, so they call it the golden chains. They can't even say what they really think, so Ray also thought about it. After all, their actions contradict their own taboos, so he asked a logical question, what will happen if you break the rules? Iela took the sticks in her hand and decided to remind them that she said that golden chains control the mana in the human body, so if you break the rules, then all the mana in the body will disappear, and he will disappear with her. So in order to better demonstrate this, she threw these branches into the fire, after which she began to laugh an evil laugh, saying that the disappearance would happen forever. Ray wondered, could one extra word really destroy him? This is pretty much a threat to anyone who dares to say what they want. But Iela tried to calm him down, because in fact there are not many people who disappeared in this way, so Ray needs to be careful to avoid this. In any case, this is nothing for the saint, even though he will lose the mana that is now flowing in him. Ray was a little scared because he still had so many questions that he wanted answered, so he decided to try to get it. If the mana disappeared from his body, would he be able to get it back later? But Iela upset him, because if the mana disappears, it will be forever, and it will be impossible to return it. She asked Ray not to be upset, because divine power also has its advantages. He may not be able to use magic, but he will be able to cast divine spells on others. He closed his eyes, as he did not want to say goodbye to his achievements, but Iela calmed him down, telling him that he could be very useful during the battle. But this did not help him, since all he was thinking about now was how not to lose his mana and gain divine power, so he promised himself that he would try to find a way. The knights informed the saint that they were almost there and were arriving in the Holy Kingdom. Ray smiled because they were finally arriving, as it had taken quite a long time. The priest looked out the window and Iela asked him as soon as they crossed the border to go straight to Salonia. Ray was unhappy, because why are they going to the capital again? Does she really mean that they are going to perform the ritual without even resting beforehand? But she reassured him, because they did not plan to hold a baptism immediately upon arrival. The baptism ceremony is an event that is celebrated by absolutely everyone. However, Ray already knows nothing about the Holy Kingdom, so he will have to gain as much knowledge as possible before performing the ritual. Yes, this is important, but who will teach him then? Iela proudly said that she would personally look into the matter. Etiquette, discipline, and everything related to baptism will be her responsibility. She smiled and said that she would tell and teach the guy everything she knew. At the entrance they were greeted by a huge and very beautiful castle, which delighted all visitors with its beauty. No matter how much Ray looked at it, he always couldn't take his eyes off it, since it was truly a magnificent mansion on a completely different level, compared even to Silo's castle. He couldn't believe his eyes. Was it all his now? All the saints live in this estate, so it is a sacred place that even priests need permission to enter. Even the people working inside have been specially selected and have status, so there is nothing to worry about. Within 2 days, Rei will need to undergo training, which Iela spoke about even earlier, which of course he was already tired of, although it had not even begun. Rei still couldn't understand why the head of the mansion, who was supposed to be training him, suddenly became so busy. At the same moment, someone came up to him and said hello. It was the maid who said that she was ready to show Rei to his room, because he was probably very tired after the trip. He smiled, because such a beautiful maid suited him very well, so he began to think that he could talk to her properly later. Just like Uriel said, of course she must have some kind of status, because she also does not look like an ordinary person. She led him into a room, near the entrance to which there was a vase, telling him that the guy needed to come here. The maid showed him his room and said that now he could arrange himself here the way he wanted, and the room looked simply incredible, you must admit. She lowered her head and asked him to get some rest since she would be forced to leave him right now, so Rei smiled and thanked her for her work. He was very surprised, because such wonderful communication really amazed him. He could not believe his eyes. Rei really becomes a saint. Who would have even thought about it before? The next morning, a small discussion began in the castle, where the speaker asked for a moment of attention. She said that they really don't have much time, so there is a lot to do and study, so they need to focus as much as possible. Uriel waved her pointer, asking why not take a look at the materials she had prepared. But Rei could not perceive her normally, since he was very annoyed that she was so joyful. She continued the story, saying what would happen if you looked at the first page, but Rei interrupted her, saying that he had already learned everything. No one could believe it, but he smiled and said that the 3-day baptism ceremony is divided into 3 main categories: the welcoming ceremony, then declaring him a saint, and finally receiving divine power from God. So of these 3 steps, the last one takes place in a holy place with saints in absolute isolation. And also during baptism, the saint should not lower his head and he is allowed to greet others only with his left hand, placing it on the upper abdomen, at an angle of 70 degrees. Uriel was shocked and continued to listen, because there are 3 more basic rules of behavior at the table: do not make sounds while eating, never lower your head, and always keep your back straight so that your elbows do not go behind your body. She couldn't believe that the guy remembered everything so perfectly, so she began to wonder if he was even human. But he was interested in the 3rd part of the ceremony, because he did not understand what exactly he needed to do after it, because nothing was said about it. He looked at his hand and said that the only thing he knew was that he would need to show his sincerity to God, so he asked the girl to tell her what she did before her ceremony. But she said that absolutely nothing, she just ate and slept all week, which really surprised the guy, because he thought she was joking all the time. But this was the truth, because after a week, mana vessels appeared in her body and she felt divine power begin to flow through her body. Did the vessels of divine power appear without her knowledge? How is this possible? Maybe that's why she is called divine. In any case, Rei remembered all the information, but Iela reported that his manners really left much to be desired. Even if his memory is beyond human understanding, he cannot in any way learn the custom, because memorizing everything and showing himself in action are 2 completely different things. She smiled and said it was time for a good snack. It was she who would personally test all his skills in action, to which Rei kindly agreed. Like a real aristocrat, he put a napkin on his clothes and straightened his back, preparing to eat the prepared dish with a knife and fork. The girl was shocked that he knew everything, so she decided to ask if he was doing well. The answer to this question was obvious, of course yes, but she didn't calm down, so she started waving her hand, saying that there were still a lot of things that needed to be worked on, so the guy should put him down. But what exactly? He didn't understand what she needed from him. Did she really want to fight with him? Rei didn't understand why she was so strict and what she wanted from him, but now she continued to shout at him, ordering him not to talk with his mouth full, but he still couldn't understand why, what was going on. She smiled and said that the annoying nobles would find fault with everything he did, so she planned to keep an eye on him throughout his training so that no one could shame him later. Rei was surprised and said that he did not need this help, so let the girl go and rest, but she insisted that this was very important, because how could she go to rest if Rei was in such a predicament? At that moment, the dialogue was interrupted by the maid, who approached the saint and asked her permission to express her thoughts. She believes that Rei should not yet live in the mansion allocated to the newly minted saint, as this may attract too much attention and lead to rumors about them. She understands that this is rude, but still insisted on considering this point of view, since she was simply sharing her thoughts to avoid trouble. The saint thought about this and looked in her direction. She sat back in her chair and asked the maid's name. Her name is Belacroix C. Yuklawood. Did she really tell Belacroix? This is one of the 3 noble families. The thing is that within the Holy Kingdom there are 3 families that are served by saints. In addition, there are also 6 families who have received the title She, which are known for their achievements. So why is such an important person like her chosen as a servant in the saint's estate? Although she tries to smooth things over, Iela understands that the maid needs to be very careful here. Therefore, she herself understood everything and said that it was better for her to return to herself, which was really the right decision in the current situation, because Iela was already starting to get angry. Iela looked at her and there was a really suspicious look in her eyes. It looked like she was trying to analyze her completely. So she said that she would remember the girl and thanked her for the advice, so as not to look quite uncultured. Ray also looked at her and was surprised by the name Belacroix. If she has a title, that means she's a noble, but do nobles even work as servants? The status of a saint was indeed much more significant than he thought, and this pleased him, since he had loved power since childhood. Night fell and everyone went to their rooms to sleep. Suddenly the doors opened sharply and made a rather unpleasant creak, which was not very audible. Ray, meanwhile, was already fast asleep, as he was very tired and heard absolutely nothing near him. The same maid approached him, whose eyes glowed with a red light. It seemed she was ready to do something very bad now, but her motives were not yet entirely clear. She held her palm near the guy's head, seemingly trying to cast a spell. Then she clenched her hand into a fist and hit him on the shoulder, but not too hard, so as not to wake him up. Her look spoke for itself. It looked like she wanted to take revenge on him for something, perhaps because he took her place and became a saint. After this ritual, she turned around and left the room, also with glowing red eyes. The next morning, Ray decided to drink a cup of coffee to cheer himself up and get ready for a long day of work. He looked at the maid and praised her for being able to make a truly delicious tea, after which she thanked him and informed him that it was brewed using flower petals from Ceylon herbs. Last night she entered the room so quietly that even the attentive Ray, who is skeptical about all this, could not notice her. However, she did nothing, and the next day was as peaceful as possible, as if she had never planned anything. Uriel looked at her and reported that she was quite suspicious. She approached the saint again and said that everything was ready for the ritual, so he needed to follow her, but he was very surprised, because the beginning should be in the afternoon. But the maid insisted on this, because the guy still had a lot to prepare for the ritual, which really surprised him. Uriel also smiled and said that Ray must impress a lot of people. The ceremonial outfit suits him very well, isn't it surprising? Now no one will be able to take their eyes off him. The maid apologized for being late, since she understood that everyone should have already gotten ready, but Ray reassured her, because weren't they still there? They were exactly where they were supposed to be, and inside the room that these doors separated, the Pope and the highest nobles were already waiting for the guy, so he himself began to worry. He had no other choice, so he opened the doors and decided that he would at least go in first. He began to walk along the red carpet and caught the gaze of all the people who came to watch the ceremony, so he was a little nervous, as he was not ready for such popularity at that moment. People looked at him and were also shocked, because they could not understand how this child could become a saint. One of them was very nervous, but still understood that now was his chance and he needed to act immediately. He and his companion walked closer to Ray and bowed his head as a sign of respect, after which they began the process of getting to know him. Ray was already excited, so the girl's hand separated him from the nobles. Uriel said that she was very glad that they wanted to meet the saint, but this went against the rules of etiquette of the previous ceremony, so after the ritual they would have a chance to congratulate him. One of them was very upset, but still both understood that the girl was indeed right now. The maid also asked them to be more polite to the saint before the ritual and rude behavior should also be avoided. They apologized for this and did not understand why the young lady from the Belacroix family was wearing a maid's outfit. She walked right behind the guy and said that she would take him out somewhere, but he didn't understand why he should do this, because they were already on her. He needs to remember to say a few words about how he is preparing to officially become a saint, but this really surprised him, because why didn't the girl warn him about this earlier? Now he understood what she meant when she said that he would have to impress many people. They asked him to calm down and not worry, but just tell him how he feels right now and be polite, and people will understand it all the way they want, because they always do. Ray began to get very worried, because he didn't know what he needed to say now. Uriel decided to cheer him up, so she clenched her hand into a fist and smiled, wishing the guy good luck. He was also very happy to hear this, so he smiled back at her, even though he was panicking wildly. Meanwhile, in front of him stood a huge number of people, one might say an entire army, who were right now waiting for what the saint was going to say. He began to worry and didn't know what to say, because it was much easier to discuss this, but when there are so many people here, everything becomes completely different. Did they all really come here for him? The maid invited the guy to take something in his hand. Ray panicked and didn't understand what it was, but she assured him that it was just a magical instrument. If he took it, his voice would sound much louder. But he said that he didn't need it at all, so he decided to make something like that from his hand, until the maid said that without it, people wouldn't hear him. A second later, a bright explosion occurred in the sky that illuminated the entire kingdom. The maid didn't understand what it was, because could it really be magic? Ray, meanwhile, began checking his own microphone and asking the nobles how they could hear it. They were shocked by this behavior, because they didn't understand where his respect was. To think that God would choose someone as young and inexperienced as him to grant him divine power. He really doesn't know what to say, so he says what he feels. He said that his name was Ray and he grew up as an ordinary little boy in a village near this city, but then he was chosen as a saint, and he made a promise that before coming here, this promise was important to him. He wants to make sure that the Holy Kingdom leads this continent. So he asked the nobles for permission to make this statement and make a promise to the people of this land. His name is Ray and he swears that the Holy Kingdom will be the strongest on this continent. He was sure that hearing something so bold from such a young boy might seem a little funny to some of them. However, it is true, so he spread his arms to show people his superiority, surprising the maid. All the people were also shocked, because they couldn't believe it. Ray extended his hand to his heart and said that for now they believe in him and support him. He will do his best to help all of them, after which he sent a huge magic ball into the sky to shock the audience. People could not understand what it was it really a meteorite and how could this be? Because this is the magic of the ninth circle, which only high magicians are capable of. After this, they realized that Ray was the high magician and began to welcome the new saint. When the show ended, he commanded the meteorite to disappear with a simple snap of his finger. All the people rejoiced and continued to praise the new saint, and the guy himself was already very pleased, although he did not understand where he now needed to go. Therefore, the maid decided to help him and asked him to follow her. She also asked for the future not to make such loud speeches next time, since it was quite promising. But Ray was surprised by this, because why was she telling him about this only now? The Holy Arch welcomed the new saint and shone, letting in the heavenly rays. The guy asked if they had finally arrived at the new place. Yes, that's why he needs to lie down in a circle. The maid said that as soon as he felt that he was spiritually ready, he should ask God for a gift, which greatly frightened and surprised the guy, making him nervous. He lay on this stone and did not understand that he even needed to speak, so he closed his eyes and thought that maybe he should just greet him first. Therefore, with his eyes closed, he began to greet him, but there was still no answer. After a while, he opened his eyes and was very surprised, because it looked like something had just happened. He began to become hysterical, because it looked like he had simply fallen asleep without knowing it. The so-called god didn't even show up and his back was starting to hurt from lying on a hard surface after spending the last couple of days in a good bed. Ray looked around and didn't understand where Iela was now and why she wasn't next to him. But she stood on the other side with her eyes closed, which really surprised the guy, because had she really been next to him all this time? So he thought that maybe he should get up for the sake of Iela and not at all because his back hurts, but she came closer to him and asked if God had answered all his questions. Ray smiled and said that it was definitely God and his voice would never leave his mind. She said that this was quite impressive, because even Iela took the whole day, which surprised the guy. The maid said that he really was a saint, so he began to laugh, saying that there was nothing special about it, but still after that he wondered, should he tell her the truth? At night, conversations began, during which it was discussed that the appearance of the saint would greatly change all their plans. Their main enemy is the Holy Kingdom, so they should act more carefully and just wait for the right moment. However, when the time comes, they must ensure that the Holy Kingdom falls, no matter the cost. None of them understood whether Ray had already completed his ritual or not yet, but isn't that impressive? After all, the ceremony can begin right now, since Marquis Hellard himself personally insisted on this. His son came closer to him and asked if his father really wanted to see him. He was visibly upset because he needed to have a pretty serious conversation with his son, so he asked him if he had heard about the new saint who could summon meteorites. He simply has to win him over to his side. He patted him on the shoulder and said that now this is definitely their chance that cannot be missed. After that, he leaned closer to him and said that they had already lost a saint, so if they could gain the favor of a new saint, that would be just wonderful. In this way they will be able to strengthen the influence of their family on the Holy Kingdom, which could not but please the eldest son of the Marquis Hellard, whose name is Barrett. Therefore, his father ordered him to make sure that they could get along well during the banquet, and he should also remember to treat him with the utmost respect, regardless of his true age. He once again emphasized this, ordering that special attention be paid to these factors so as not to become his personal enemy. After they parted, the guy smiled and told his father that there was no need to worry so much. He had already heard that he was a simple guy from the village who was nothing of himself. It was night outside, so he sat and began to think about how he needed to beat everything. Everyone in the castle was already walking around and discussing the new saint. Many people conveyed information about his strength and majesty to the masses, but is he really a simple person and not a saint at all? He's really lucky to have been chosen and to climb this high. It's an amazing life-changing opportunity. The nobles kept laughing at this and asked if they should teach him some basic manners. Count Train seemed to have seen something and closed his eyes to take a better look and analyze the situation. He saw that same man and was very scared. Besides, his partner was no longer laughing at all. Barrett really began to worry, because he had never appeared at banquets before. Why did he decide to do it now? It was the Duke of Trey named Zeke, who came here with a not very happy look. He looked quite pumped up and seemed to be looking for something, as he looked around vigilantly while the rest of the people in the room greeted him. Barrett smiled, although he was very worried, but still began a dialogue, saying that he could not even imagine that people from Treya would be here. But he looked at him with the coldest possible gaze, making it clear that he had absolutely no time for this, because he did not come here to admire Barrett. Hearing this phrase, the girl began to laugh and asked who he was considering then. Her name is Marquise Krellin. He came to see Ray, so he asked if he had already come here or if he was not there yet. The Marquise understood that most likely he had not yet met the saint. Barrett laughed and said that he would arrive soon, so it would be nice to wait for him together. Zeke began to suspect that he might have something urgent to do, because he left them in a great hurry, and Barrett simply continued to try to extract as much information as possible from the lips of his interlocutor. And Zeke continued to scream and scold the guy, because he was completely shameless, even though he wasn't here. Flowers still continued to stand near his room, and Ray wondered if all this was really made especially for him. This is very convenient, because it seems that everything was sewn based on his tastes and preferences, but how did they guess about it? The new uniform suits him very well. Ray didn't understand how she was able to determine his measurements so accurately, and the maid said that she took measurements on the day of his arrival and sent them to the tailor, so she should have fit him perfectly. He smiled, because with enough practice, absolutely anyone can accurately determine the size, so when they first met, he realized that she was amazing, but she turned out to be even much cooler than he expected. She showed absolutely no emotion and just stood there without much interest or desire. But still, after that, out of politeness, she thanked the guy and said that she would take him to the banquet hall. Ray laughed and said that he would not refuse such a thing, but he still could not believe that the girl had absolutely no reaction to his statements and jokes. A lot of people had already gathered in the living room and everyone was waiting for the start of the event, or rather, for its most important guest. The nobles saw Ray and began to discuss that he came much later than he promised, so the girl began to calm him down, because perhaps he needed time to get ready. Therefore, she decided to defuse the situation a little and asked if they had heard what happened during the ritual. Yes, but not in detail, so Barrett told him that Ray inspired everyone with his speech, but still he laughed, because he is nothing more than a simple person. After this phrase, he was a little scared, because the butler asked everyone present for a moment of attention, since a new saint had just arrived here. Ray looked like a real emperor and fully corresponded to his image of a saint. A smile reigned on his face, and he was accompanied by an equally beautiful girl, who seemed to be plotting something further. All the people began to be surprised, because many of those present had not yet seen him, so they began to discuss among themselves that they had imagined him completely differently, but such a small boy emanated great confidence and calm. Barrett immediately ran up to him and said that he was the eldest son of Marquis Hellard, so Ray smiled and said that he was very pleased to meet the members of the Hellard family and it was also a great honor for him. The son was starting to get nervous, because he didn't see Ray make even one mistake. At that moment, Ray continued to stand confidently and introduce himself to all the guests present, continuing to say that he was honored by all of this. He began to panic, because at this rate all his plans could collapse greatly and he would have to suffer punishment from his father. So he began to try to take control of the situation, because he had heard before that Ray was a common man, so he needed to strike back to prove himself. Ray replied that he was from a small village, which is located near the kingdom of Cilia, so Barrett straightened his arms and assumed that in this case, Ray was attending such a banquet for the first time, but still he thought to himself that it was unacceptable for a simple person to come to such events. He couldn't come to terms with this, but Ray smiled and seemed to read his thoughts, because he immediately replied that it was really his first time at such a celebration. As Barrett said, truly ordinary people are not allowed to such banquets. Saints are not commoners, so this does not apply to you. At such banquets there is nothing for any mediocrity to do. Yes, there are people like him everywhere. They cannot come to terms with the fact that others have something that they do not have, so they cannot just quietly and calmly watch from the sidelines and behave tactlessly, trying to interfere in the affairs of others. Indeed, some people are simply worse than trash. Ray smiled again and said that Barrett seemed to really believe that status determined a person's worth, but that was just common sense. What these people have in common is that they end up digging their own graves. Ray looked at him and said that he was not at all used to such a life, so it was difficult for him to understand them, but Barrett understood that it was better not to be rude and also said that he had already forgotten what they were talking about. Suddenly, unexpectedly, the guy began to continue to be bombarded with questions that he was not quite ready to listen to, let alone answer. But Barrett continued to stand his ground and said that Ray was a commoner in the past. Therefore, he took a sword from his holster and decided to swing it sharply. It seems he decided to attack the guy. Ray was shocked, because this was his first banquet and he was already receiving similar behavior in his direction. The ground near the arches began to shake and an unpleasant sound of a sword whistling was heard throughout the area. Behind Barrett stood Zeke, who came to this event for a reason, holding his sword to the guy. Seeing this situation, Barrett was very frightened and started screaming. He really started to have a strong panic. Ray wasn't ready to see it either, so he started yelling and reprimanding Zeke, asking him why he was doing this. Isn't it dangerous? It's good that he stopped the sword with his mana, so Zeke decided to apologize for such an act. He apologizes for making such a bad first impression on him, so he immediately fell to his knees and bowed his head, causing the guy to feel misunderstood. But Zeke just wanted to let him know that he couldn't let that idiot humiliate the guy, even though he knew it was rude. He couldn't hold back any longer. He looked at Ray and simply continued to ask for forgiveness, but he was shocked, because he did not understand what he was doing. His servant also asked Ray for the opportunity to compliment, since everything that Barrett from the family of Marquis Hellard said was blasphemy, so she also did not understand how he could allow himself to make Ray look like a fool. Zeke jumped at the opportunity, saying that they must destroy him and ensure that the family was punished accordingly. Hearing this, he was very scared, but they continued to discuss it, saying that this would serve as an excellent example for others. Ray agreed and asked Yuklawood to call Marquis Hellard, so she ran quickly to carry out this instruction. But Iela interrupted her, saying that there was no need to run anywhere, since he was here and saw everything himself from the second floor. The father began to insult his son, and he was shocked and did not know how to properly apologize. Therefore, he himself could not stand it and was the first to hit his son with his hand, calling him a complete idiot. He continued to beat him for several minutes, and also did not stop his insults at all, because he seemed to have forgotten what order his father had given him. What right does he have to treat a saint like that? Everyone was shocked when they saw this picture, where a father beat his son for several minutes for such behavior, so no one even intervened, but simply watched, thinking about whether it was worth stopping him or not. The father began to ostentatiously fall to his knees, offering his deepest apologies, ordering his son to do the same, because all this happened because he raised him poorly. He looked at Barry's and continued to shout at him, ordering him to immediately apologize for his behavior, so he even began to stutter a little from fear. The maid and Zeke in the background were discussing this whole situation and sincerely did not understand how he dared to say such a thing in the presence of a saint, so Zeke also offered his help, saying that he could punish him properly. Ray was already annoyed by this, so he asked everyone to stop swearing and calm down and began to think about how he could stop it. He looked at his father, who was no less frightened, and then asked what he thought would be the best punishment for his son. The Marquis clenched his teeth and became noticeably nervous, and cold sweat began to pour down his body. He said that Barry's lost his mother at a fairly early age, and he should have raised him as a good father. He was upset because he didn't want him to have the same life as him, so he had to give him a good life without flaws, making it his personal promise. Therefore, he looked at the guy and said that if there was such an opportunity for him to forgive him the first time for such unreasonable actions, in exchange for this, as expected, he would renounce his title and donate his fortune to the temple. But shouldn't the punishment only affect his son? How can a parent not correct his child's mistake? Ray was very surprised, because the father is really going to give up his title right now because of his son. He quietly called Barry's, who stood up in panic and waited for what Ray would tell him. He continued to kneel in front of all the guests of this palace, so Ray asked if he realized his mistake. Therefore, Barry's agreed that he really spoke blasphemous words to him, but Ray was very kind today, because if the father was the same as his son, he would also punish Marquis Hallard for such behavior, but apparently he is completely different person. Not all, Barry's biggest mistake is that because of him, his father has to kneel in the presence of all the guests. Ray smiled and said that he was thinking about his punishment, but because of the sincerity of his father, who seems to really love him very much, he will turn a blind eye to it for the first time and have mercy on him. Therefore, he made it clear that he no longer held a grudge against them and forgave them both, which greatly surprised the maid and Zeke, who seemed clearly shocked by this behavior. The Marquis began to have tears in his eyes, so he began to ask if he was really ready to forgive them. Would he really just not take any action? Ray began to laugh, saying that this is all on the condition that they actually donate money, as they themselves mentioned earlier. The Marquis began to apologize and say that he would donate any necessary amount, and Iela watched the situation and laughed, because this is really a very light punishment for such sins. But still she hoped that he had thought it over and realized his mistakes. At night they approached Ray and asked if he really thought it was worth forgiving him. Zeke said that if the saint gave an order, he would immediately take care of them, but he was already tired of these questions, because why did this blue-haired guy pick on him? Ray stopped and really became a little aggressive, because he realized that the guy was following him practically all the way. It's even strange that he himself didn't pay attention to it. He looked at Zeke and said that even in all this time he had not asked his name. Without hesitation, he also fell to his knees and said that he had committed a really terrible sin and began to apologize, but Ray just wanted to know his name, so he introduced himself again, saying that his name was Tracy Zeke and he was from the Trey family. Ray looked at him and said that the maid also had C after her last name, but what does that mean? C is a title. People who have C in their name serve the saints, and this shows their devotion to them. But why is this so important to so many people? The guy smiled, because he does not at all think that all three families should serve him, and in general it sounds quite funny. She was serious and reprimanded him, since this is a tradition that they have followed since ancient times. Please don't feel burdened by this, it's just the will of God. So Zeke said that if Ray thinks 3 families is too many, then let him just choose him alone and he will do everything in his power. The maid was surprised and noticeably angry with him, so Ray calmed her down, saying that he would not force anyone to leave and there was no need to fight about this. He looked at them and asked what about the 3rd family, because there are only 2 of them now, but the 3rd ensures the safety of the saint from the shadows. Their real identity is not even known to the Holy Kingdom. Therefore, they themselves don't even know who they are, which really surprised the guy. Besides, they know anyway that they are always there to protect him. Ray was very surprised at one moment, as something very strange flashed before his eyes. He looked at the tree and didn't understand how this was possible. She was right, they were indeed there, so now that he knew of their existence, he could sense their mana and use it for his own purposes. He began to count them all in order, as an X-ray was formed in his eyes, which captured these ultraviolet indicators. Ray began to scream, because he counted 7 at once, but the maid simply continued to stand with a stone face, absolutely not surprised by anything. She asked Zeke if he felt anything, but he also didn't feel anything. At that moment, strange voices began to be heard from the tree, which were barely audible. A girl was sitting on him, who, despite his young age, realized that Ray was really a magician, which was very impressive. The next morning the saint had a lot of tasks, especially after such a difficult night, where he learned so many discoveries for himself. At the castle, the first work processes began with Miss Euclid, who greeted the staff, after which she came closer to the picture with swords and thought about her past. She remembered how they shouted at her and ordered her to get up immediately, because she is from the Bellicroix family, so if she can't even do this, then she definitely doesn't deserve to bear the name Bellicroix. The girl was still very young, so she asked her father for forgiveness for this, but he said that the one who would serve the saint could not be weak in any way. So he ordered her to take the sword, because there had never been such a case that 2 saints existed at the same time. Given that they already have a saint, then there definitely should not have been saints in this generation. However, in order to serve a saint who does not even exist, does she have to suffer like this now? But years later, God answered her question by choosing another saint. But this process was interrupted by Ray, who forced the girl to open her eyes and come out of this state, calling her name. He asked if Uriel would actually lead the next ritual, but what does that mean? She was pleased because she had said more than once that the ceremony would be performed by a divinely beautiful woman. Euclid was serious, so she said that if Ray allowed, she would explain everything to him, because except for special cases, only saints can enter the ceremony hall, so it has nothing to do with appearance. He was surprised, so he asked Iriel if this was really so and did she really think it was funny. They went out to walk through the forest and he felt very pleased to be outside for such a long period of time, because he didn't even know that there was a forest here. It reminded him of the time when he sat and studied magic as a child. But the memories did not last long, as Iriel reported that they had already arrived at the right place. Wait, there are knights here, but is there a need for such protection? So this really is the place. Ray was really excited because he didn't understand where they had come from and why there were so many guards. Uriel showed him the steps that rose very high into the sky, saying that this is where the entrance is. She looked at the guy and said that they just need to go up all the way. Uriel smiled because this part of the ceremony is meant to show his respect for God, so he won't be allowed to use magic. What? This is really too cruel. It really started to get dark outside very quickly. Ray was beginning to suspect something, so he asked Iriel to stop and wait, especially since he wanted to rest a little. What would he do without it? She smiled, because they had just begun their journey. Was he really tired so quickly? Looks like someone here is having trouble with stamina. But he denied it, because all this was due to the fact that all yesterday evening the guy walked around the kingdom, talking with people, which the girl herself knows. Therefore, it is logical to guess that he no longer has the strength to continue to walk so much, especially since he is not allowed to use magic, thanks to which there would be no problems at all to get to the highest point of these steps. But she raised her hand and reminded him once again that she had already informed him that from now on they should not use magic, and at the ceremony site it would also be unacceptable. She showed him the road and told him that he had to go all this way on his own, so let him follow the stars and thus get to the desired point, but she once again emphasized that magic should not be used under any circumstances. Ray looked at these steps and wanted to turn back, but the girl encouraged him and believed that he could handle it, and he also understood that he had already gone far enough and could not give up so easily. After some time, he stopped and looked at the sky, and his whole face was sweating. Since the guy was able to overcome all this path, he was exhausted, so he fell to the ground to at least somehow rest, and also did not understand what he was thinking about, agreeing to this. After all, it took much longer than he expected. But his melancholy did not last long, because in front of him he saw a beautiful house, because initially he assumed that there would be a completely empty area. Without further hesitation, he went into it and opened the entrance doors, asking if anyone was here and saying that it looked like he would need to spend 7 days in this place. Iriel also said that he will need to show respect for God, but he doesn't even know what he needs to do, because the girl told him that she hasn't done anything all week. Ray smiled, because he began to perceive this mission as a kind of vacation. Therefore, he went outside to take a closer look at the house and realized that he would have a good rest there, especially since the week would pass very quickly indeed. Only then did he not know about all the trials that were prepared for him and the harsh reality that he would have to face during his stay in this place. He took the apple out of the tree, glad that they were fresh enough. Immediately after this, he decided to eat them, since for such a long period of stress on the body, Ray became quite hungry. He was very happy, because thanks to these apples he was able to eat, but after a second his mood changed greatly. He began to throw them on the ground, because of them he was poisoned, and this is very cruel. Ray began to panic and get angry, because even in order to make fire he had to take a stick, because he promised that he would not use mana, so he had to do everything with his own hands. But how can he survive here? Why didn't anyone tell him anything about this, since even cooking fish is already very difficult? Isn't his suffering enough for them? In the evening he still managed to light a fire, but he still continued to analyze their words, where they promised only 1 week and that it would all last no more than 7 days. But why has he been here for more than a month? Ray was simply furious. It became very unpleasant for him to realize this. All he wanted was to at least find out what was happening here. He started waving his fish and asking if they really decided to make a savage out of him. So he started waving his arms and realized that he no longer had the desire to be a saint. But something stopped him. He was shocked because he did not understand what kind of feeling it was. All this magic happening because he just got angry. Ray waved his hands and was furious. Magical mana, which is given to all saints, began to run through his body, thanks to which it lifted him several meters above the ground. Finally, the process of his transformation began and divine power came to him. He began to fly like a real superhero, but such happiness did not last long. Ray stopped and began to panic, because where did his power go? She simply disappeared, but what should he do then? Luckily she appeared a few seconds later, making a little joke with the guy. From now on everything will be for real. His mana disappeared again and his strength disappeared, so he began to get angry, not understanding what was happening right now. A second later, a huge flurry of mana fell on him, which completely pierced his body, and he finally began to feel it. But then he was lowered to the ground again and all the power disappeared, forcing the guy to stand in bewilderment. He did not understand what was happening, so he wanted to know the answer to this question, because is God himself now playing with him? A very bright glare of the sun appeared in the sky, which seemed to be the answer to his question. A moment later, a huge charge of magic formed from it again, which again flew towards the guy. He was already very angry, because he did not understand what these senseless actions were, since he had been here for a whole month, and the power had not come to him. Therefore, he began to run away, asking God to leave all this, since he no longer had the strength and there was no point in this, because mana appears and disappears. He was already panicking, because this is even more annoying, because he feels how the air around is filled with divine power, and it immediately disappears. He has never been so upset. What kind of mockery is this? As soon as he thought about someone comforting him, Iriel appeared next to him, who seemed to have appeared here for a reason. Ray was happy, because even though the first person he met a month later was Iriel, he was still very happy, because perhaps this only meant that he could leave here today. But that's what Iriel saw. She didn't understand what was happening with the guy and how she could help him. After all this, they had a dialogue where the girl asked whether Ray really claims that he can use both magic and holy power. But he replied that he had not tried magic yet. He was also very surprised, because what happened to her clothes? She replied that she felt a strong divine power and ran to him in a hurry, and also said that the ritual was now over. Ray looked at the girl and said that he needed to cleanse her, which he actually did by using magic. He smiled, because it seemed he could still use it, which made both him and the girl very happy. He can use mana that floats in the air, so why can't he use divine power? Uriel said that it was really a shame, but he remains the one whom God chose, and also an incredible magician, so if someone dares to say something to him, he can simply use magical power against him. Iela seemed to have fallen in love, because she continued to follow him, and maybe it was because of the divine power, but the air around became very pleasant and even Ray began to smell delicious. This surprised him very much, because he did not understand what she was talking about now. It's a warm scent that makes you want to be close to him, so Ray rolled his eyes and realized that he needed to stay away from her for now until he learned to control his power. The servants also came to him in the forest to inform him that they wanted to congratulate him on acquiring strength. The guy was happy, because he was pleased to see Yuklawud and Zeke together, so he also thanked them for the visit. They said it was a great job, and as soon as they heard about the news, they came right away. Zeke insisted that Ray give him his backpack to carry, and Iela insisted that she wanted to carry it and would not mind if Ray gave her more tasks, so he was shocked, because he did not understand what was wrong. They are not like that. He looked at the sky and ordered them to stop as soon as possible, because he wanted to return to his mansion and not waste time on these meaningless things. He looked at Zeke and asked why he was constantly following him. But he said that as a member of 3 families, it was his duty to serve the guy anywhere and anytime, so he would never change his principles, and he would never have bad intentions. All this was really suspicious, so in the mansion, Ray continued to sit in his room at night and wondered when it would end. He looked at the stack of books and wanted to look at them all, because when he became a saint, he promised himself to make the great kingdom the greatest. So he began to read, and since he was now officially a saint, he needed to fulfill his promise. And first of all, he needs to learn more about the kingdom and its history, so in order to understand all these nuances, he had to turn to books for help. He was very happy because he figured out what could be done, because in order to lead the Holy Kingdom, he would create a completely new system. As soon as the sun rose, Ray called all the nobles of the Holy Kingdom to the mansion, to criticize them for not working efficiently enough. Therefore, due to this, he proposed adjustments for agriculture, commerce and trade. Among them was Mill's solar system, which was intended for the agricultural industry. Ray spoke so confidently that he received enormous support from the nobles, so the first technology was approved very quickly. But Count Train was a little worried, so he turned to Ray, informing him that among the things that are written here there are still incomprehensible points, because what does it mean to use priests as mercenaries? But he smiled and said that this is indeed true, the whole point is to send priests as mercenaries. Was Ray really suggesting that he send his priests into battle? Yes, everything is absolutely true. At this moment, the others also began to realize the whole situation, because the fall of the priests will lead to the fall of the nation. In addition, the number of people striving to become priests will decrease. Ray reassured them, because of course the priests would not stand on the front line, they would all be in the rear of the battle. While the wounded at the fronts are brought to the priests, in this way they have the opportunity to avoid casualties among them. But the nobles did not fully understand this, because in any case it is always very dangerous on the battlefield, especially if enemies attack from all flanks. Ray understood this and completely agreed with them, because the battlefield is indeed not a safe place, but with a good strategy, all the priests will return to their families alive. Naturally, he will not send them into battle without a plan, so there will always be paladins near them. With this alignment, their priests will be completely safe, but there is one caveat. Using them as mercenaries is a completely different strategy. If they win without their intervention, that's good, but if they lose, then you'll have to use them as backup. Seeing those who were wounded on the battlefield, as well as witnessing the action up close, must be a truly good experience for the priests. However, the nobleman was not entirely sure of this. Of course, they are indeed a necessary force in battle, but are there really no other options? All for the sake of victory and getting money and glory. But Ray interrupted him and said that using priests as mercenaries is not just money and their honor, but just a nice bonus. He smiled and said that they would send priests to the battlefield, and in return they would receive power, although the interlocutors did not understand what exactly he meant when he said the word power. From the point of view of the peoples who need the help of the Holy Empire, they cannot do anything that could endanger them, and as long as they occupy their troops, they will be able to ask for compensation for the sacrifices made on our part. The interlocutor also thought about this, because it is indeed true, they will have more opportunities to gain control as soon as they begin to allocate their forces, but still, isn't it too dangerous? Uriel also chimed in, saying that despite the risk, she also thought it was a good idea. So she raised her hand and said that she agreed with the saints' ideas, because they are always great. However, she is also sure that the idea of hired priests will cause some backlash. Ray was a little worried, so he asked if this was true, then could they somehow win the favor of the nobility? But Iriel calmed him down, telling him that there was no need to worry, since she would be happy to help him with this. She put her hand on the table and said that there was no point in winning favor, and all they need is the words, "Oh, the most beautiful girl in the Holy Empire. Please help me, Lady Uriel." Ray smiled and had a good laugh, and also noted that the influence that Uriel has is very unusual, so it would not be an exaggeration to say that all the high-ranking nobles are supporters of Uriel. He looked at her again and thought that if she really helped him in this situation, then it would be difficult for everyone to object. This was the best way out, so he had no other ideas at all. In the meeting room, Ray said that they were done for today, so if anyone has other ideas regarding the promotion of the Holy Kingdom, then feel free to tell them. Most agreed with him because they thought his ideas were very good. The Holy Empire slowly improved all of its activities, but it was difficult to completely change the farming method, so they started with a small plot of land for the sake of experimentation. And the public turned out to be not at all against the use of priests as mercenaries, after they received consent from the priests themselves. A lot of letters of help appeared, where people asked them for help from hired priests, so thanks to this function, the Holy Kingdom was able to collect a lot of funds. Ray was happy because his ideas really helped the Holy Kingdom improve their quality of life, but even though everything was more or less in order now, they would still need specialists in various fields, and this would be a very difficult task to think about. Ray spent all his free time in the library, looking for answers to his questions. The librarian also seemed very tired, so the new visitor decided to cheer her up a little. She immediately rose from her chair and was delighted, because Lady Ecklet had really returned so quickly. Yes, she said that she was gone for a while. 3 whole months have already passed since their last meeting. How quickly time flies. It was very strange for her to see so many people in the library, since it was usually empty, so she asked why there were so many of them here. The librarian smiled and said that the saint had been visiting her for several days. Yes, it was he. Even at that moment Ray continued to sit and read the book. It seems that everyone fell in love with him, doesn't it? Therefore, the girl came closer to him and moved a chair near his desk, which surprised him quite a lot, because Ray did not plan to see anyone now. She smiled and greeted him, asking if he was really the new saint. He agreed and asked what she wanted, and he was also haunted by questions. Who is she and why does she communicate with him as with a friend? She took one of these books and asked if they were all devoted to medicine now and had he really read all of them. She began to openly laugh at him, asking if he really managed to remember anything from this. He agreed. Of course it was successful, to some extent. Ecklet continued to laugh, so she asked the guy how to treat a cut from a rusty knife. Ray thought about it and said that she could prevent the symptoms of poisoning if she used holy medicine, after which the wound would heal. She said it was right, but does he himself agree with it? Ray replied no. So she looked at him and asked what he was going to do then to cure the patient. Ray said he would make an incision around the infected flesh, but why? The answer is simple, because everyone thinks that getting cut by a rusty knife is tantamount to poisoning, but this cannot be said. No one will be poisoned by a rusty sword, but around the cut site, an infection can enter the cells. So, it is impossible to cure this perfectly using holy healing, so it would be much better to remove the infected area around the cut, and heal the area itself. Ecklet looked at him and asked what kind of cells he mentioned earlier. But Ray forgot that in this world people don't yet know about the cells in the body. So the girl looked at him and said that maybe these cells he was talking about could not be healed with holy medicine, but wouldn't it be too barbaric to cut out the affected area? Ray agreed with her, but said that this was the only correct way out of such a situation. Ecklet leaned back in her chair, because she realized that as long as they could cure the patient, the method itself would not be so important, but Ray did not quite mean that. She put another hand on the table and stood up, saying that she liked the guy, which shocked him very much, because no one had ever allowed him to behave like that in the presence of Ray. After which she smiled and invited the guy to go to her laboratory, where they could discuss even more interesting points together. She also looked at the fallen book and apologized for not introducing herself. Her name is Iela and she had already begun to announce her position, but Ray interrupted her. He couldn't believe his eyes. Could this really be Iela? She's the manager of the priests, so is she really the high priest? And despite the fact that they met for the first time, the girl heard about the guy even before she got to this castle. So if he needed any medical help, he could call at any time, though to be honest, she didn't really understand why a saint was studying useless medicine. Before him stood a huge number of different books and all this was in the girl's laboratory. Apparently she is also studying medicine, although she says it is useless. Ecklet still hoped that this would help her cure one long-standing illness. Ray looked at her and said that this is something innate, isn't it? She felt very funny. It was a defensive reaction, because how was he not surprised after seeing this? That's why he said that she had this sore since birth. Ray asked if she was blind in one eye and could she feel pain. Ecklet replied that she was not in pain, but she still could not see. Ray noticed a huge number of books on medicine, which were even more numerous than in the library. If she would mind if he looked at all this more closely, after which she gave him a look. These were symptoms noticeably similar to cataracts. He said that it was she, but in this world people did not know what it was, so Ecklet was very scared and began to ask Ray what it was. But he was not yet completely sure, so he began to ask whether the girl could see in the dark. She replied that she really could see a little better at night, so Ray was convinced that it was a cataract and was ready to explain everything to her, so he asked her to look at what he was now drawing. This is the pupil, and next to it the lens. When she looks somewhere, the lens focuses on the light, thereby allowing us to see better, but in her case, the lens is very clouded and this disease is called cataract. She looked at him and asked that if he was telling the truth, then what should she do? If it's a disease, can't it be cured by healing? Maybe it's because the girl was originally born with cataracts, but what if the healing doesn't work? Ray looked at her and said that divine power eliminates disorders in the body and heals them. But what if the divine power does not accept this as a violation? Perhaps for this reason she is unable to heal. But this is a violation, because Eklet has only one-sided eye. This is from the point of view of other people. Maybe from the moment of her birth, the body does not understand that something is wrong. In any case, the girl should clean her lens to cure the cataract, but she did not understand how this could be done. Ray looked at her and said that she needed to cut out the problem area, but still panicked a little, because she did not understand how in this world this could be done without precision tools. Iela started screaming at him, because does he really want to say that she needs to cut out her eye? But Ray said that it's just part of the operating process. First of all, you need to get rid of the clouded lens and replace it with something else. Although he thought about it and decided that it could be simply removed, because there is no artificial lens in this world. He continued to say, because even if they get rid of the cataract, there is no point in this, since she will not be able to restore her vision. Eklet smiled and bowed her head, saying that there was no need to worry about her incurable illness. She was sure that in a couple of years he would be able to find a way. These words hurt her very much, because did she really say right now that Ray would not be able to cope with this task? Even if this is another world, won't it really be able to cure cataracts? He looked at Eklet and ordered her not to worry, as he would definitely help her. She liked this approach much better, so she smiled and looked at the new saint with pride. A second later she burst out laughing very hard, because she couldn't believe it, so she started laughing at the guy and saying that he was really very funny. But still, she told him that she agreed to treatment and invited him to follow her to show him something. This was her laboratory where she spent most of her time. She was founded by the Holy Kingdom so that she could study medicine, so she told Ray to feel at home and take whatever he wanted. His happiness knew no bounds. He could not believe it, but the girl said that she was lonely here anyway, so this is the least she can do for someone who is really interested in medicine. Ray thanked her and every day began to study the girl's illness, almost without getting out of the laboratory. A month later, he already had several prepared test tubes on his shelves, which he tested. He took one of them and began to examine the troll's blood. After contact with air after a short period of time, the blood changes its consistency. And while he was saying all this, she had already become hard, like a piece of jelly. But the blood of different monsters has its own characteristics. Does he really think that from a medical point of view it will be useful to them? Ray thought about it, because it looks like she will most likely really suit them. He was a little scared, so he wanted to ask the girl if it was really impossible to mix the blood of different monsters with each other. She said that this is true, because each monster has its own different blood composition. But there is one exception: unlike other species, in the case of orcs, due to their great adaptability, they can be mixed with other blood. These words made the guy think, so he began to think what good adaptability means and is it possible to somehow test it. It was already getting dark outside and the whole kingdom was getting ready for bed. But the guy still continued to walk through the forest in search of medicine. He was really very tired, so he began to wipe his forehead, deciding that that was enough for today and that he should also go to bed. Something unique near him, but what was it? Was there really an orc and a troll next to him now and both of them were dead, and what if they had just fought? It's like a gift from fate. He glanced at the troll, who was still alive. He noticed a large wound on his body and realized that he was now in a state of shock because he was bleeding. However, it was surprising that he survived after fighting an orc that was twice his size. Now it was the turn to look at the orc, who was lying exhausted. Ray immediately remembered the girl's words. Unlike other species, in the case of orcs, due to their high adaptability, they can be mixed with other blood. He immediately stuck out his tongue and smiled, because this is really a great chance to test all these hypotheses, so if he seizes the moment, he can save him. The troll continued to lie and moan from impotence, but he was a little surprised when Ray connected a blood transfusion machine to his veins. All this time the guy was near him and noticed how the troll woke up and was very scared, so Ray tried to calm him down, but he immediately rushed to the attack, frightening the guy, who asked him only to stay in place and not move at all. Therefore, in order to protect himself and save the blood transfusion machine, Ray used a numb spell and stopped the monster in place. He waved his hands and asked him to calm down, because he did not want to harm him, but on the contrary, he was trying to help him, since he had lost too much blood, so he transfused him with some of it from the orc. He woke up too quickly, so he never had time to finish, but Ray was even more surprised by the fact that the wound on his body began to shrink very quickly. He looked at the blood and didn't understand why it was like that. Had it really just cleared up? Ray waved his hands and was very happy, because it was just perfect. If it worked here, then now he will definitely succeed in public. Ray looked at this place and understood that it was exactly this place that Eklet had told him about. When he transferred the blood of an orc into a troll, it became very pure and pliable for use, so he was very surprised, because he could not even imagine that such a wonderful result could be achieved. It dawned on him that thanks to this method he would finally be able to create his own artificial lens and cure Eklet. He was serious, so he understood that now he first of all needed to get as much blood as possible from trolls and orcs. He wondered where he could find so much blood for his research. Eklet decided that she could solve this issue, so she said that not far from the laboratory there was an abandoned village, and next to it in the surrounding forests there was a place where orcs and trolls were quite common. She looked quite scary, like in horror films. Therefore, Ray immediately went there in search and was worried, because this village used to belong to the village of Hagel, but the girl definitely did not lie when she said that the village was really abandoned. Suddenly something fell very hard, making a rather unpleasant sound, which really scared the guy. He turned his head and saw children there. But what were they doing in this abandoned city? Were they also abandoned and left here to die? Ray came closer to them and said hello, but the guy put his hand on the girl, making it clear that he would be ready to fight if he dared to attack. But Ray just offered them something to eat, giving them some meat. The guy was scared and worried, so Ray calmed him down, saying that the food is quite normal and not poisoned, so it can be safely consumed. He smiled because he was pleased that at least they trusted him. That's why he reached into his bag, because he understood that the only thing he could do now was to help them, at least giving them a little more food. He looked at the children and offered them something else. After they opened the bag, they were very shocked when they saw a huge amount of gold coins. Ray smiled and ordered them to spend this money on the road to Salonia, because there they would already be able to provide for themselves and find food. But the children did not understand why he was so kind to them. He laughed and said that no reason was needed for this, even if he was seeing them for the first time. The children didn't believe him at all, so he continued to reassure them, saying that he really didn't need any reasons. Just to think, this happened as soon as he left the capital. He understood that the current laws did not provide for this at all, so he would need to deal with this issue as soon as he came to the Holy Kingdom. He looked at these ruins, saying that one day he would restore the glory of this place in order to make the Holy Kingdom a much better place. The next morning we had to continue our journey. Therefore, Ray was already on his feet in the morning and went to a large cave. He was a little scared, because he understood that it was quite huge, so perhaps the orcs lived in it. Therefore, you need to be as careful as possible and try not to wake them up. Ray got as close to him as possible from behind, but was still a little nervous. He took out a syringe and apologized to the troll in advance, because he would need to steal something from him. He laughed and said that he would just take some blood from him, after which he came to a village where there seemed to be a huge number of trolls in tents. They were very surprised by his appearance, so they began to grunt, not understanding what was happening. Ray came closer to them and asked them to do a small favor. This made them very angry and surprised, since they were not used to seeing strangers on their land. Therefore, the strongest of them immediately rushed into battle, which made Ray laugh very much, since they did not want to listen to him at all. When he received no response, he waved his hand and immediately used a grappling technique to stop them. He pointed his finger at his opponent and said that it was definitely him. Didn't he really remember how Ray saved his life in the forest? So he stopped and waved his hand, telling him to just stop and listen to him. All Ray needs is to do a favor for him, for which he will repay him well. After meeting them, it was time to go back. Ray walked and was happy holding the test tube in his hands, because thanks to the orcs he was able to test some things today. But first, when he returns, he will need to use everything that he collected. Suddenly, someone in front of him took a step towards him with his boot. This surprised Ray very much, so he also stopped and asked, "Is it really you again?" The girl ran up to him and was in tears, so she grabbed the guy by the clothes and pointed in that direction. At that moment, her brother began to be beaten and thrown against the wall. It was the villain with the bat who took all the money from him and laughed and asked if he now understood why he had to politely give it back when he asked. But the guy didn't give up and started shouting back at him, ordering him to return the money back. Another villain's partner approached him and asked what this boy allows himself, is it really not enough for him? Therefore, he swung his bat and decided to hit him several more times for daring to object to him. Luckily, Ray arrived in time to help, so he grabbed the bat and ordered an immediate stop, which surprised the robber. Therefore, the robber jumped away from him and turned his head towards him, after which he decided to ask who he was. They began to analyze the guy and what he looked like. Ray noticed his wallet with the money that they stole from the guy, but he couldn't believe it a little. But everything fell into place when the robbers pulled out weapons and surrounded Ray, because he had a large bag that they wanted to take for themselves, but they also asked if he didn't think that walking here alone was not a good decision at all. The main one began to laugh, saying that now he would teach him a lesson. At this moment they also began to attack him from behind. Ray was absolutely calm, so he didn't even look in his direction and put out his hand, hitting the enemy with it and inviting the main one to attack. He was shocked by the guy's skill, because he didn't even understand how this was possible. But what exactly? Ray asked if he was really interested in how he knocked him out with one blow. Therefore, he smiled and said that he would not mind continuing. The robbers took out weapons and rushed into battle, asking if he really thinks that everything in life is so simple. A few seconds later, all the attackers were disposed of and lay unconscious on the ground. The children united at this moment and hugged each other tightly. Ray smiled and looked at them, asking if everything was okay with them. He also apologized to them for what happened. Ray took the children with him and invited them to the Holy Kingdom. But the maid was clearly against this, as she said that the mansion is a holy place in which only saints, as well as their servants, can live, since they don't know who these children are, so they cannot let them in. Is it really impossible to do this, even if the saint living here allows them? Can't only 2 children fit in such a big place? But Yuklawud said those are the rules. Ray was shocked, because he couldn't even think that there were such strict rules here. He didn't even know. But he looked at the guys and smiled, asking them not to worry, because if they couldn't live here, he could find them another place to live. The children were shocked by such an act. Ray just came and bought them a house, but he was very surprised, because he didn't even ask them what their names were. So he looked at them and decided to ask, but the children shocked him, because they still didn't have names. This shocked him, so he looked at the guy first and began to come up with some interesting name for him. Ray remembered Christmas and laughed because he had just made a decision, so he said that the girl would be called Mary and the guy would be called Chris, since they had a very good meaning from the place he came from. The children stood in bewilderment and did not say anything, so Ray smiled and asked if they didn't like the names. No problem, he can come up with something else. But the guy put his hands on his sister's shoulders and said that this was not at all true. He just didn't know what to say, because he was very grateful to him. Ray was very pleased to realize that he was also able to help children. They ran up to him and wanted to hug him tightly for what he did for them, thanking him for all this. But there wasn't much time, so it was necessary to continue working in the mansion. Ray still continues to sit and study all the necessary materials, because he needed to come up with a cure for cataracts. Eklit approached him and asked if he was still working on it. She didn't understand what he was going to do, since he sits at work for days on end. But Ray asked her to just wait, because he just wants to help her. Finally, he managed to create an artificial lens, which began to glow magically blue. Eklit decided to find out exactly how Ray wants to help her, because he talked about curing her eye. Has he really abandoned this idea? He raised his glasses and said that of course he knew how to help her. So he showed her the test tube and said that thanks to this he could cure her eye, but she was shocked by this, because did he really think that it would help? She looked at the guy and asked what it was and where he could find it. But the guy confidently told her that it was troll blood. But after studying hundreds of books, she couldn't understand how the blood could become so pure. So Ray explained to her that he simply mixed it with orc blood. As Eklit said, orcs are able to adapt to anything, unlike other species, although Ray learned this by pure chance. While the orc's body can accept blood, during the purification process it becomes pure. That is why he mixed the blood of an orc with the blood of a troll. This is amazing, because they can produce clear blood that is still malleable to manipulation. She asked Ray again if it would really help her heal her eye. But he simply asked her to trust and said that everything would be fine. Ray showed her the lens and told her that he would only have to put it on his eye in order to heal it. Ikla was shocked and started screaming, because at first he said that he was going to cut out this cataract, but now he says that he wants to pour this blood on her eye. So Ray looked at her and tried to reassure her, because technically speaking, they cut out the parts of the lens that were affected, and then they will put it in as a replacement for what was cut out. He looked at Eklit and understood that most likely she needed time to think about it, because after all, she could not even imagine that something like that could be possible. So Ray looked at her and tried to convince her with his eyes of this decision. Then he bent down, making it clear that he respects her and is ready to help if she allows. She was shocked and started screaming, because doesn't he understand what it means for a saint to bow his head? Ray tried to convince her and said that he understood that it was difficult for him to believe, because it sounded between something unreal and impossible, so he asked her to trust, because he would do everything possible to cure her eye. Eklit was shocked, because he spoke quite convincingly. She continued to look at the guy and felt the sincerity in every word of this child, who was really trying to help her, and it sounded very convincing. She felt sincerity in his every word, although she herself understood that this was madness. Therefore, she smiled and kindly agreed to this, because this is already the last hope for her cure, so if there is even the slightest chance of success, then she will grab it. A little later, she was already lying on the operating table, where Ray was preparing everything necessary for the operation. He decided to use mana to keep the girl's eyelids open all the time, and by making an incision in the lens, he is going to remove all the affected areas, and then after removing the entire affected area, he will replace it with a new artificial lens. But although the procedure is not at all complicated, there are still some nuances. At least there is no professional equipment here, but it is also not difficult for him to do everything manually. After all, don't forget who he is, because in a past life he was Park Yu-sung, a brilliant doctor in the world, who was called the Hands of God. After some time, the girl began to open her eyes and come out of anesthesia. Ray looked at her and asked how she was feeling, because her new eye looked really good. She began to be very surprised, because her eye was beginning to make itself felt. Eklet looked to the side, trying to examine the entire room in which she was. She looked out the window and noticed how much better she saw. She even had tears flowing, which means that the eye is functioning normally. Ray noticed this and smiled, asking how the girl was feeling. Was everything okay? He wondered how she was all this healing process. She cried with happiness and smiled, saying that she was completely fine and saw really very well. She couldn't believe it, so she asked him if this was really not a dream. But the guy just smiled. They looked out the window together and rejoiced at the pleasant view and the fact that they had succeeded after so much work. But everything could not be so good for a long time, because someone was already rushing for help. A nobleman ran up to the saint in a panic and said that they now had an emergency situation. A huge army gathered at the borders and was about to march towards the Holy Kingdom. Iela did not understand what he was talking about, so she wanted to find out more information. What kind of army? How many are there and how far are they located? But he leaned over from fatigue and said that for now this is all the information that was reported to him, but it seems that they are not from any particular nation. Iela was shocked, because it seemed that this army had been assembled by a necromancer and it was heading straight towards them. Not far from the kingdom there were terrible magical clouds that were moving towards the kingdom. Even a simple flower that grew in the forest could no longer do this, since it was already destroyed by the monster with its metal leg, around which there was magic. A few seconds later, everything in the forest was covered with a purple curtain that inspired fear. A terrifying army of a necromancer was approaching the Holy Kingdom, who gathered all his strongest fighters in order to enslave all the inhabitants of the kingdom. There was no time to hesitate, so a state of emergency was immediately declared. Tomorrow will finally be a day of holy war. Are all preparations ready? With the paladins at the front, all guardsmen and knights will protect rear. Many lives are at stake, so make sure you prepare yourself mentally before battle. The knights began to discuss all this, because they still can't believe they about face the undead. It's times like this when I have thoughts about my family. Rather than praying to God, I thought that my family first as well. I should have made the trip to see them before I came here. Same, praying to God was the last thing I thought of. I happened to hear this from the officers, but it seems that the new saint is joining us in combat. Really? Are you talking about the one who can use meteor? However, it'll take 4 days straight to walk all the way from Salonia to here. That's right, seems like it's a matter of if we can hold the line until the saint arrives. The knights looked up and were frightened, for they were obviously very worried about what was to come next. Iela was also going through a bad time, for they were going to have some very difficult times ahead of them. While she was thinking, someone came into her room to tell her that the Pope had ordered for the saint to be sent to the border and the order had been issued by the Pope himself. To think we'd be faced with such a force that the Pope would even order the saint to join the battle. She was also told that they had already asked for them and however it seems that they will take at least 4 or 5 days for them to arrive. But she can't believe in that, because if that's the case, who is traveling alongside the saint? The boy informed her that the 3D Paladin Order and the Holy Altar, along with the Royal Guardsmen, and they are currently en route to the border. Iela was just extremely surprised by this, since no one had told her about it. So are these all the troops they have? The guy only remained silent, so the girl started to shout and get angry, once again asking, has the Pope gone mad? Their opponent is a necromancer from the age of sorcery and she is sure he's well aware that is not enough to fend them off. Meanwhile, in the age of sorcery in the far past, magic was the topic of research and the entire continent was blooming with innovations in magic. However, forces that used dark magic brought an end to that age and the one that was considered to be the key cause of their downfall, the king of the dead, is necromancer. So he managed to be revived. Meanwhile, the servant continued to tell the horrifying news that they have to deal not only with external conflicts, but also with the coming rebellion, for they can see the mood of the people, and therefore are unable to send a larger army. Iela summarizes with quiet gloom that the border is not that important to the Pope right now, and inside her, rage and resentment burns brightly for the saint the Pope is using as an expendable commodity to maintain his power. All of a sudden, the door swings open with a wild shriek from a temple servant and it turns out that while Iela was reported one piece of information, another has already appeared, and now the enemy army is approaching much faster than expected. Iela shrank with anger and despair. Suddenly, she abruptly leaves her place, and under the surprised shouts of 2 servants, runs out of the room, unable to waste any more time on all this uselessly. In the meantime, a bugle trumpets in defense of the Empire, calling the soldiers to full battle readiness, and one of the army commanders announces the approach of the enemy army and demands to raise their weapons. On command, arrows immediately flew into the air, cutting through the blue sky with a deadly cloud, and the enemy army, including skeletons, immediately felt the weapons of humans. The confrontation between the living and the undead heated up, neither wanted to retreat. The holy woman called on God for help, asking him to support the soldiers, so that their bodies would become stronger and be able to withstand this battle. With glittering hands holding the book, she spread God's grace to the soldiers around her, boldly looking into the eyes of the enemies. The soldiers immediately felt their bodies fill with divine power and rushed into battle with renewed vigor, hoping to finish everything before the reinforcement forces arrived. The commander of the squad immediately shouted at the soldiers not to relax because of this help, because the enemies are acting in a variety of insidious methods, and most importantly, the strongest is still ahead. And his words were confirmed, when the first appeared white spirits with terrible smiles, banshees, and black impenetrable lats, dead knights. The commander shouted in horror to the soldiers to retreat and regroup before it was too late for them. But it was too late for him. One of the banshees was right in front of his face, extending its sharp claws towards him. Both the temple servants and the soldiers began to flee, unable to bear what was happening, but none of them could escape. And in the midst of these cries of pain and suffering, in a dark cloak hiding him from head to toe, stood the necromancer, savoring every drop of spilled blood. He ordered his dead not to let go of a single living soul, and immediately the soldiers felt how the enemy army became stronger. And as much as the surviving commander tried to help the soldiers by recalling them, he had a terrible thought: were they really alone with the dead? The commander did not have time to dodge the mace of the huge dead men, and prepared to say goodbye to his life. But in a split second the situation changed, and a white glow saved him from horrible destruction. Rei appeared on the battlefield in his developing white robes, with such martial energy on his face that even the commander exhaled with delight and relief. Remembering how he rushed to the army defending the empire, Rei also recalled how the Pope had ordered him to go to the border because of the difficult situation in the empire. So now that all the soldiers were surprised to see the saint, Rei only activated his powers while gloomily looking ahead. Turning around, he ordered those who remained in formation to divide the wounded among the priests to heal them as soon as possible. But the soldiers and temple servants were unsure, for if they helped the wounded, fewer people would be able to defend against the undead's attack. Until they saw that the bones of the dead around Rei had already managed to melt like ice cream in the heat, and they praised the saint's strength with admiration. Rei only hummed as he faced the army of dead running at him, led by the necromancer. Although his saint's powers helped a lot, due to the fact that skeletons and other foul things were numerous, he decided to use his magic as well, sending a fireball forward. Explosions and bright flames filled the battlefield, burning everything in its path. And once the fire had calmed down and the smoke had cleared, only one figure with raised arms stood proudly alone, covered by a translucent purple shield. Without fear, Rei assumed it must be the necromancer. The old man in the cloak stared at the guy in shock, not understanding how he was able to use magic being a saint. The necromancer, with the anger inherent in working with the dead, began to cast another black curse, unwilling to give up so easily. With his command to cast off the calls of the underworld and bring death to its knees, he summoned another endless army of the undead and sent it into battle. The knights of the army once again stirred behind Rei, looking at the new number of those they would have to fight, losing their lives. But the saint was with them for a reason. With one spell and the power of the saint he managed to get rid of all the summoned dead, causing the necromancer to retreat a step in horror. The old man in the cloak shouted that he would never give up and that no one would stop him, sending another deadly spell specifically at Rei. Once again he was defeated with a gesture of one hand. The holy chains bound the necromancer before he could cast any more terrible spells. Rei's incredible strength, his skills, and the combination of divine power and magic led the necromancer to a surprising thought: he couldn't just be a saint, he must have already approached the level of a god. The weeping knight, no longer afraid to approach the necromancer, knocked the thought out of his head with his fist. Looking sadly at the blazing field, Rei realized the reason for his tears. Those people who had fallen in this battle were also becoming dead and unfortunately falling under the power of the necromancer. And all those they saw now in this horrible state used to be someone's slain family. Rei berated himself for not coming sooner, so he did the only thing he could in this situation. Summoning the Scylla of the saint, he laid the dead to rest, giving them a relieving oblivion. A cleansing rain covered the battlefield, covering the soldiers and priests mourning for their lost loved ones. Rei, chiding himself for his slowness, looked sternly at the kneeling necromancer, not forgetting the real culprit. But when he asked if he felt guilty for what he had done, and if he was afraid of joining the dead he had ruled before, the necromancer laughed madly. Paying no further attention to the insane old man, Rei ordered him to be taken to the Holy Empire. Having done his business at this place, he hurried to help at the next point, for the war didn't end here. Meanwhile, the dead were terrorizing another city where the saint was already waiting. And in that place, using her holy power, the locals were protected by Iriel, supporting the soldiers. Divine power shone in her eyes as she looked at the next approaching wave of the dead. Alas, besides the undead, There was also an unknown army among them, so it was doubly difficult for them. A sudden sword thrust caused an explosion that scattered a crowd of skeletons around her. Iela stared at it in surprise, trying to figure out what it was, until, in answer to her unspoken question, the pink-haired and purple-haired knights appeared before her, apologizing to the saint for being late and saying that there was nothing to worry about now that they were here. Iela, on the other hand, was even more worried, for Lord Zeke was supposed to be with Ray, and now he was without his support. When she heard that Lord Zeke had been ordered here by Ray himself, she couldn't believe her ears. The knight recalled the past, in which Ray had ordered him to stay in Salonia, because if he went after the saint, he would only cause him inconvenience instead of support. And when Lord Zeke had resented it, and still asked to go with him, worried about Ray, he had offered to fight Ray one-on-one to prove that he would not be in the way. The man apologized for pulling his sword from its sheath and swung at Ray, not doubting his strength. Well, he should have doubted, because the huge sword was able to hold back a tiny aura sword no bigger than a dagger. And now, Zeke's sense of self-importance was hurt, because he couldn't imagine Ray's strength if he was able to deflect a blow with a small dagger. After explaining all of this to Iela, he justified his coming to her aid, making her stand in wonder. Iela, however, forgetting her image as a saint, looked anxiously at the sky, worrying about Ray, and even daring to call him an idiot, not understanding the real danger, in front of the other knights. Ray, thankfully, could not hear such disbelief in his powers, at that moment running into another city full of already broken dead. There he was met by the crying child he had saved earlier, holding her little sister in her arms. Ray snapped out of his shoes, immediately running up to them and checking on the unconscious little girl's condition. However, contrary to his hopes, he was unable to trace any pulse, breathing, or consciousness in poor Chris' body. The child cuddled closer to her sister, unable to let her go, while Ray regretted that she was too weak even before what had happened. With tears in his eyes, the child admitted that he had to protect his sister no matter what, not reacting when Ray instead blamed himself. After all, he shouldn't have brought them here, and apologizing for the pain he had caused her with that decision. Mary disagreed, continuing to sob and blaming only herself and her weakness. And as Ray towered over the broken child, his eyes came across a knight behind the children, clearly not gone from the Holy Empire soldiers. It must have been Mary defending herself and protecting her sister. Ray, looking collected and serious, ordered everyone who was hiding to come out into the light. Though not the first time, but only when he named who was standing where, the mysterious pursuers showed themselves, and their distinguishing feature was a bone mask on the lower half of their faces. Bending in greeting, all the members of the Dane family, the 7 messengers, manifested in the darkness of the night. One of the 7 messengers introduced herself first, respectfully placing her hand on her chest. She also introduced the other 6 messengers in turn, and each of them had a unique appearance and identical bone masks on their faces that concealed their identities from prying eyes. They were given names that differed only in the first name, but the second name was still Young, which made Ray puzzled for a second. With his hands on his chest, he explained that he had summoned them all because he wanted them to take care of Mary. Hong Yong, the first of the 7 messengers, squinted slightly to make sure that she had heard him correctly and that he was referring to the living child behind him. After hearing Ray's words about Mary's special abilities and constitution of body and spirit, the messenger confirmed that she was indeed able to survive where everyone else was already lying down. Hong Yong objected to raising her as an assassin. Before he could clarify exactly what he wanted, Ray heard another messenger ask if he wanted them to train the child in special techniques, and Ray happily complimented her on her guesswork. Hong Yong again declined, as they had a primary assignment, and that was to protect Ray, and they couldn't waste time on anything else. Besides, they needed to protect the identities of each of the 7 messengers, and taking care of the child implied a high risk that they would be exposed in the future. All in all, the messengers refused until the last, when a desperate Ray mentioned that he could make it an order. Seeing all 7 people flinch at that word, the saint's eyes lit up, and he seized the opportunity by simply issuing a full-fledged order. The messengers, reluctantly, but had to obey the order. Ray also ordered them to take care of the little girl's funeral, and Mary herself to listen carefully and train with the messengers, as they were trustworthy people. Having dealt with the problem here, Ray sternly turned around and headed off to where his help was still needed. Meanwhile, things were not going smoothly for Iela, though the soldiers did not notice this, continuing to receive the saint's blessing. Dressed in knightly armor, the woman commanded the knights and motivated them not to give up and get the victory. As soon as the loud words were spoken, she exhaled heavily, covered in sweat, and the girl knight worried whether she was fine after using so much holy power. To distract her, Iela asked to take control of the left flank and monitor their progress, which the girl immediately fell for. When she left, Iela had a moment to realize that she couldn't go on like this. There was no end to the battle, and no matter how strong she was, she wouldn't be able to bless the knights indefinitely. As she thought about it, the woman barely dodged the unexpected blow, miraculously jumping aside. Cradling her injured arm, she stared in disbelief at Duke Zahard who had attacked her. Lord Zeke stepped up to her defense and covered her, clarifying if the saint was all right. Lord Zahard slung his one-handed weapon over his shoulder and greeted both Iriel and Zeke sarcastically, not at all looking upset or offended by the guy's words about his betrayal of God. He mustered up the courage to argue with a mad grin that the Holy Empire had no future because of its small size, unable to withstand the power of the superhumans. Iriel was annoyed at his behavior to the point of gritting her teeth, but there was nothing she could do to counter the master of the sword. She wasn't sure if she could fight him at full strength, and even Lord Zeke's presence wouldn't help. Suddenly, Lord Zahard suggested that each side retreat, and the saint wondered what his plan might be, for despite her recent doubts, the holy power was very motivating to the soldiers, and yet they would not be able to defeat the master of the sword. Gritting her teeth, Iriel agreed in her mind that it was not a bad suggestion to pause and wait for reinforcements. When she voiced her thoughts aloud, Lord Zahard grinned contentedly and called it a wise decision. But as he was about to leave, satisfied that he had achieved his goal, he was stopped by someone's voice, and Iriel flinched, unable to control herself. Surrounded by holy magic, Rey was approaching them from behind, sternly wondering who this lord thought he was, daring to make a mess of things and flee the scene without being punished. Rey looked almost insane, ready to defend what he held dear to him to the last, summoning all his power, both divine and various kinds of magic, against the flaming orb. Considering that the human body can only withstand divine power, or only magic because in saints, magic transforms into divine power, Lord Zahard couldn't take his eyes off the picture in front of him right now. Rey, placing his hands on his hips in a relaxed pose, asked him if he had any last words before total defeat. Looking for ways out of the situation, something occurred to the Lord, and he suggested to Rey a battle between the protégés of each side. Zeke hastens to ask Rey not to get hot and accept the offer from the traitor, as he might be up to something, but when has the saint ever turned down a good battle? He cancelled the fireball spell, and Zahard thought with joyous excitement that Rey was just a round fool who thought he was a fool. Rey, in his usual manner, beckoned his opponent toward him without moving or drawing his weapon. Still thinking it was foolish, the sword master calculated the saint's weak points, sensing that he finally had a chance to deal with the threat. After all, even if Rey is an archmage capable of summoning a meteor, it makes no sense for him as long as he can't use magic. Boots creaked under Zahard's sudden jerk as he pushed himself off the ground in seconds and took a wide swing, leaping out of the air at Rey. Still as unflustered, Rey summoned the aura sword in his hand, glowing with blue divine power. This was something the Lord was unprepared for, and as he met Rey's sword with all his might, he felt a recoil of terrifying power. He was thrown back a couple of meters, almost dragged across the battlefield, and a small but noticeable crack formed on the powerful two-handed sword. A relaxed Rey stood before Zahard, almost provoking the men to the same thoughts the necromancer had earlier. Who the hell was the guy who could summon meteorites, use divine energy and create aura swords? Where did he even come from? Zahard made another attempt, thrusting his sword at the saint, gritting his teeth with eagerness. He tried his best until he found Rey acting strangely, and the guy with the crazy grin was finally able to play to his full potential, having learned from Zahard all the time before in practice, and adopting his fighting style. So now he was already attacking Zahard, not giving him a moment's respite, for even his thoughts were now racing. He had made a huge mistake. The saint, in a devious move, deceived the Lord, and when he put his sword up to protect his neck, slashed him in the leg, declaring that he would not give men like the Lord a second chance. Zahard, feeling the wound, feeling Rey's speed and strength, and realizing that his fighting style was not only being copied but improved upon as he went along, begged for mercy, taking a knee. The guy pointed his aura sword at Zahard, and began to interrogate him, saying that a swordsman like him would be too ashamed to follow someone else's orders, so surely, he was acting on his own accord. The man who had bowed his head suddenly rose out of the blue and tried to attack from the sneak, shouting that he only wanted to show the nobles in the shadows that even harsh methods like his could change the world. Of course, Rey deflected the blow, and afterward made his sword disappear for a second. To Zahard's surprise a second later, that moment remained the last he had ever seen in his life as his head rested on the ground separate from his body. At about the same time, in a quieter place, the commanders of knights and mages of the various kingdoms listened to the news of what had happened earlier on the battlefield, coming to shock. The sight of a defeated, bound, and powerless necromancer who had managed to be captured alive caused large question marks in their minds. A soldier from the Holy Empire's army smiled and thanked the people from other kingdoms who had come to help, but said with a relieved expression that the necromancer had already been taken care of. The servant who ran up to him drew the attention of everyone present, for he brought good news. The rebel forces had been all but defeated. Iriel was rubbing her tired wrists in the company of the unchanged Zeke and Fia, but as she looked around, she was pleased that they had cleared most of the area. The pink-haired Fia put a finger to her lips, wondering about Rey's origin since he had come here so easily and solved almost all of their problems on the battlefield, when Zeke tiredly asked her to watch her tongue when she spoke of the saint. Everything was coming to an end when a purple glow appeared on the horizon and a terrifying force pressed them to the ground as if coming out of nowhere. Fia, Zeke and Iriel were once again forced to prepare for battle, blown by the icy strong wind. The glow, intensifying with each passing second, made Iriel's eyes widen in horror. In front of them, the bone dragon loomed, embraced in hellish purple flames. A rumble of thunder signaled the arrival of a new demonic force, and Ray, who had sensed it when he arrived at the manor, realized with a sigh that it was time to head back to the battlefield. The maid he had asked to take care of a few things for him agreed and relayed that she would be sure to pay special attention to the girl he had rescued. Hearing that the child was to be taken care of by the 7 messengers, the maid squinted at the Dane family and was not happy about it. Things were not going so well for Iriel and company, for the bone dragon had brought with it new problems, and now its huge wings and powerful strength were simply blowing the poor soldiers off their feet. The saintess folded her arms and summoned her divine power, and once again glowed with a warm golden light to help the army and resist the death spawn. But contrary to her hard work, although some skeletons burned in the divine glow, there were still too many crawling and reaching for them from all sides. Fia wanted to lead Saint away, but she didn't have time. Looking straight into the jaws of the monster towering above her, Saint froze in a strange frenzy. The bone dragon reflected in her eyes, and only then she realized its hidden essence. It was not just a huge flying skeleton, but a real monster, the dragon of fear. Her whole body stiffened, not allowing her head to move either. Iriel felt her consciousness floating away, and fear made her heart beat so often that it was about to fly out of her chest, piercing her ribcage. Suddenly, Saint felt a small sense of relief, but it was only a matter of time before her sight returned and she saw Fia and Zeke covering her back and taking the full force of the blow. Neither of them could move, but the snapping sound was coming closer to the girl knight, and she froze now, not just in induced terror, but actual fear, for she could not move, and behind her the skeleton was already reaching for her. As she braced herself for the worst, a sword blew off half of the skeleton's body. It was the work of Lord Zeke, who managed to overcome the monstrous force, and began to move, returning to the battle. He didn't feel half his strength and doubted he would last long, but he needed to protect his partner and the saint, so he had no choice but to raise his sword and grip it tighter. Zeke fought like a wolf, out of his last strength, not falling to the skeletons or under the eye-terrifying demons. There were too many of them, however, and at a certain point a snapping sound meant a cloud of bones coming at him. They buried him beneath them, pressing down from above and blocking even the slightest sliver of visibility. Fia asked the saint in a panic what they could do, for she couldn't move, but if they did nothing, Zeke wouldn't last that long. No matter how hard Iriel tried, the divine energy wouldn't leave her body, frozen with her. There was an explosion, and the skeletons scattered in different directions under Zeke's power, but he himself was in very bad shape, covered in wounds and scratches, breathing heavily. A weeping Fia asked him if he was all right, but since she couldn't move to see for herself, Zeke risked deceiving her by claiming she was overreacting. He himself, feeling tired for the first time as a sword master, still unable to steady himself, but walked over to the dragon, leaning on his sword. Unable to stand still, seeing that the dragon only inspires fear, but does not approach on its own, the Lord makes a serious decision. It is necessary to attack this monster, not for nothing he has trained so long. He fights back as best he can, but even though he has been called a genius in swordsmanship since he received the title of Master Swordsman at a very young age, he was unable to deal with the army of the undead on his own. Having been seriously injured, one of his last thoughts was regretting that it was him and not someone stronger who could handle this dragon and not put the saint in danger. That was when Ray's calm voice caught up with him, surrounding him with divine power and reassuring that Zeke had held out well until his arrival. Holding out his hand and muttering a cleansing spell, Ray destroyed the skeletons reaching for the kneeling lord. Now they were one-on-one, the holy genius Ray against the bone dragon of fear, almost the battle of the century. Standing in front of the dragon, Ray remembered reading articles on dark magic, which spoke of a great weapon that neutralized all magic below the 7th circle, a great unliving one that even an aura sword could not touch. The saint began to use holy magic, thinking with his mind that since such a demon appeared here, it means that somewhere nearby there must be another necromancer, but he will be able to get to him only after he deals with the dragon. When the dragon was completely hidden in the blue glow of divine healing, Fia and Iriel, having been able to move, admired that it took only one spell from Ray to kill the great dragon of fear. However, suddenly, their joy was premature. A violet light sparkling in the empty eye sockets destroyed Ray's magic, and the dragon opened its mouth. Zeke shouted to the saint to be careful because the dragon was gaining breath for a deadly strike. A beam of destructive force pierced space and rushed towards the battlefield faster than the speed of sound. Ray, in his typical manner, was surprised that the creature was so powerful that even its magical shield was cracked. Ignoring the shocked people behind him, Ray cast a healing spell one after another, causing the bone dragon to literally float in his magic. Finally, a huge amount of blue magic collapsed, destroying the dragon, and leaving only a trail in the air behind it, but even after that, Ray could not sense the necromancer, and behind his back, Iela had already reached Zeke, treating him with her magic. However, even after this, the Lord did not wake up, and his wounds were still covered with demonic energy, so dense that Iela's divine power could not do anything about it. Behind, already understanding where this was going, Ray approached, creating strong scissors from his magic, and stopping Iela from futile attempts. Seeing these wounds and knowing a lot about medicine, the guy was amazed that Zeke was still alive. Taking off his shirt, Ray promised that he would do everything possible to save the Lord. Ray cleansed his hands with a spell, and although they were in the worst place to perform such an operation, he ordered Iela to ensure that no miasma or demonic energy touched them from the outside. Fia, seeing the knife at Zeke's stomach, screamed in fear, but Iela silenced her. Placing his hands on the man's chest, the saint first decided to cleanse him at least a little of the demonic energy and could hardly resist a cry of pain. Sweating with diligence, focusing all the demonic energy from Zeke's body into his left hand, Ray regained his strength and began to clean the wound before the operation. Having created an amazingly thin thread of divine magic, the guy now needed to connect the arteries to ensure the correct flow of blood in the body. Ray's hand turned black, but now was not the time to hesitate, even though Zeke already looked better. But Iela, looking at what Ray was doing, had mixed feelings. On the one hand, she was ashamed that she herself did not fully trust Ray and his methods, and by stopping Fia, she stopped herself first, and on the other hand, she could feel with every cell of her body that Zeke was getting better, and this made her ashamed more. In addition, she noticed the saint's blackened hand, and now she was worried about him too. As soon as the last stitch was made, Ray fell unconscious. Iela immediately rushed towards him and extended her hands, wanting to heal his blackened hand. However, no matter how hard she tried, the saint could not do anything, and helplessly almost cried, realizing that she needed a specialist in this matter who could give Ray special treatment. As if in response to her thoughts, one of the 7 messengers in the familiar bone mask came out from around the corner, unnoticed as always. She commanded her colleague to take the saint away with a heavy sigh. While Ray dangled head down on the messenger's back, Hong Yong informed Iela that they were taking the saint with them to Salonia to give him proper care, and expressed hopes that Iela would also arrive for the same purpose. Iela agreed to come to the saint's estate, but first she had to deal with the remaining deals, no matter how worried she was about Ray. A man in a surgical gown woke up when he was called several times to go to the operation room by a colleague. He has given his medical history to another doctor and confirmed that he remembers perfectly well that a heart surgery is now scheduled. As he enters the room, he senses some sort of catch. Something keeps him uneasy as he looks at the patient in the oxygen mask, reminding him of someone familiar. He urges himself to come to his senses, asks for a scalpel, but in response the other doctors turn on him, their hands beginning to glow with a soft green light, and they themselves are wondering why a scalpel is needed when magic can be used. And at this point, Ray jumps up on the bed in horror, waking up from a strange dream. The bright sun shines down on him from a familiar window, and he realizes he is in his chambers, so the first thought that comes to his mind is the thought of servants. Both maids are already in place, and while the dark-haired Yuklawud looks stern, little Mary does not hesitate to cry and openly rejoice at the saint's return. After stroking the girl's head, Ray gets a question from the second maid, who doesn't hesitate to tell him that it was a foolish and insane act. Saint quipped to the girl that she must have been worried sick about him, but the maid fiddled, parrying that she just wanted to keep her job. As Ray remembered Zeke, and Yuklawud grimly listed his horrible misdeeds, like not looking after Saint, and even sleeping deeply right now, Ray ran his gaze over the still dark hand. He looked it over in surprise and disgust, not understanding how he could still move his fingers, though he still remembered the terrible pain during Zeke's treatment. The maid told him that he had been cured by the saint and the chief priest, to which Ray fell out again. Although Ray had just woken up, the first thing he was taken to was not to be fed. He was instead taken to the basement where, on a tall square stand with a white cloth, lay an object that emitted a nightmarish amount of demonic energy. The evil heart of a bone dragon, left on the exact spot where the dragon had been defeated. Ray wondered why the hell he had brought this thing in the first place, and the maid told him that he should go to the lecture hall and explain himself to the nobles who couldn't believe that the dragon had really been destroyed. Ray's thoughts and mood were far from rosy, so ordering the maid to take the heart and follow him, he went with a warlike attitude to where he was invited. The lecture hall was filled with nobles, and the chief priest, upon receiving word that Ray was in attendance, asked everyone in the room to calm down before the meeting. The Veyborn Kingdom representative questioned the fact that the saint had not only defeated the dragon, but had also used magic, something saints normally cannot do. Finally, Ray, dressed in the white robes of a priest, entered the hall, and right from the entrance, he demanded that questions be asked immediately and directly, and he promised to answer. Marquis Philia of the Kingdom of Glamour clarified whether Ray had used magic to defeat the necromancer on his own. Ray answered a simple yes without any further explanation and simply demanded to move on to the next questions as soon as possible. Now the representative of the Regent Empire took umbrage, ordering him to provide them with some sort of confirmation of his words. The men said in a disrespectful manner that they had come to the Holy Empire to prevent the dire threat looming over the entire continent, so they had every right to be outraged and demand any proof. The princess of the Regent Empire also interjected, claiming that even a captured necromancer was not a valid argument until they saw Ray's powers with their own eyes. The chief priest immediately realized that they were now trying to test the territory and see if Ray was considered a threat to them, and if they should unite against him this time since he had defeated the necromancer single-handedly. With a sly smile, Iela looked at the boy, waiting for the show. Tired of it all, Ray didn't disappoint him, and directly asked his attackers if there was any difference in how exactly he defeated the necromancer. After another disdainful look from the representative of the Regent Empire, Ray took a step forward, slyly repeating his words about proof. And instead of answering, he materialized an aura sword, almost putting it to that man's throat, still wondering if the evidence was enough now. The princess, in the same contemptuous manner as the men, asked if Ray's move was an official statement of the Holy Empire against the Regent Empire. Utterly exasperated at this, Ray called his maid over to him, and took the bundle from her hands, pulling out a bone dragon's heart, which immediately began to emit dark energy. He handed it to the princess, and she had no choice but to touch the heart with her finger. The brutal demonic energy bound the girl, and she couldn't even pull her hand away in horror. She couldn't even utter a word. Ray, on the other hand, brought the heart back closer to himself, and stated in a loud voice that the Holy Empire had enough strength that they could defeat even a bone dragon. Now it was Ray's turn to ask questions, and he immediately inquired with a murderous expression on his face whether he should consider the actions of the Regent Empire as an official statement towards the Holy Empire. The startled representatives were forced to apologize in their official names. The saint unhappily clucked his tongue, not hesitating to express what he thought of the intolerance of some of the nobles. As soon as the chief priest nodded in agreement to Ray's request to return to his room, the boy left the lecture hall, hearing Iela ask if anyone else had any doubts. After a while, Ray wondered if he should visit Lord Zeke and check on his wounds. The maid immediately gave him a lecture on how a saint should behave and how he should not break his distance from other people in different circles. Iela also clarified that there was a waiting list to meet the saint, causing Ray to stop in surprise. And the fact was that as soon as he left the lecture hall, the chief priest was bombarded with questions from everywhere, most notably about Ray's current level, to which Iela had to say that even the Holy Empire didn't fully know the answer. However, she assumed their own estimation of the saint at the level of an 8th or even higher circle of magic. The powers that be were as shocked as they could possibly be, since even the imperial mages of every nation stopped at the 6th circle, let alone the ordinary citizens. The princess of the Regent Empire, who had attacked Ray earlier, was the first to orient herself, and immediately requested permission from the Holy Empire to stay here for a while longer. Iela had agreed to accept representatives from all the other empires as well and could only empathize with how much more work the guy would have to do. When Ray heard about this situation from the maid, he couldn't hold back a disappointed groan. Even though the Regent Empire had been the first to send him an invitation to meet, the saint had ordered to cancel everything he had planned and decided to go to Zeke's place instead. The carriage brought them to the Lord's estate quickly enough. Ray's hand continued to remain dark, having failed to recover from the demonic energy damage, but he didn't care much about it. Stepping out into the fresh air, the saint marveled at how much this large estate reminded him of Zeke's, and Iela confirmed that the Lord himself had designed the exterior. A maid from Zeke's palace reported that the master was in his bedroom and offered to follow her, while Ray wondered why Zeke hadn't stayed at Salonia Palace to recuperate, to which he received a disgruntled reply from his maid that it was Zeke who had taken care of the saint for the first time, and had not let anyone, not even Iela herself, near his idol and savior. After the woman's words that such behavior, while nice, was not necessary, Ray discerned between the words her hatred for the knight, though she denied it. Swinging opens the door to Zeke's bedroom, Ray and the maid following him said hello to the men. Zeke hopped up on the spot, gazing in surprise at the saint he was so worried about. He instantly jumped off the bed and ripped his shirt off as soon as Ray told him that he had come to check on his patient. What happened next was a real show, with Ray marveling at the quick healing of Zeke's wounds, the knight himself thanking the power of the saint for it, and Iela demanding that Zeke stop showing his exposed skin to the saint and cover up at last. Zeke snapped at the woman and suggested that she not come to him anymore since she was so busy, while Iela explained with a furious look that she was following the saint, not choosing where she wanted to go. After Ray's shout, the woman immediately apologized, and the Lord hurriedly recanted her words and assured him of eternal peace and goodness. In fact, besides the main purpose, Ray also had a hidden purpose, so after checking Zeke's wounds, the guy ordered the 7 messengers to come out of the shadows. Hong Yong was the first to appear, already stressed enough by this for Zeke, who failed to see her presence earlier. But when he was prevented from raising his sword against the assassin by another of the messengers, the man was horrified to realize that he had not only sensed her from afar, but also up close. Iela, despite her dislike of Zeke, recognized his abilities, so jerked forward to defend the saint when she too was overridden. Rei clapped his hands and tried to stop the mess, and the 7 messengers lined up behind him in an obedient row as he introduced them. The knight and maid stood in silent shock. One of the 7 messengers wondered why they had been summoned to appear now if they were not allowed to show themselves in front of other people and there were strangers in the room. Rei paused for an important pause and first said that it was an order, and they could not disobey it, and then said that from now on they would all have dinner together, shocking not only the messengers but also the knight and the maid, who were still in shock from the first time. Meanwhile, deep in some castle, a conspiracy continued to brew, where 2 cloaked figures resented the failure of their plan with the bone dragon. While the blue cloak suggested destroying the empire, the red cloak said to start by removing the saint in their way, for example by sending him away from the Holy Empire to other kingdoms. Using his magic to grill the meat and sticking it on the aura sword like an ordinary skewer, Rei gave everyone here a look of shock and regret. With his usual gesturing smile, Saint, when asked about the reason for having dinner together, replied that he was just hoping to improve understanding and work between the 3 families since they had to cooperate anyway. Pushing everyone to eat, Rei made sure that the 7 messengers took off their bone masks for the first in a long time, even though they looked confused while doing so. Hong Yong, who followed the others' example, bowed her head obediently, taking it as an inevitable order, but the guy immediately explained to her that he didn't want to achieve their cooperation through violence. Lord Zeke was the first to speak up, stating that the Trey family would cooperate. A grim Iela asked if he realized that this meant breaking family tradition, to which Zeke only waved her off as his family's purpose was to protect the saint, so there was no problem with his choice of methods. With glances consulting amongst themselves, the 7 of the Dane family raised their hand and swore to cooperate. Seeing that things were going better than she expected, Iela had no choice but to follow their actions and promised the Belacroix family's cooperation. However, she didn't stop there, and said that although the Belacroix family's mission was to seek information for the saint, there was also a side mission of no less importance, to stay by the saint's side until the last, through marriage. Everyone's faces were inexpressibly stupefied at this point, but Rei took first place as the main subject of conversation. Thoughts of what Iela had said did not leave the poor guy the next day as he sat in the throne room next to Iriel. Everyone had been so surprised yesterday that the woman had hastened to confess that she had not wanted to tell of such a thing, because marriage was only a method of fulfilling her mission with dignity, and that she had not yet thought of such a thing with Rei. However, the fearful look in her eyes and her sly clarification that it was only for now, kept him on his toes even as he got to work. Coming to bow to the saints, the very representative of the Resian Empire, Lord Gregory, had once again apologized for his rudeness in the lecture hall some time ago, and had brought a box of gifts to make amends. As soon as he opened the box, Iriel jumped up from her seat when she saw a piece of jewelry, and explained to the confused Rei that this was a great craftswoman who had lived several thousand years ago and had created masterpieces. Besides, although there was only one earring, legends say that magic could be used to find the second earring, so it was an insanely valuable gift. Lord Gregory assured that this legendary treasure only confirmed their sincere intentions. Placing the earring in his ears, with a smile that sparkled like the jewelry, Rei suggested the Lord get out as soon as possible, for the next nobles awaited in the hallway to bow. The Lord, however, did get another moment of the guy's attention, and invited Rei to pay a diplomatic visit to their Resian Empire. Rei's mind immediately whirled with 100 thoughts about how majestic the Resian Empire was, what resources it had, and how different the methods of treating people there might be because of that. The aristocrat who noticed his thoughtfulness immediately began pouring honey into his ears, first by complimenting him on the greatness of Rei's deeds on the territory of the Holy Empire, and then by suggesting that they cooperate to organize business with the Resian Empire. His plans were simple. It was not so much business and money that mattered, but the power of the saint, which had never been seen before. But the unimpressed Rei thanked him sunnily for the offer, but refused, saying that he had enough to do in his home Holy Empire. He even shouted those words louder so that the line of nobles outside the door could hear his intentions as well. Lord Gregory had to accept his defeat, and he bowed out, asking Rei only that he not forget his invitation to visit the Resian Empire. Iela, standing behind the back of Rei's throne, asked if he was really thinking of the interests of the Holy Empire, and Rei confirmed that he was telling the plain truth. The boy also asked to gather all the aristocrats who were still nearby in the hall to announce some very important news. And leaning over to Iriel, he asked for her help as well, but she in her typical manner chose to hear the information first before giving her consent. With a slight smile, standing up from his throne, Rei spoke words that could shock. He wanted to open an entire academy for doctors to teach local healers how to treat people with his techniques. He reminded her of the condition Zeke had been in days ago, and that it wasn't the holy power that had saved him, but Rei's medical skills, and explained that he wanted to make it possible for ordinary people to help the wounded. Iela breathed out a sigh of relief, agreeing to help since it was such a noble cause. However, she doubted that her help was needed at all, as Rei was a true hero to the entire holy nation. As Rei had planned, there was an uproar in the hall when the aristocrats heard of his plans to found an academy of medicine. But with Iela's encouragement and her knowledge of political games, it was decided to create an academy not only a place for medicine, but also for magic, which appeased most of the aristocrats. And it was because of this that Rei was finally given the title of professor of the academy. Rei felt great in his role as a teacher, his enthusiasm infecting everyone around him. He was surprised to see more people attending his first lecture on magic than he had expected. It was because not only the students but also the professors had thrown themselves and decided to attend the class of the saint who had such a high level of magic. In addition, rumors of a strong, handsome lord were spreading among the students at a terrific rate, and given the eighth circle and the mastery of two powers at once, it should not be said that the hall was full house. The academy was now filled with noble families of various statuses. Tapping the chalk on the blackboard to draw attention to himself, the guy finally started the first lecture with a question to the audience about what an expression of magic was. One of the students answered correctly, converting magic, proper spell casting, and proper spell redirection, for which he received praise. But beyond that, Rei had the idea to convey that there are other ways to create magic, taking fire spells as an example. Having written his scheme on the blackboard, the saint managed to explain in simple words how to make any spell easier and more accessible for any magician and offered to practice it right at the class. One of the professors, who was present as a supervisor, looked with amazement at the way the theoretical lesson was being converted into practice, and was a little suspicious of Rei's abilities in this scheme, although he admitted that it had a point. Suddenly, the same student who had successfully answered the question earlier shouted in delight that the method worked when a drop of water appeared in his hands without too much effort. He was the first, but by no means the last, to understand the pattern and match the spell, and Rei watched their reaction with pride. The saint's thoughts were on his upcoming medicine class, from which he expected no worse, when he was interrupted by the professors attending the lecture as students. Jumping around him with delight, they showered him with compliments and even inquired as to the name of this ingenious theory, which would have to be presented to the Association of Magicians. Shrugging awkwardly, Rei calls it the atomic theory. Some time later, in a completely different place, the students couldn't contain their excited shouting, looking at the bright blue glow in one of the classrooms. And the whole point was that the professor, previously surprised by Rei's methods, having spun the scheme that the saint had voiced in his spare time in his head, had not just been able to succeed in spell casting, he had broken through to the fifth circle of magic, after years of stalling. So, while Rei was still sweetly slumbering into his pillow, he heard loud screams, banging, and noises that shouldn't have been there this early. Barely getting out of bed, he opened the door, begging for the door to stop battering his room, and not realizing what was even going on. And on the other side of the bedroom was a crowd of students, sobbing at the realization of the prospect, begging for another lecture, and even signing a petition to make magical lectures a permanent thing. Infuriated because he'd been torn from his sleep for such a cause, Rei cast a bunch of spells on the room to make sure the door wasn't definitely kicked in with his enthusiasm by the students, and also so he wouldn't be disturbed by this screaming. Alas, he had to compromise with all these people and increase the number of magic lectures to 2 a week, which made him regret his desire to do it at all, because he had envisioned it differently. Meanwhile, away from all the noise, a blonde girl read out the request of the elven village to move out. The white-haired elfess agreed but asked for the paperwork to be done by the end of next week, putting aside her tea and checking the request. Her companion was surprised by such speed, but Lord Era explained that she had plans to make a trip somewhere soon, so she did not want to delay it. The elfess immediately realized what she was talking about, and asked Era to tell Rei that she was living well too, causing her to blush slightly. The vehement denial didn't help, for Era was indeed going to the Holy Empire, so the pause came out awkward for the elfess. Staring up at the sky with a warm smile, she remembered the guy she hadn't seen in 6 months, which wasn't a long time for an elf, but a strange melancholy settled in her chest. At the academy, however, things were much more active, for Rei had brought a professor who had advanced in magic the other day to assist in another class. The students' chuckles at this were quickly cut short by Professor Clarissa's menacing stare. Rei once again adopted a serious expression, which combined with the glasses on his face and his academy uniform gave him the right professorial look, and ordered the second lecture to begin. Rei didn't use too complicated examples, preferring to show everything in practice, so he asked Professor Clarisse, who was assisting him, to demonstrate the air-cutting spell. Doubt was written on the faces of both professor and students, but Rei remained firm. He offered to use the spell, aiming not at him, but at the board behind him, to calm everyone present down at least a little, and through gritted teeth the professor agreed. Sending the spell forward, the wind was ready to cut everything in its path, but Rei used his favorite word, and cancelled the spell faster than it was created. He explained to the students that due to the scheme of magic, since the two types of magic come from the same place, mana, Even if a spell was created, it could still be cancelled, and his words caused a real flurry of disbelief from the students. Briefly summarizing that this was his entire part of the lecture, he told everyone to split into pairs and practice stopping someone else's spell, to which they quite logically said that it was impossible for them since they weren't Rei. With the fervor with which soldiers in war are usually supported, Rei shouted that magic is basically a thing that defies logic, so they should never stop accepting and believing in new ideas. The students were moved beyond belief and motivated to at least try to practice, and that was all Rei needed, so he quickly slipped out of the lecture, wishing them good luck. Pulling himself up, the tired boy was glad he had time to prepare everything he needed for his upcoming medical lectures. He was nervous that these lectures might be unpopular compared to swordsmanship and magic when an incident caught his attention. One girl was being crowded by 3 guys, and one of them was particularly huge. In the company of his chums, he was clearly trying to declare his love for her or something. However, the girl didn't look pleased. Rei felt it was his duty to come closer and intervene in the conversation to defend the student. The big guy immediately started making excuses that he didn't mean to intimidate her. But after the girl admitted that she was just frightened by his size, and that such huge guys were not her type, now Rei had to be rescued, because the big guy had somehow implicated him as the main culprit. He said such nonsense that Rei didn't even realize whether it was a compliment or an attempt to insult. The big man, encouraged by the beauty's words that Rei was actually her type, immediately drew his sword and threw his glove at Rei, challenging him to a duel. He loudly shouted his name and accomplishments, like his exam grades and fighting ability, but it was obvious that he simply didn't recognize the professor who taught the classes for mages. He paid for it when Rei smacked him on the top of the head with a stick, not even using his powers to cool down the angry boy. Rei threw the stick aside and gave an almost contemptuous snort, treating it as a mosquito's squeak over his ear. And what was his surprise when the crowd around him erupted in applause and compliments, calling him almost a hero. After responding to the student's sincere, timid thanks, Rei suddenly smelled the familiar odor of alcohol, and at first complained about the perfume. The girl, however, admitted that she had been making potions recently, as she was planning to take medicine lectures, since even people like her were allowed to enter. Rei, hiding behind a mask of cordial calm, inwardly shouted with delight, now believing that his lectures had gotten at least one student. The girl asked to be called Gria, and even paralleled Rei's introduction with the name of the professor who would be lecturing. But it was her friend who cleared up the situation to the end, running up to the student and asking her what she was talking about with the professor. Looking at the flushed and flustered Gria, her friend elbowed her in the side, joking that she must have fallen in love with the new handsome professor. Gria's mysterious smile was her answer. Meanwhile, Rei had finally made it to his room, almost complaining about the lack of calmness throughout the day. As he was contemplating how exactly he should conduct his lectures next while sitting on his bed, suddenly Iriel's voice came from underneath him and she stuck herself out, accusing Rei of messing around while she had to hide in her room. Scared worse than she had been after her encounter with the bone dragon, Rei wailed about what she was even doing in his room like that. Saying that she was just worried about how his day at the academy would go, Saint also admitted that she was doing even too much for him than a normal person. The atmosphere heated up when she changed addresses from Saint to Rei's name, almost breaking into his personal boundaries. And things could have gone too far, but the seal on the guy's hand glowed with a white light. And from the special portal to Rei's bedroom came a superior-looking Iela. The smiling expression on her face was immediately replaced by displeasure when she saw Rei not alone, but in the company of another girl. If Iriel was surprised to see a high elf standing before them, Rei was surprised to see exactly Iela here, only guessing that it was a teleportation spell. Folding her arms across her chest, the beautiful lady pretentiously stated that it was obvious she wanted to see Rei. Sparks literally flew between the two women as Iela made a lunge towards Iriel, and the saint immediately snapped back in her usual manner. He could not stand the tension any longer, so Rei pulled out the cloaks and handed them to the two girls, telling them that they were planning to leave the academy. Even the rough fabric of the robes could not hide the beauty of both of them, and the saint only sighed, realizing that if he was seen with the elf and the saint in the same company, they would attract too much attention. Arriving at the cafe and taking a table, Iela recognized that not much time had passed since her last visit to human lands, but much had managed to change. Rei's thoughts that elves have a very different concept of short time were interrupted by a waiter awkwardly asking for permission to seat a group of other visitors who had been waiting for a seat for a long time. The guy recognized the travelers in them immediately, and they hardly argued at all, except to clarify that they were more like mercenaries. The only woman on their team said they were members of the Biblical Mercenary Guild. Rei thought back to what he had heard earlier about their success in their work, and in the meantime the conversation was intercepted by Iriel, excitedly questioning these mercenaries and their reason for being here. With great pride, the mercenary showed them the contract in which they had been asked to help with monsters and opposition directly from the Holy Empire. Iela only said a word about being interested in their story, with all her emotionless elven beauty, and the mercenaries were already floating and ready to tell her even the code to their safe, with both male and female members falling under that spell. Thanks to this, the members of Bilical's mercenary guild laid out all the information as a matter of course, which gave Ray a solid understanding of what was going on in the Empire. It turned out that although the number of lower-ranked monsters was almost zero, suddenly the higher-ranked monsters began to gather in groups and act so coherently as if they had some special tactics. This worried Ray, as he recalled the Bone Dragon, and summarized that someone must be controlling them, otherwise the stupid monsters didn't come up with such plans on their own. Suddenly, the ground shook, and screams from outside signaled the appearance of the monsters. Running outside, they saw not an ordinary monster, but an entire dragon-like wyvern. Furthermore, the mercenaries and mages were immediately frozen by an unnatural fear, forbidding them to even move. Iela found this interesting, but hummed with boredom that using fear only worked if your opponent was weak. With 2 fingers, without much exertion, she threw the wyvern into the nearest counters, and it was the counters that were the most unfortunate in this situation. Pressing her lips together, the elfa snorted contemptuously and finished her sentence about how having a stronger opponent to use fear on was foolish and pointless. Even after recounting the food and wood on the counters with her nose, the wyvern shook herself off and tried to attack again, but Ray restrained her in time with holy chains. Looking at its futile attempts to free itself, the saint assumed it had a mind of its own, for after Aira's use of the fear spell, the wyvern should not have remained so active. Iriel, meanwhile, promised to deal with the newly approaching monsters. Meanwhile, in the dungeons of the Holy Empire, the torture of the captured necromancer continued. He was surrounded by the brilliant minds of every single empire, but the necromancer was a tough nut to crack, and even while reciting a spell he managed to mock them. The mages clenched their teeth in fury when the necromancer called their 6th circle skills a mockery of a great man like him. In fact, he had already come to his senses and, with the help of his dark magic, had learned that the saint was not there, so he dared to continue hatching plans to overthrow the Holy Empire without fear of being beaten again with one right hand. The chief priest, entering the dungeon with a brisk gait, informed the gloating necromancer that the saint had already arrived at their door. Iela bent over the mad old man, regretfully explaining to him that all his plans would remain mere dreams, to which he laughed wildly in her face with yellow rotten teeth, for it was not yet clear who was having the last laugh. It was only at sunset when Ray and company were able to defeat all the monsters in the area, now slightly perplexed as to what they should do with the bodies. A frowning Iela, who was standing behind the guy's back, suddenly summoned him for a private conversation right that instant. Stepping aside, she cast a silent spell for the outside world so that no one could overhear them. She said that, given her absence from human lands, she might not understand much about the local customs, so she would only describe her feelings about their surroundings. Growing darker, Iela admitted that she had sensed large magical circles around her, even on the academy grounds, in different locations. Ray wasn't ready to hear about the magic circle, but the elf confirmed that at first, she only felt slight mana flows that confused her, but the moment the monsters appeared, those flows intensified and accelerated. Unfortunately, Iela couldn't tell what type of circles it was, she could only feel raw power without exact data. Ray froze in horror, knowing full well that it would be very difficult to break these circles without breaking a couple regions. And even though it's only enough to erase 30% of the circle, since they don't know their location, nor the materials used to draw them, it all becomes an impossible task. Realizing that even he might not be able to do it, Ray instantly began preparations to evacuate the people. Looking for escape routes, he and Iriel concluded that the evacuation would have to be in 2 parts, northern Geralt and southern Sulien. To inform people to leave the city immediately, Ray climbed Iela's conjured high cliff from where there was better hearing. The guy applied magic so that every resident could hear him from every corner. With an order in the name of the Holy Empire, Ray warned everyone of the danger by throwing off his cloak, perfectly audible thanks to the spell, and visible against the sunset. People recognized his voice and appearance, but continued to run closer to him, asking questions and not wanting to leave so easily, so the guy had no choice but to launch a blast of fire at them. Hoping that such a demonstration to people would be enough, he jumped off the cliff and rushed down, feeling incredibly furious. Iriel, having received her assignment, hurried north, calculating in her mind that it would take about 3 days to evacuate, and the mountains would only make the road more difficult. Suddenly she looked over her shoulder, sensing pursuit. The girl stopped in a favorable spot where she was ready to meet the 5 people whose auras she had sensed almost the entire way. Dropping her hood, the saint turned directly to her pursuers, and those no longer thought to hide, looking at the real saint with malicious anticipation. Their masked faces couldn't cover their mouths, so they said unpleasant things without watching their tongues, and most importantly, they thought Iriel was almost not alive anymore, so they weren't shy at all. The girl was quickly surrounded, and if she wasn't too worried about the 3, the middle-aged men had energy like Lord Zeke's, which meant they were no less experienced sword masters, and they were the main danger to her. At Iriel's kind offer to spank them lightly if they confessed about the empire that had sent them after the saint, the young lads only swung their swords at her. Going after the saint with such skills and weapons was foolish, so they were instantly swept away by a golden glow. However, the problem of the two sword masters still remained, as they were almost unaffected by Iriel's blow, and the girl wondered what kind of empire could afford so many mercenaries at once. Throwing off her cloak, the girl prepared herself for a hard unequal battle, in which only one wrong move of hers and an open weak point, and she might not come out of this clearing alive. She tried to approach them slowly, using not just her sword but pure divine power, but suddenly both men jumped from their seats at the same time. Iriel was surprised, for in such a battle they were risking more than just wounds, they were putting their lives on the line. And that was to the girl's advantage, for in such a battle even a simple turn of events, unexpected enough, like the golden divine flash that blinded the mercenaries for precious seconds, could win. It was not Iriel, for whom the battle was unequal, but the hand of one of the masters, cut off by a sword of divine power. The men suddenly decided to chat, threatening the saint with great trouble because of the immense power hanging over the Holy Empire, which even Iriel could not handle. But the girl dismissed all their words with a slight smile, for contrary to the strongest dark forces, the Empire had an incomparable advantage. Ray, the sword master, having nothing more to say, took the final blow from the saint's hand with a smile on his face. While Iriel was dealing with the sword masters, those first three mercenaries managed to get their feet away from her, but there was no way the girl would let them go so easily. The voices of the same three boys who had managed to escape echoed in the dark forest, cursing the saint for her amazing power, and questioning how they could get back to their own. However, a bright flash stopped them from even thinking about it, and the saint herself appeared before them almost in the form of a goddess of war. Iriel sternly suggested that they follow her quietly while she was still good, otherwise they would still return with her, but no longer in such an unscathed state. But the three boys, one by one, staying almost on the hysterical edge, suddenly twitched. Looking at them shocked, Iriel realizes that the mercenaries had bitten into the poison pills hidden in their teeth, and were now choking on the red liquid filling their mouths. Such an attempt to hide the information and prevent it from leaking out would be very effective if they weren't dealing with the saint. She simply healed them, and no one usually provides a second pill like that. Displaying none of the attributes of a servant of a god at all, Iriel looks at them with contempt, and offers to simply cut off their legs so they won't try to run away from her again. She refuses to make concessions to the mercenaries with an indifferent look, reminding them that the attempt on the saint's life is a terrible sin, and they will have to pay for it with their own lives. But after the interrogation, the blonde-haired boy still asked one favor, adopting a submissive pose, and even the spirit within him had already surrendered to the victor's mercy. When Iriel promised a small favor for the pure truth, the mercenary, despite the threats of his partners, swore an oath on the manna, promising to tell only the truth and nothing but it. The mercenary revealed that he belonged to the proxia faction, which had already attacked and committed crime in the Holy Empire 20 years ago. According to the official historical version, there was a monster attack then, but now it turns out that it was all organized by just one criminal group with far-reaching plans. Then the monsters did not just attack people and find their food, and selected the strongest representatives of which could be raised good mercenaries. Those who did not fit certain parameters were given to the monsters as a sacrifice, and those sword masters that Iriel had seen before were also kidnapped from other kingdoms. With tears in his eyes, the mercenary confessed that Proxia had even kidnapped family and friends, and dared the mercenary to threaten to kill them if they didn't obey. After listening to his story, Iriel turned around suddenly and let them go free. Furthermore, she told them not to worry about the Proxia faction, for she planned to turn it upside down just to protect her empire that they dared to sharpen their teeth on. Hearing such bold words from the saint, that is, not the last person in the empire, the two remaining mercenaries also asked to speak, and Iriel agreed, but ordered them to follow her, for time was running out and people were still in danger. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of the academy, Ray tried to find at least a trace of magic circles, but unfortunately, he couldn't feel a single magical reaction. The surroundings were deserted, and only frozen in running poses were the people who had failed to escape, and therefore petrified and frozen with a terrifying expression of panic on their faces. Suddenly a startling realization occurred to Ray. Thanks to this, after all, not a single building had been destroyed, despite the problems with the people. Remembering Aira's words that at least 30% of the circle had to be destroyed for it to stop working, Ray sent fire magic into the building and a huge explosion shook the outskirts. And then it was clear to Ray, because it was after the explosion, when some of the buildings were destroyed, that he felt the faint echoes of magic, which meant that the whole village was one big magic circle. Ray was suddenly distracted from his thoughts by voices nearby that were yelling about explosions. Ray was surprised that there were still people here, though they should have evacuated long ago or at least turned to stone, so he immediately called out to them. The two men, recognizing the saint, tried to justify that they were in no way violating the evacuation order and that they had only been caught off guard by one of the demons and the only possible escape for them was to hide in the building. Rei wasn't so easy to fool, however, and he came to the realization pretty quickly that something wasn't right here and found inconsistencies. As soon as he had asked a couple of leading questions, the mercenaries had sprinkled themselves, and after saying that they killed the soldiers who were trying to fight the ghosts, and thus helped the monsters to escape, the mercenaries even bared their weapons. But their weapons weren't swords, they were pills that suddenly melted away as if they weren't even there. Rei would be interested in examining these pills, because the traces left by the people were catastrophic, but he had no time left at all. So after subduing his curiosity, Rei launched a spell that fixed the mana around to track the presence of people around, because it would not be enough for him to wipe out 30% of the city from the face of the earth with just one explosion. In detail, calculating all possible possibilities, Rei used his magic and caused a huge earthquake. Meanwhile, Iela had already listened to the story of all three mercenaries and realized that all this time, even though they had been in proxia training and doing all sorts of horrible things, they had not been deeply immersed in this filth. Now, knowing already much more about this group, Saint could appreciate how extensive their deeds were and how many things they had done under the cover of ordinary coincidences. Relaxing a bit, the mercenary who had first told her about herself asked Saint about her own childhood and assumed that she had grown up in a rich and wealthy family. This caused the girl to sink into memories that echoed in her with both warmth and sadness. Memories of a happy golden-haired girl with enchanting pink eyes. The story of Iela began in a small church on a small island that was part of the Holy Empire. The girl was very different from other orphans by her bright appearance. Besides, she had an angelic character and rather sharp mind, so she was always in the center of attention. One day one of the priests suggested to the then still small girl to try to travel and see the huge world outside the island. Although Iela was really eager to get out there and see what it was like outside, she strongly doubted her ability to live on her own, but the priest with an affectionate pat on the head reassured the girl and said that he would always be at her side. Having received such a boost of motivation and support from a loved one, it was only natural that the then still little girl was really fired up with a desire to see the world. But instead of planning the journey for a long time, the priest suddenly said that they would leave today and did not even give the girl a chance to say goodbye to her friends. Riding in the carriage, Iela suddenly notes that they had time to pass the village but never entered it, but the priest reassures her that they plan to head towards the port. The little girl didn't see the danger at all and didn't suspect the kind uncle when he said they were going to Geralt, a rather large town that was quite different from the island villages. Climbing into the ship, the girl happily endured all the time on the road, enjoying the sea and the sensations of the journey ahead. Then the men, as they stepped onto the dock, offered Iela a drink of the holy water he had prepared especially for her to celebrate their journey. Obediently drinking what he offered her, and not even suspecting his intentions, Iela instantly felt something wrong. Her whole mind went blank, and the last thing she saw in front of her was the smiling face of a seemingly kind priest. But the priest was kind only in appearance, because when she came to her senses she saw that the very men who had been supporting her all this time had sold her to some strange people and resented the fact that she had been given only 2 gold coins instead of 3. With the same sweet smile, the priest admitted that it was a slave port for the slave trade, leaving the girl in shock and a sense of betrayal. Iela couldn't believe her ears, and she felt like something in her soul broke at that moment when she heard the priest call her a slave. Finally, getting her with every word, the men said that she could indeed write letters to her friends and send them whenever she wanted, but not out of kindness. He planned to send other children from the orphanage here as well. So the girl with the colorful looks became a slave. The only thing she wanted was to hide from the world. She sat for 4 days, staring at the wall, unable to get up and recover from the moral wounds of betrayal, alone in this big world. As the day came when she was to be sold, all her observations through apathy came in handy. The girl managed to memorize all the characteristics, habits, and weaknesses of the gang that trafficked children. The cross around her neck had been given to her by her mother, and she remembered how painful the loss of her mother had been for her, looking at the only memory left to be treasured. While the men in charge of the slaves happily lost his hands looking at the child's striking appearance, Iela thought of a plan. And when the men thought that the girl had already taken her breath because she hadn't moved in a long time, she shoved the very cross her mother had given her down his throat so that the girl would always remain strong. Memories of the cross that had once been sprinkled with someone else's blood just so she could live still lived in that little iron on a thin, ragged rope. Of course Iela didn't go into detail when the mercenary asked her childhood, but quite honestly admitted that they could have called her an assassin, which the mercenary didn't believe. They had already arrived in Geralt and the priest of that city came out to meet them, bowing low before the saint. The girl had a right to look at him with hatred, for this was the man she had trusted more than life and who had sold her to the slave traders years before. Heavy memories filled Iela's head again as she remembered how she had escaped from the other slave traders and how she had to survive. So she had gone to the dirtiest of methods to keep herself alive and had no concern for the lives of those who tried to capture her. The cross in her hands, which should have been a symbol of her freedom and faith, became a symbol of her hope for her own future, which she had to forge on her own. And each time she was chased, the girl violated the same terrible doctrine of the church, and with each such encounter was covered with more than just blood over her skin and hair, as if she were marking herself with stains that could not be washed away. She was covered at first with guilt, and afterward with an armor that made her blame not herself, but the world around her that allowed such an outcome. Iela was about to become another lost child, completely ruining her soul, when a sudden bright golden glow illuminated her path. For some reason, the goddess chose her and endowed her with the gift among all the others. But that was what had saved her, for it was then that she realized the value of human life and the futility of revenge, which gave nothing but more pain. So now, looking at the face of the frightened priest who had sold her out earlier, she didn't feel that pain. All that remained in her eyes and in her soul was pity for the fallen man who continued to live with the weight of guilt and fear of receiving punishment for his deeds. Meanwhile, Ray continued to destroy the city, but with each blow he realized that he could not just take and break absolutely everything. Already seeing the outline of the circle, he noticed the symbolic placement of the buildings, and now realized that the entire layout of the city was built in such a way that the buildings themselves became part of the runes of the magic circle. Suddenly, something warm ran down his face, and he felt his consciousness blurring. Another magic circle unfolded above him and he found himself in the very epicenter of the demonic magic going on. Due to the unfortunate location and his own efforts, now the magic of the circle began to conflict with Ray's power and the guy could not hold back a cry of pain when the purple lightning bolts bound his body. Moreover, the main problem was that the saint had already used a great deal of magic when forming the explosion earlier, and now that the demonic energy of the magic circle was penetrating his body, he couldn't control and resist it at all, much less heal it. As if these problems weren't enough, he found that portals had already begun to form on the sides of him, and monsters were pouring out of them in packs. With brown under his nose from overexertion and with purple mana hovering around him and demons arriving, Ray admitted to himself that he wouldn't be able to fight them in this state. However, the truth was also that if he didn't, they would definitely go after the people who had evacuated. Therefore, he had to bear his aura sword instead of hiding and at least recovering a bit. Unfortunately, the spell in the circle he was in was created in such a way that every time he used his magic the blood in his body began to boil. Suddenly, arrows from somewhere pierced his back, and Ray himself fell down, unable to dodge in time. The boy felt some guilt for being too careless while the monsters around him were already coming closer, glaring with red eyes. He was unconscious, alone with these creatures. Meanwhile, Aira watched the people evacuate the city and thought that Iela was doing her job right since everything was going smoothly. Suddenly, she felt rather than heard Ray calling her and her ears twitched excitedly. The elf immediately activated the portal, sensing that Ray's life was in danger. There she saw that he was already practically inhabited by monsters, the boy himself being unconscious. Full of uncontrollable rage, the girl swept the monsters around with her emotion alone as her eyes glowed with blue power. However, she was horribly shocked at the form in which the men she cherished lay before her, for Ray was completely shrouded in dark mana, unconscious and covered in his own blood. Aira immediately began to treat him and tried to wake him up, but the very sensation and smell of the dark power she had never forgotten for 20 years left her in shock. It reminded her of the curse that had put her in a long sleep for 20 years, and now she could smell it on Ray, and she had no choice but to bow her head in sorrow. The guy was lying on a daisy-lined bed in the center of the hall, looking spirited and carefree. After news had spread of what had happened to Ray, many of those who had followed him had been saddened to tears, and the Holy Empire itself had hailed him as an incredible hero, and even bestowed upon him a title that no one had ever received before, Abel. This was to be expected, but as soon as the Holy Empire lost the support of the saint, who was representing the forces of an entire country, one of the kingdoms began to attack. Now they had to save themselves on their own. Feeling almost on the verge of insanity, Iela unfortunately recognized that even if the problem with physical exhaustion could be solved, not a single soldier during those 3 days could rest mentally. Suddenly, a great many people she had never expected such a thing from, such as the representatives of the Resian Empire, had come to their aid. The saint looked with unimaginable sadness at all those she had previously thought were just children, but now they were fighting directly without respite. Iela admitted that Ray should have rested for the rest of the war and only then awakened, so that for once they would rely on their own strength rather than involve the saint. However, her moment of melancholy was suddenly interrupted when mages and swordsmen of astonishing power appeared on the battlefield, though she had not expected to meet so easily. According to recent spy reports, they had been spotted in Celine's empire only a few days ago, so she didn't understand how they could have reached the Holy Empire so quickly. Iela glanced over to Zeke, and when one of the sword masters tried to attack them, they barely fought off his blow. The men didn't take them seriously at all, and his next blow was already much stronger, he didn't believe they could stop him. Lord Zeke pushed the saint and was hit because of it, but he didn't doubt it for a moment, because she wouldn't be able to withstand such strength. This man was at least an intermediate or even a top-level sword master. Iela frantically shouted to the soldiers to retreat as soon as possible while there was still a chance. The enemy group's sword master who had attacked Zeke earlier strongly disliked this and tried to attack Iela as well, but at the last moment the divine energy managed to save her and the man nearly lost his sight. Iela remembered how at the camp they had discussed them in their next moves, and one of the newcomers who helped make plans was Gria, the same girl that Ray had once saved. Iela had to listen to her because she was an amazing volunteer among the academy students and the plan was accepted quickly enough. Then, at the camp near the campfire, when they took a moment to take a breather, Zeke asked Iela if it was hard to do without the saint. The girl sadly confirmed his words. She said she had no idea how much Ray had endured and how much he had done for them, but she also said that she was a saint herself and she couldn't rely on Ray all the time. The three people who joined them then agreed with her and said that it was about time to bring back the Holy Empire's true strength. Lord Zeke was perplexed that they had so easily left their comfortable chairs and traded them for a military camp, though being aristocrats they didn't have to, but one of them said there was no point in convenience when the Empire was on the brink of war. One couldn't help but think of the fact that it was thanks to Ray that they could now gather here together, because his plans to reorganize the Empire had helped the aristocrats, mages, and warriors alike a great deal. After all, if before these people were just aristocrats taking care of their estates, now they had come to the rescue in the most difficult time for the Empire, regardless of their own benefit. Meanwhile in the castle, Iela continued to cleanse and heal Ray, though there was no result alas. The elf ordered the maid to always stay and talk to Ray so that he would always have contact with the real world. Yuklawud couldn't help but recognize that no one could have achieved what Ray had achieved, to receive so much attention and care not only from humans, but from elves as well. The girl took seriously what Iela had said about keeping in touch with the saint, so she spoke aloud about how Ray was missed by far more than one person right now. Depressed and downcast, she didn't notice the little finger on Ray's hand twitch. In fact, Ray slept only outside, but inside he was in some strange subspace. He had no rest because his normal mana had been replaced by the mana of two curses that were of the same type and therefore opposed to each other. Both curses were visualized in the form of a bone dragon and in the form of a snake, and at first they stayed away from each other. The guy was calculating how to deal with this problem, since one similar case had already happened when he tried to heal Iela, so now he just had to wait for the two mana to be pushed out of his body. However, Ray unfortunately couldn't help himself on his own, so coming to the tricky part, the guy disturbed the dragon's mana stone and made it think of another curse in the shape of a snake. So now Ray was watching two different mana battle, the bone dragon's magic and the new curse's magic, but so far, no matter how hard the bone dragon tried, his opponent was quite strong. Although it was affecting Ray negatively, he just tolerated it and angrily thought that he didn't know who had created such magic, but once he caught him, that person would not be happy. In the conversations of the maids in the castle, meanwhile, stories were spreading that the war was very hard and even Lady Yuklawud had gone to the battlefield. And the main thing is that the criminal group is approaching and not just getting rid of, but also taking not only adults but also children, who could be raised into walking weapons. Meanwhile, on one of the fronts, everyone warmly welcomed the girl, and even the captain of the 8th Cavalry Unit was insanely happy to see Yuklawud. The girl was gathered on the battlefield and believed that with such successes, and they could well defend not only Selene but also Geralt and Salonia. However, since their enemies were scattered not only on one side but in different places, she decided to split her squad and send some of them to the mountains. Suddenly, Yuklawud felt some strange flow of mana, and tensed up. Meanwhile in the castle, Ray finally opened his eyes after a long time, and the curse that had made his hand blacken, and that had been eating away at him, at least mentally all this time, finally left his hand as well. Ray's method of provoking the two forces and making them attack each other was obviously successful. Ray couldn't move yet, however he could feel the mana and that was very important to him as he was now sure that he was alright after all and now he just needed to heal himself. However, when he started the healing, his own hand, which had previously been cursed, felt very different. It took the guy a few moments to come to a realization. Now, thanks to what had happened, Ray could activate mana much more easily and in larger quantities. So he had literally advanced, and everything that had happened was not for nothing. Having healed himself on his own while applying a special new method, he felt much better than before. He was now ready to fight and save the Holy Empire, and was free from any restrictions in achieving his goal. Meanwhile, Iela was not doing so well and after commanding the army to group up and move back, she began to accumulate divine power in her body because she absolutely had to apprehend those people from the criminal gang. She was stopped from doing anything reckless by Zeke and company, saying that they would take care of it and do their best. Iela disagreed with them and tried to talk them out of it, but Zeke said that even knowing that they would die here, it was still the most important thing to make sure that the holy of this empire was in order, otherwise the war would be over in an instant. Sighing, the girl called upon her mana again, but no longer to attack, but to protect all the soldiers from being hit, applied healing and full protection. As she spoke the words that they should not have died on the field, she already knew that unfortunately not all would be able to escape given the strength of those men. Zeke began to give out orders, but he was so taken aback by the words of his attackers that he abruptly jerked forward to punish those who dared to speak such loud and foul words towards the saints of their empire. However, he was blocked by one of the sword masters who spoke disdainfully of the skills of the Holy Empire's soldiers. Despite all of Zeke's skills, this master was quite difficult for him to fight against, and so far the score was 1-1. The men from Proxia's Pruspid faction couldn't believe that this small empire had so much talent that he wouldn't mind getting rid of. While they were talking, another one of the villainous team went around Gria and almost defeated her with one punch, but the girl managed to stand her ground. The members of the criminal group proceeded to battle, and the Holy Empire's army was constantly suffering terrible wounds, for the strength of these people was much higher than the ordinary ones. Zeke was shocked that just because of just 2 people, their army was suffering such defeats. The sword master of the enemy team was tired of waiting for the Lord to turn his attention to him, so he lunged forward, and Zeke barely managed to defend himself. Suddenly something flashed before his eyes, something bright and shiny. It was the snow that appeared along with the arrival of Yuklawud, who unemotionally told him to surrender quietly and calmly to those who were attacking the army. Meanwhile, Iela had managed to get out and almost make it to Salonia, but she was completely unfazed by the fact that she had left the soldiers behind and had to run away so disgracefully. She was given no time for respite. 2 of the men who had attacked the army earlier had already arrived behind her, never leaving her alone. The girl prepared her swords with the help of divine power and promised that she would not give up and would defeat the 2 at once, no matter what it cost her. The members of the faction, having activated their power, simultaneously lunged at the girl, and she would hardly be able to survive this blow. Suddenly, however, those mages were split almost in half by a blue light, and a wave of relief swept over Iriel's eyes when she saw the back of her favorite Ray, alive, unharmed, and very angry. Ray, in his usual manner, asked if they had planned all this in his absence, and if they were the ones who had cast that spell on him. After the villains of the criminal group admitted that, unfortunately, it had only stopped him for a month and they regretted it, Ray angrily exclaimed that 1 month was not just a period of time for him. Therefore, having already lost a lot of time, he said he would get rid of 2 of them at once, so as not to waste any more time. 2 from the group exchanged glances, and though frightened by his power, they lunged forward and grabbed his arms. This all happened in a second, and Iriel only managed to think that their movement of mana was as if they were trying to transfer their mana to the boy. One of the mages shouted that he was just a human and couldn't withstand the infusion of mana from 2 sword masters at once. In a moment of confusion, Ray acknowledged that such a forcibly infused amount of mana could disrupt his mana flows and seriously harm him. However, after a massive explosion pierced the sky with blue light, the boy dusted himself off while the 2 men lay prostrate, and said they just needed to choose their opponent wisely. Iriel, again in shock, looked at the boy, feeling she had missed something in him, something new. Ray, in turn, said he would not wait for her, as there was very little time left, so he ordered her to simply follow him to the best of her ability. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, Zeke looked terrible and was in critical condition. Yuklawud tried to find out how bad he was and whether he could hold on any longer, but she herself saw that everything was not cheerful there. Even her moment of confusion was attempted to be exploited by the enemy, and she had to defend herself urgently. She had originally planned to fight 2 at once, but one after the other, but now she saw that while she would defeat the first villain, Zeke might not survive this fight. The witch from the criminal group was surprised by Yuklawud's strength, considered her an abnormal person, and even admitted that it was quite difficult for her to dodge the ice spears. Suddenly, a terrible sound distracted Yuklawud. Unfortunately, the sword master of the criminal group found an open spot on Zeke and pierced him in the stomach with his sword. Yuklawud frantically called him, but Zeke fell to the ground in front of the enemy and could not utter another word. And that man, even without receiving significant wounds, was already preparing to attack Yuklawud. The girl was in terrible fury and prepared to defend herself to the end, but she didn't have time to cast her spells, because the enemy army suddenly began a rapid retreat with terrible screams. And one of the soldiers pointed out that he had arrived, the saint. The witch and the sword master of the enemy group were shocked by his appearance, and the whole battlefield practically froze, leaving their battle and watching his walk. Approaching Zeke, Ray, unfortunately, realized that the body of the man he so valued was already cold and that he had died just a few minutes ago. Yuklawud confessed, clasping her hands tightly and almost crying, that she was weak and that her abilities were not high enough to protect Zeke. Ray harshly asked who dared to do this because he planned to cut this person into pieces. The witch from Frosty told her partner to be very careful, as she felt amazing strength from this guy, and that he was not as simple as he looked, but he did not perceive Ray as a serious threat. The girl didn't have time to say anything more, because the very next second she was literally split into uneven parts. And Ray himself, with a grim voice, without turning around, said that judging by her position and power, Zeke's death was clearly not at the hands of that girl. It seemed that only white fury remained from him when he turned to this guy. The sword master tried to say something like a malicious assurance that the saint of the empire was truly a monster, but it was clear that listening to him was the last thing that interested Ray. Lifting Zeke in his arms, the saint entrusted Yuklawud to finish the military actions on this field and prepared to leave. Ray himself teleported to the forest and laid his friend's body on a stone, analyzing his condition. Unfortunately, the sword master had lost a lot of blood, and many parts of his body were already wounded, so Ray simply did not see ways to save him. Finally, Iela caught up with the saint, and with the same great regret, looked at Zeke's body, not believing that the guy had really lost his life in this battle. She unleashed her divine power and illuminated his body with light, promising that the empire would never forget his sacrifice and all that he had done for its inhabitants. However, this light awakened some flashes of memory in Ray, and an utterly incredible idea, considering the current medical time, came to his mind. Maybe, just maybe, they could save Zeke. Iela was terribly upset and understood Ray's condition, but divine magic was not omnipotent, and Ray simply could not bring a dead person back to life. The boy, it seemed, agreed that magic could not do it, but he himself was quite capable, so he materialized a scalpel in his hands, looking serious, once again saving Zeke. As soon as the scalpel touched Zeke's chest, the saint immediately screamed for him to stop, because the previous case could not be compared to the current one, since life and death are only the affairs of God and ordinary mortals can do nothing about it. Ray, with terrible seriousness, said that if life can only be saved by the will of God, then he will either break this will or become a god himself and do it on his own. Expecting the worst, because such expressions were taboo, and such words should be followed by divine punishment, she was greatly surprised because nothing happened to Ray. Ray had no choice but to shrug and just ask her to believe in him. Remembering everything that had happened before, and all those cases when Ray turned out to be capable of what no one had been able to do before, the girl agreed and even offered her help. Ray did not waste any more time and began to analyze Zeke before starting another operation. As a medic, he understood that the sword master's brain was no longer working, but his body, after using Ireel's divine power, was in excellent condition. Using his medical knowledge, he realized that the golden hour was starting, those 4 minutes from the moment the heart stopped beating, and he could save the men. Gaining access to the heart by removing the ribs, Ray thought about what he could use instead of medical instruments, and using his creativity, he launched lightning into Zeke's body as a defibrillator. Moreover, he had to use air magic to circulate air through the man's body, as he could not breathe on his own, and there was no lung ventilation system at hand. He had to massage the heart with his own hands, and Ray prayed to all the gods for it to work. Lightning after lightning, air after air, massage after massage, he performed resuscitation actions in this medieval magical world. And suddenly, both Ray and Ireel heard a short thud, but this meant that Zeke's heart was beating without Ray's help. The boy immediately demanded that Ireel quickly heal Zeke, and the girl, absolutely not believing, began to use her power. Zeke breathed evenly and deeply again, although she had previously seen with her own eyes that he could not do this, and there was no spirit in his body. The logical question followed, who the hell was he, having done all this with his own hands? Ray simply and cheerfully answered in his usual manner that he was not the only one involved in Zeke's resurrection, and that it was their joint work that brought such amazing results. To which Ireel immediately tried to excuse herself from this, as such black magic was not something she desired, and this caused Ray to laugh in relief, seeing that everything was slowly getting back to normal. Now that Zeke was alright, he still had other tasks, so leaving Ireel, Ray immediately galloped away. The girl didn't even have time to tell him that coming to the Pope now would not be the best decision. Meanwhile, the entire city was engulfed in flames. Standing on a rock, towering over all this hell, was Lord Gregory, the representative of the Resian Empire, who had initially offered his help. He laughed madly, looking at the horror unfolding under his feet, thinking that soon the people of the Holy Empire would lead him to a safe place, as he had hidden well and played his role to the end. However, apparently, he had not hidden well enough, because a weapon was already pressed to his throat. As the mysterious man ordered Gregory not to move, and he jerked sharply, trying to free himself from the grip, his hand flew to the ground, followed by the Lord himself, but only in pieces. The man was sure that he had surrounded himself with a protective barrier, so he was very surprised that someone found him and even managed to approach him so silently. Stepping on him, one of the Dane family angrily asked who his boss was, and the men suddenly realized that it was not one person, but there were 7 of them. Gregory tried to blame the senior priest of their empire, but Hong Yong clarified that she wanted to know who gave him orders in the criminal group of Proxia, not some silly excuse. Realizing that even being without a hand and completely defeated, the man was not going to say anything, Hong Yong ordered one of the 7 Danes to get into his brain. The girl was displeased with this, but obediently applied magic, and the outlines of a cross began to appear on her forehead, quickly gaining the brightness of golden glow. The men did not believe that such magic could be available to anyone, as even senior priests or saints cannot do anything like it, but this was the last thought formed in his head. Having received information from the Lord, the girl contemptuously pushed him away with her foot, as he was no longer able to say anything coherent, struck down by this magic to the point of foaming at the mouth. Having received their tasks, the Dane family split up to solve this problem and finally returned to the saint. Meanwhile, Rei arrived at the very heart of the Holy Empire, and ordered the soldier who greeted him in surprise to tell the Pope that he wanted to meet with him. Arriving at the Pope's place, Rei told him that Proxia was not just a lousy organization, and that it was formed not out of nowhere, but from an alliance of their neighbors and even the Holy Empire itself. The Pope immediately declared that he would track down all the traitors in the Empire and deal with them as soon as possible and as harshly as possible, but Rei warned him that there was no need to do so, and that it was better to wait until all the rats came out. Angered by Rei's words, the old man did not understand how one could turn a blind eye, even for a while, to these criminals, and Rei did not understand why he was so furious and reckless. He again asked the Pope to calm down and not give in to emotions if he wanted to achieve a good result and get rid of the criminal group for a long time. Leaving the hall, he did not see how much the Pope's face had changed and how dark his thoughts were, filled not with thoughts of the Empire's prosperity. Walking in the opposite direction from the office, Rei was still thinking about this. This criminal group surely had gathered more masters than they had shown before, but Rei needed precise information to prevent another such group in the future when he could no longer help the Holy Empire. Meanwhile, a bright dawn was breaking as Lord Zeke rode his horse on the road, clenching the reins in powerless anger and shame. It was all because the saint had forbidden him to appear on the battlefield when he finally came to his senses. Although he was very indignant about this, the girl, using the trump card and saying that Zeke needed to take care of himself because the saint had already helped him once, managed to convince him. She promised that the 3 families and she herself would solve the issue with this war, and Zeke needed to come and join the path of the saint. During the journey, Zeke remembered his childhood, how strong he was in his teenage years and how he was called the strongest possible. As a member of the Trey family, his destiny was to help and protect the representatives of God, the saints. However, when Rei met Zeke and blocked the man's sword with just his bare hands, the sword master thought that there was still much he did not know in this world. Because after that moment, he wanted to give his whole life into Rei's hands and become his loyal servant, assistant, and bodyguard. And the more painful for him was the realization that he had become not a sword, but a real burden for the saint, and because of this, he felt terribly sad. He shouted that he was the worst guard, and Iriel, watching him from the window, was worried about the men. In fact, she had kept Zeke away from the war, as Rei had asked her, but she still did not understand what he was planning to achieve with his actions. At the same time, the saint came to the dungeon to the necromancer, and the old man met him with a cunning smirk, assuming that the empire was now in flames, and Rei simply confirmed that everything was very bad, and he came to ask the necromancer a few questions. When the necromancer laughed and said he wouldn't tell Rei anything under any torture, the boy seemed completely unopposed. On the contrary, he looked very cheerful, having carte blanche to use not just torture, but a more terrible method, pointing out the shortcomings of the necromancer himself. Taking a file out of his bag, he listed other terrible diseases that were in the necromancer, and then suggested that when he gets rid of these diseases in the old man, the latter would be immensely grateful. However, looking like a real devil, he did not plan to act for the necromancer's gratitude, but just wanted to check how compatible the bodies of humans and trolls or orcs were. So, after some time, when the old necromancer looked like a young beauty, albeit hairless, the necromancer begged for mercy, asking to be saved, just so they wouldn't touch him anymore. Rei was terribly disappointed that the old man gave up so soon, because he had many more modifications planned. So, the essence of proxia was quite simple: 5 magical towers that maintain balance among themselves. And then when Rei competed and fought with a dragon and an army of the dead, he actually defeated the Black Tower, so all the other towers hate him and want revenge. The necromancer also proudly and eagerly told about the fact that Proxia has 15 sword masters and 7 mages of the 6th circle, and that no matter how strong he is, he will not be able to defeat them, which Rei, of course, did not even listen to. But to his question about where the main base of the criminal group is located, the beautified necromancer answered with a cunning smirk that it was in the Grencia Mountains. The Grencia Mountains were the first mountains on the continent where elves and gnomes could coexist, as it was a neutral zone with good lands and resources. Rei had to admit that it was indeed a very good place to maintain an army away from the Empire and remain unnoticed for so long, and he would even like to send a meteorite into those mountains, but he did not want to harm the innocent elves and gnomes. It's not to say that Rei was very scared, especially after the recent modification, thanks to which he had no previous limitations, but the fact that, Besides the 15 sword masters and mages, there was also a mage of the 7th circle, made the last battle a bit more difficult. Summoning Hong Yong, the saint ordered her to go to neighboring countries to monitor movements and react to everything that happens. Noticing that something was troubling her, he asked what the problem was, and she replied that, naturally, his orders come first, but she would also like to join the army. Rei was surprised by her initiative, but agreed with her, saying that they need to use their forces more thoughtfully. His first decision didn't change, and he still sent one of the 7 messengers on a reconnaissance mission because this mission was much more important than an ordinary battlefield. Hong Yong looked at the boy who sounded like he had gone mad, saying that if the other army has special forces, they need to create something too, with some doubt. Some time later, Zeke stood at the door to the saint's office, hesitating to enter. However, the maid reported his presence, so he had to move and even enter the office, lowering his head. He expected to be scolded or even despised, but instead, Rei simply came up, patted him on the shoulder, and told him to be on the training field the next morning. Shocked, the man asked if Rei really didn't want to send away a soldier who failed his mission, and Rei was annoyed even by the fact that his friend had such thoughts. He tried to convey to the guilty conscience of Zeke that he had put a lot of effort into making the men invincible, so all he needed to think about for the next few days was training as much as possible. He also said that he knew how much Zeke had suffered and tried, so if there was someone he could trust his life with, it was the Lord. With a confident look and a sparkle in his eyes, he affirmed that Zeke was the sword of the saint. The man was inspired and immediately knelt before him, expressing his respect. And the next morning, he was so full of strength and enthusiasm that Rei himself wanted to cry from it. Now Rei set about teaching Zeke to use his powers anew and not just to summon the mana of the sword master into the weapon, but to find a balance. He suggested visually dividing the sword into 3 parts and distributing these parts equally to feel maximum control over the weapon. After the words that Zeke needed to break old habits, the process went much faster, and the man himself was surprised by his results. The Lord tried again, and with guidance, quickly did what he was told. In the end, Rei just told him not to give up for another 3 days and to hone this skill in this time, to which Zeke agreed without doubts in his master. Although it was said about 3 days, Rei did not plan to force and expect a perfect result in such a short time, because he knew how difficult it was. However, he had plans to leave the Holy Empire for some time to deal with problems, so he needed to leave it in the hands of someone he trusted very much. Suddenly, he felt a strange but familiar flow of mana and beautiful Iela emerged from the portal again. Rei called her delightedly and even stood up from the chair to greet her. However, Iela, apparently, did not expect him to be in perfect order, so she blushed and got nervous as soon as she saw a live and healthy Rei. Unable to restrain herself, she hugged the boy, and he warmly and gratefully returned her embrace. When emotions settled down and they had enough hugs, Rei told Iela about his suspicions regarding the Garcia Mountains, and the elf said that this place is governed not by her, but by another high elf. Because of this, Rei was a bit concerned because it was not easy to enter these lands, considering how unfriendly this race could be. He understood that especially since he plans to fight on their territory, he would be maximally unwelcome, and not only the village he needed to go to, but also all the other nearby elf villages would be against him. Hearing that he was asking about the strength of the elves, Iela said somewhat indignantly that each high elf is immensely strong, but she is the guardian and keeper of the high elves, so her power is much greater. Rei promised Iela that he would try not to cause any conflicts with the elves, but she did not really believe him. To Iela's great regret, she had to return, and she said that she was immensely glad that Rei had recovered, and was frank in her words. Finally, she said that the head of the Garcia Mountains is a calm and accommodating elf, so as long as Rei does not act too loudly, everything should be fine. Hearing these words during the farewell, Rei felt only more disgust towards the criminal group because they chose the most convenient place for themselves but did not think about the poor residents of those places. 3 days later, Rei came to Zeke to check his results. The man demonstrated his new skills, and Rei made such a sour expression that the bruises under Zeke's eyes deepened twice. Then the man confessed that when Rei taught him and showed how to handle the sword, he felt something awakening inside him, and wanted to improve it. The saint realized that by explaining to Zeke how to use the aura sword, he not only gave him a technique but gave him a deep understanding, which the man, worthy of the title of a junior master of the sword, successfully developed. Now, the Holy Empire in his absence will be in safe hands, and he does not have to worry. Offering to teach the sword master another tactic, Rei stood in a combat stance, ready to attack with a cunning but pleased smile. He swung, but did not immediately deliver the blow to Zeke, as if waiting for something. The man was slightly offended by such disbelief in his strength, but at that time, obediently analyzed the saint's sword, which despite the difference in color, seemed to him the same as his own. Firmly deciding that he would parry this attack, the man was not at all ready for the sword to suddenly melt in the air. His eyes reflected sheer question marks. With the same smile, Rei said that this would be his last lesson, and that in real battle mode, it feels even more exciting. Because the blue aura sword, passing through the sword Zeke put up for defense, rushed to his head without any obstacles, as if it was made of water. Shocked to the core, the men reverently asked if there was any way to block such a strike, to which Rei evasively avoided answering. It was time to talk about the future, and the saint, returning to a serious demeanor, announced that he plans to head to the proxia base. Zeke immediately stood up to follow the boy but received a slap and was forced to calm down for at least a minute. Although the man was entrusted with the defense of an entire empire, he felt offended that he could not follow the saint, and was even scolded so ungraciously. Finally noticing Zeke's tired look, Rei asked if he had eaten at all while training. With noticeable bruises under his eyes, Zeke responsibly answered that he would never leave the training field for some food. He only didn't receive another slap because the hungry are not beaten. Meanwhile, the servant Iela reported to her that her departure had already been recorded as prayer time, and none of the soldiers would follow her. Another news about the Inquisition's advancement made the High Priestess slam her fist on the table in emotions. And the news that the Inquisition did this despite the absence of her order, but with the permission of the Pope, shocked her. Iela immediately jumped up, threw on her top priestly clothes, and ordered the servant to follow her, almost flying out of the office with a sharp step. And Rei was already in the mountains, dressed warmly for the winter weather. A loud sneeze echoed through the mountains, alerting everyone to the arrival of the frozen saint. Realizing that with each step even his specially magically heated clothes are no longer helping, and the blizzard is worsening visibility, Rei decides to set up camp and make a stop. Warming up by the fire, the boy resembles a contentedly ruffled cat. Thinking about whether he can use something in this forest to make the fire bigger, he spots a slender tree growing right in the middle of the field. Grabbing its thick branches, he tries to pull and uproot the stump when an inhuman voice demands he immediately stop these attempts. Rei doesn't react immediately, dumbfounded for a few seconds. But when the tree turns around and looks at him with a toothy and eyeful face, he raises his hands in a soothing gesture and backs away. While Rei wonders what kind of wonder this creature is, it aloud declares that normal people don't wander into these forests. Rei retorts that he didn't expect to see a forest monster tree here either. Feeling offended, the creature states that it is actually a dryad, and asks not to confuse it with some demons. Rei already had images of dryads from his own world in his head, so naturally, he didn't believe that a dryad could be anything other than a beautiful semi-clad forest beauty. The creature, angered by the disbelief, extends its roots from the ground to stand more upright. After a lengthy silent eye-to-eye confrontation, the creature turns its back to Rei with a funny tale, and changes the subject to the extraordinary divine powers of the boy. After hearing that Rei is a saint, it asks to share a drop of divine power with it and promises anything in return. Rei ponders his request offer for a long time, not forgetting about his original plans. The dryad, lowering its head, sadly says that without these powers it can't return home to the forest. It turns out that some dark people came one day, weakened the forest and its creatures, and occupied these places on their own, depriving many of their home. Rei is immediately struck by this story, realizing that he has come across a creature from the mountains he is heading to, and these dark people are the proxia criminal group. With a bright smile and a nod of approval, Rei tells that it's a fantastic coincidence, as he came to this place to punish those people. After these words, the dryad even agrees to help Rei and fetch him branches, so he doesn't have to sustain the fire with magic. So, it simply breaks off one of its arm branches and throws it into the fire, even remarking that it's the best wood Rei will find in the area, sparking Rei's further desire to help this creature as soon as possible. The next day, the blizzard ends, and the boy walks through a normal forest, no longer needing wood and magical clothes. Suddenly, as soon as he enters the elven territory, he is stopped by one of the border guards. With naive childlike simplicity, Rei asks for an audience with the high elf, which naturally results in him being sent away deeply and for a long time. Rei didn't expect a warm welcome, but it still upsets him. Who knows where this conversation would have gone if the supreme elf hadn't descended onto the clearing, supported by the wind. When greeted more amicably, the boy starts sharing his problem, but the elf's attention is not captured by him, but by the earring in his ear. The supreme elf of this village had exactly the same one. In just a moment, from a kind soul, he turns into a fighting machine, emitting a terrible aura around him. The elf doesn't believe Rei's words that it was a gift, as these earrings were the property of the village and the legacy of his mother. Honestly admitting who he is and where he's from, Rei awkwardly scratches the back of his head, not understanding the fuss. But as soon as he hears the name of the Resian Empire, the elf starts attacking directly, declaring that friends of this empire are their enemies. Rei disappointedly admits that things are not going very well when magic hits him and an explosion is heard. Barely avoiding being toasted to a crispy, appetizing crust, but failing to keep his clothes in good condition, Rei ran away in a wild frenzy from the enraged elf. The elf yelled for Rei to immediately return those earrings, not considering that dodging someone else's magic, this would be the last thing on the boy's mind. Countering with a remark that he would suffer anyway, whether he returns the earrings or not, Rei just kept running as fast as he could, not wanting to draw the group's attention by using magic. The elf quickly lost sight of him, no matter how hard he tried, and began to doubt Ray's human nature because of such speed. In a calm environment, the saint deeply regretted what had happened, as he planned to defeat Proxia with the help and consent of the elves, but instead, the legend of the second pair of earrings was triggered. Even in this escape, the eternal optimist managed to find a plus, as he was able to understand the geography of this place and roughly realize where Proxia might be located. All torn up, the boy set up camp to avoid going hunting in the middle of the night and instead get a good night's sleep and set off the next day. Even before the sunrise, Ray had already risen and tracked all the locations he had previously charted on the map. He calculated that they probably use the same circles for defense as in the academy, so he needs to be careful and not repeat that situation. Suddenly, the boy was interrupted by some noise. Going a little further, he surprisingly saw a wounded group of elves and gnomes in the middle of the forest, looking at him suspiciously. Realizing that they needed help, despite the fact that he was very ungraciously expelled from the elf village earlier, Ray couldn't stop himself from helping. He suddenly dashed forward, and before he was grabbed, blinded everyone with a bright flash. When the gnomes blinked, there was no one in front of them, and they thought everything was fine. However, Ray himself jumped out of a portal nearby, not alone, but with a wounded elf, who immediately started cursing him with all his might. He slapped some green goo on the elf's wound, and the elf immediately felt relief, while the boy said that he made these medicines from plants found in these forests. The elf, realizing that they were helped, immediately slowed down and thanked for the rescue, even apologizing for their initial rudeness. The elves told that they had a skirmish with the gnomes, as usual, over territorial issues. Introducing themselves in turn, they noted Ray's respect for nature and looked at him even more favorably. Then came the logical question of what the boy was doing here, to which he briefly told them about the enemy army of humans hidden in their forests. The elf snorted and said that he knew about it and even named the exact number, 150 people, shocking Ray, because such a number could not simply cross the snowy mountains, which means that Proxia had already established connections with other kingdoms, allowing them to enter from a more convenient and safe route. Now Ray directly said that army plans to destroy the continent, and he came to make them disappear from the face of the earth. Receiving an offer from the elves to help in return for saving their lives, Ray asked them to take him to the village and arrange a meeting with the Supreme Elf. However, as much as this couple wanted to help, it was not in their power, as only the seniors can decide whether to let someone into the village. Deciding to at least rid himself of one problem, Ray handed them the earring and asked them to bring it to Chersi, the Supreme Elf who had chased him around the mountains. And for the next 3 days, Ray spied on the Proxia criminal group, spending all his time recording all their actions, habits, culture, and generally gathering any information that could help him in battle. And one day, he began to act, starting by catching a small forest animal. The 7 from the Dane family, having initially embarked on a special mission for Ray, were now discussing the results of their inspection of other kingdoms, and were dissatisfied with what they saw, as traces of Proxia were everywhere. However, the main culprit still remained in the Holy Empire, and the movements it was making were beginning to cause concern. They had just started talking about how all the threads lead to the Pope, who had taken all the power under his control, when one of them suddenly stood up sharply and made everyone fall silent. She detected a strange source of mana located in the Vatican, moving out of the city very quickly. Immediately going into combat readiness, Hong Yong gave the order, they must eliminate this source of mana, and any actions aimed at protecting the saint were allowed. Meanwhile, Iela was also having a tough time, as she was infuriated by the Pope's actions, which she still perceived as childish behavior. But the next moment, the door of her office was almost ripped off its hinges, and soldiers began to enter, ignoring her words. Moreover, she was ordered to quietly say goodbye to life, as one of the mercenaries pulled out a knife with clear intentions. However, before he could act, he was intercepted by Hong Yong, who ended his life with one strike, managing to turn around and ask if Iela was alright. Not having met them before, the High Priestess was now in shock and could only nervously sweat. Meanwhile, Ray was starting a new chapter in the life of the enemy group, hiding in the mountains, as he had released rodents he had been collecting for several days. These rats carried the plague, which had claimed many lives in the Middle Ages. Although it was a magical world, sanitation here was at the same level as medieval Europe, so with his knowledge, it was not difficult for Ray to replicate this virus. From the same observations over these 3 days, in this settlement, there were almost no priests to whom people would turn in case of illness, and who were unaware of the existence of penicillin. Continuing in torn clothes, Ray was incredibly pleased with himself and the plan he had implemented. The mold quickly spread on the bread he had obtained. He then threw away the brown mold, and separated the bread into different stacks with white and blue mold. He quickly finished his work, preparing to wait until he could produce penicillin. The village was already infected and lost its calm, as the dark spots and the first victims fell to the work of the magic of the Black Tower. Naturally, the spores began to spread throughout the area, as soldiers quickly began to say goodbye to life, and many people caught fever and inflammations. Ray observed all this from the bushes from his favorite comfortable spot, ensuring that everything was going as planned. Proxia was supposed to collapse and disappear from the face of the earth without his further intervention, just with the help of one disease, which even priests could not cure. However, the boy did not rush to leave, as he was still concerned about the story of Mage of the seventh circle in the ranks of Proxia, and he wanted to make sure that everything went smoothly and to eliminate this threat if possible. Moreover, Ray was a bit crazy, so he also expected to find more grimoires here, with the information he needed, for example, travel magic, allowing him not to cross these snowy mountains on the way back. After a while, Ray was already running up the tower, eager to reach the Sanctum Sanctorum, mocking the guards who lacked the strength to catch him. Seeing that the tower's top was guarded by sword masters, the boy figured there must be something very important hidden there, something Ray desperately wanted to get. Without wasting even an extra minute, Ray dispatched the guards in such a manner that a saint would have long ago suggested he take a course in rehabilitation from insanity. His eyes shone as he thought about taking what they were guarding as a war trophy for all the days he had to spend there. As he expected, behind the door at the very top of the tower awaited a huge library, infused with magic from floor to high ceiling. However, something lying at his feet prevented him from going further and satisfying his desire for magical folios. It was a young man. They exchanged mutual looks of misunderstanding. Suddenly, the man on the floor realized that Ray was the one who had released the rats and plague, and he stood up, surrounded by an unusual dark energy for these parts. Ray, recalling this power he felt when the demonic magic circle in the academy absorbed him, fearlessly smiled at the creator of the circle. The black mage and leader of Proxia immediately assessed Ray's level and achievements as if reading facts from a sheet. During the conversation, the topic of the necessity of committing inhumane crimes just for revenge came up, but the men Ray found refuted the saint's assumption, saying that revenge held no interest for him. However, experiments and research were important to him, for which he would do anything. Ray frowned, as summing up this man's words meant that all the human sacrifices, all the suffering and tears, were just to satisfy his scientific curiosity. Suddenly, the men activated a new circle, deciding that Ray would be an excellent research subject, especially since he was such an interesting representative of humanity endowed with unique powers. The seventh circle mage already considered victory in his pocket and even behaved contemptuously, but suddenly he felt he couldn't move, and chains began to bind his body. Ray concentrated his power, coldly indifferent, stating that he couldn't allow such a threat to society to live. In the last second of his life, the mage realized that Ray was much stronger than him, and at a much higher rank. Unfortunately, this knowledge brought him no consolation, as there was no one left to console him. Together with a huge flash stretching for miles around the tower, the criminal group Proxia was destroyed. At sunset, Ray was returning home, feeling great about this thought, as he was damn tired, and had already planned to surround himself with medicine upon his return. One of the books he snatched from the tower, which should have contained information about teleportation, was supposed to help him return home faster. The rest were of no interest to him. Alas, contrary to his expectations, the book did not yield to his magic and continued to tease him with its locked clasp. Meanwhile, the people who tried to attack Iela had already been destroyed, and one of the 7 messengers explained that they had been sent from the Vatican. Iela did not refute this and quickly believed that the Pope was behind it all. She remembered how her conversation with him went a few days ago and tried to prove that they needed to quietly gather all the criminals of Proxia, but he did not calm down for a minute. Moreover, he declared that only the Pope can decide the future of the Holy Empire, and that he was endowed with this gift by God himself. Not falling for the trap of choosing sides, Iela asked the Pope if he thought that the saint undeservedly held his position as a representative of God and that his words had no basis. The Pope did not respond, but judging by the fact that he subsequently sent mercenaries for the high priestess's life, his answer in his eyes was unequivocal. Iela, gathering her thoughts, asked one of the 7 messengers to deliver a message.